He watched his kingdom fall and ran when it mattered most. But when he opened his eyes again, he was back in the past. Same weak third prince, same broken future waiting ahead. This time he doesn't hesitate. He picks up the sword, takes command, and starts fighting for his life. Step by step, battle by battle, he's turning himself into the knight his kingdom needed from the start. Because this time, he's not running. He's leading the war. In the tavern, a man asked if he knew about those rumors. They say some madman was wandering the battlefield. A comrade asked again, a madman? The man put his mug of drink on the table and said that he was most likely a mercenary with lifeless eyes, because as soon as the battle was over he disappeared and went in search of a new one. The comrade answered thoughtfully, a mercenary, not attached to life. How strange, the man said, and also, this madman keeps saying that he survived again. Also, they say that he always appears in battles somehow connected with the Empire. It seems that he is driven by something personal, rather than money. The comrade took a sip from the mug and said that these words already gave him goosebumps. So who is this madman? The man replied, well, judging by the rumors, he is most likely the prince of some ruined kingdom. They say he is looking for a place where he can die. After a while, Yuri was sitting near the stone, and the knight in front of him lifted his helmet and asked, and all he could think of was to end his life, the third prince of Betrayal, Yuri Betrayal. Yuri Betrayal is the name of a dishonest man who destroyed a kingdom with his own hands, and the name of a sinner who managed to survive in that kingdom. 10 years ago, a cry was heard in the casino. Come on, the third prince of Betrayal, Yuri Betrayal, laughed joyfully and shouted, yes, he's lucky today. The royal magician Hernando said, cool. How does he manage to win every time, and by a very small margin? The man stood up and said, well, luck is there. He knows. He thinks he cares? MC asked. So are they ready for another round? This time he's doubling the bet. Hernando put his hand to his lips and suggested they leave already. If they stay here for too long, they'll be late for the meeting. Suddenly, the man kicked the table and asked why they didn't just leave while they were nice. He thinks they don't know he cheated? Another man asked, did he decide to cheat? What nonsense. Yuri stood up in irritation and asked, cheat? Who do they take him for? The man replied, well, given his behavior, he's not a nobleman. Maybe he's the king of some country or something. The guy chuckled and asked again, a king? If he were a member of the royal family, he wouldn't have sent him away so easily. Another man spoke up. And what was he talking about? He's getting on the Empire's nerves by escalating tensions in the war. All princes are the same. He thinks they're just like their fathers. What's it like to be a useless son? What can people who only know how to swing swords do anyway? MC broke the table and screamed loudly. The man froze in surprise and asked, what? Yuri ordered them to listen to him. You bunch of idiots. He is the third prince of Betrayal, Yuri Betrayal. And they guys, thanks to his kindness, are being transferred today. The men were even more frightened by what they heard and screamed loudly. After a while, Yuri asked, doesn't she understand that he is telling the truth? He was standing in the street and talking. He was late because his father had an urgent conference. After all, he had already told her all this through the communication sphere. The princess of the empire, Catherine Avarna Grandzine, folded her arms across her chest and remained silent. MC spoke. He was trying to say, maybe she would let him go at least once? Catherine asked, does he think he alone has trouble finding the time for this? Does he even understand how long it took her to get here? Avoiding the glances of passersby, MC replied, he knows perfectly well, but he asks for understanding. Since his father is currently not at his post, he needs to be careful. In general, he shouldn't have told anyone about this. Catherine smiled and asked, so she is nobody to him? Yuri answered fearfully, no, it's not like that. Catherine asked, if he didn't trust her, then why did he tell her? He could have told another woman he trusted more. She turned away and said not to talk to her until she said so. MC asked Catherine to wait, but she left. He looked at the pendant and asked what he should do. This time, making amends would be much harder. All this time, a man was watching them from around the corner. From that day on, their relationship worsened even more. The ties between Betrayal and the Empire reached their breaking point. The Empire's actions were just a simple provocation, which gradually began to go beyond what was permitted. As a result, the conflict between the two countries began to escalate. A cry rang out. Invasion! The Empire has invaded Betrayal. We must evacuate immediately. MC's eyes widened in surprise and he took off running, throwing his jacket over one shoulder. An order was given to tell everyone in the castle to flee. Yuri ran to the burning castle and froze. Eventually, official war with the Empire began. After the passage of eras and countless casualties, a war that seemed to never end. A cry rang out. Elder brother Joshua, His Highness, he must evacuate immediately. Yuri asked. Reinforcements, have they not arrived yet? Betrayal's most powerful force, and the one people called the strongest on the continent, Fiore Betrayal. Just because one man was missing, the tide of the war was gradually turning in the Empire's favor. At first, he thought it was a simple coincidence and ignored it. Perhaps he was simply denying a reality he didn't believe in. However, thoughts of past battles in which he had risked his life and his rational thinking led him to one conclusion. Catherine had betrayed them. She was the only one he had told everything to. The moment his father left Betrayal, the Empire's ruthless invasions began. He hoped that this strange coincidence would ultimately prove to be just a coincidence, but the answer to the letter he had barely managed to send to Catherine was, a dove landed on MC's hand from which he untied the letter and widened his eyes in surprise. On the small piece of paper, only sorry was written, nothing but disappointment. The knight screamed, "It's Prince Briol! We must capture him and Briol will be finished." MC clenched his jaw and said, "There's no end to them." He blocked the knight's blow and threw him aside. But at that moment, they began to attack him from the side. He also neutralized the enemy and stopped. Yuri heard footsteps behind him and turned around to see the Knights of the Empire. They looked at him carefully, and he thought, a nightmare, so this is how it will end. The man knocked the sword out of his hands, and Yuri closed his eyes, preparing to accept his death. Blood splashed in all directions, and when he opened his eyes, he saw a knight in front of him. He froze in fear and cried out, "Laurent." He asked to save his highness. MC screamed, "Laurent?" The other knight stepped forward and said, "No need. They ask you to run, his highness. If something happens to him, Briol will fall. Faster. He needs to run faster, his highness." Yuri frowned and started running, and the opponents shouted, "Prince Briol is escaping. We need to catch him." After a while, they stood near a wooden building and said, "He couldn't have run far. We need to find him." Yuri was sitting inside behind the boxes and thinking, he can't hide here anymore. He must somehow miraculously break through them and come up with something. I wonder what happened to his father? Considering that he still hasn't returned, most likely he was killed by the Empire. Suddenly the door opened and a small beam of light illuminated MC. He was scared, and a knight entered the house. He thought, no, if he dies here, Briol. He asked for mercy. If he dies here, Briol won't be able to resist anymore. He thought, the Knights of Briol who sacrificed themselves for him. Yuri clenched his fist and said, he's trying to say. He lowered his head, and the knight asked for forgiveness. He won't explain for long. The Empire will be punished for its sins. The Empire's soldiers will soon burst in here, so let him go. After some time, Yuri ran through the forest and thought, he must survive even in this way. He must survive. He must restore Briol. He must take revenge on the Empire. However, it was all nothing more than childish bravado. But reality turned out to be cruel. In the end, everyone died. What was the meaning of all this bloodshed? He can't even think of a reason for all of this. Yes, he picked up the sword only to punish himself. Someday someone will appear who can kill him. After a while, a voice was heard. They say he is looking for a place to die. Just think. So this is the reason he so fiercely rushes into the most dangerous battles and makes reckless accusations just to relax. And all he could think of was to end his life? He is obsessed with himself to the very end. Death for someone like him is too good an end. MC said. He says all this with the air of a man who wants to kill him. So let him end it already. The man said, the third prince of Briol, Yuri Briol. MC's eyes widened in surprise and thought, everyone who knows his past has long been dead. The guy lifted his helmet and said, it's all because of him. Absolutely everything. He alone is to blame for all of this. Yuri asked fearfully, Laurent? He thought, this voice, it was definitely him, but he died then. Like, the knight grabbed the hilt of the sword and said, the reason Briol fell at the hands of the Empire is because of the oath of honor of the Flander family, which served the royal family all this time. Because of this, his dignity and faith collapsed overnight. Yuri Briol, MC thought, the one who died long ago, returned as a ghost, just to challenge his mistakes and sins. A nightmare. He thought he would feel better when he died. This terrible feeling of guilt weighs on him even in the last moment of his life. The last Briol will never give up his honor, even in death. After a while, he heard a voice. Yuri, Uriol. He opened his eyes and froze, lying in bed. Fiore said, he hadn't opened his eyes for 3 days. Is he okay? MC sat up and asked father. He thought about his dead father. Maybe. He lowered his head and spoke, so he also went to hell. He ended up here for obvious reasons, but his father. Fiore asked again. What? Yuri took his hand and answered, well, for a man who constantly talked about honor, he lived a pretty tolerable life. Fiore hit him on the head with his hand and screamed, what kind of nonsense is he talking about? Yuri grabbed his head and asked, even in hell he can't get rid of this habit of his? He ordered him to apologize, at least now. He stopped his gaze on a small leaf of a plant and looked out the window. He thought, they are not here. Outside, the maids smiled sweetly and the fountain was pleasing to the eye. MC thought, he does not see them. If this is hell, there must be sinners and a terrifying flame of purification. The devil must torment him and mock him. Wait, then this. His brothers stood by his bed and asked, Yuri has finally woken up. He lost consciousness again, and they screamed, Yuri Briol. He is currently 13 years old. At first, he thought it was a dream, or a lingering memory, but no matter how hard he tried, he could neither wake up nor see the end of the world. Instead, old memories lying in the recesses of his memory constantly repeated. He could not help but accept the fact that he would return to the past. In the spring of the year, he turned 13, and the fact that he got another chance. After some time, the prince was asked to get up. He asked to be woken up. MC grunted in response, and he was told that it was time to practice swordsmanship. He quickly widened his eyes and stood up. He started to get dressed, and said, Ina, hurry up, let her give him clothes. More precisely, his things for the shower. She asked the prince to calm down. Ina smiled and said, first she will help him wash his face. She asks him to sit down. Yuri remembered Ina's bloody body, who was sitting near the wall, and lowered his head. He turned around and said, Ina. She asked, yes, his highness? He asked to slap him. 3 hearty slaps. Ina asked again, what? He wants her to commit treason? MC said, it is not treason if he told her to do so. Ina asked, is he sure? He answered, absolutely. he, Yuri Briol, will keep his once pronounced oath. Sometime later, MC held a wooden sword in his hands on the training ground and thought he had forgotten that Ina was very strong. The guys passed behind him, and Yuri thought, and no one even offered to apply any ointment. Even Bernard didn't say a word about his cheek. Yuri's swordsmanship trainer, Bernard, stood in front of him. MC thought he was simply sparring with him, without even pointing out his mistakes. When did Bernard start simply sparring with him? Some time ago. Bernard stood in Fiore's office and said, he is quite good when it comes to intellect, but it's a shame. If the prince had been a little more sincere, he would have been a blessing for Briol. MC thought exactly from that moment. They started sparring because they couldn't agree on anything during training. Hearing that, he began to become lazy and stopped putting in the effort. He turned to Bernard and said, starting today, let him train him properly. He, Yuri Briol, will train properly from now on. Bernard looked at him carefully and said, he doesn't know what came over him so suddenly, but he understood, sir. Bernard released mana and said, from now on, they will begin real training. He attacked MC, and MC asked him to wait. He stopped and thought, exactly. Before Bernard came to Briol, he was known as the Sword Demon. After a while, Yuri lay on the ground and thought, so this is what proper training with the Sword Demon is, Bernard. If he hadn't been a mercenary in his past life, it would have been much worse. He looked at the sun through the fingers of his hand and thought, although it is a little tiring, with this kind of training, his abilities will improve much faster, right? Not bad, not bad. Bernard examined him carefully and thought, he repelled all of his attacks. Where did the prince improve his skills so much? A cry rang out. His Highness. Anna ran into the training grounds and said, she thinks it's time for him to stop and come out. His Majesty requests his presence. MC turned around and asked, His Majesty. Why? Ina replied, it looks like Count Johannes has brought his son. Yuri thought, Count Johannes' son. He's the one who betrayed the kingdom and gave the empire a chance in his past life. Got Bavar. That idiot? He turned to Ina, and she asked, yes? MC said, that idiot, where is he now? After a while, two families were sitting at the table. Johannes said, the third prince has changed so much, he's become much smarter. Fiore frowned and replied, he thinks he just took the wrong pills. Johannes said, if there are any, he'd like to give them to his son too. Fiore said, his son is already smart. Johannes said, he still has work to do. Gott looked at Cedric admiringly, and MC gave him an irritated look. Gott looked down, and Joshua nudged MC with his elbow and asked, Yuri, did he quarrel with him? MC replied, actually, yes. He stabbed him in the back. Joshua smirked and asked, so what will their almighty Yuri Briol do? MC frowned and thought, he looks normal, but in fact, now he is thinking how to match the mood of others. He hasn't changed at all. Gott frowned even more and looked up at MC. Yuri replied, he won't do anything. He needs to control himself. He thought, everything is for him. Gott. This life will not go the same shameful way as the past. Come to think of it, around this time he had a fight with Gott. It was very one-sided. He decided to betray him because he had a grudge against him since that day. After some time in the courtyard, MC said, okay, Gott. He heard he is quite good with a sword. Gott caught the wooden stick and thought, well, he knows a little about them. Yuri shouted, quiet. The kingdom doesn't need weak-willed knights. Gott replied, he's not an official knight. Yuri shouted, wouldn't he be a knight who serves this kingdom? Gott replied, well, yes. Yuri swung the stick and said, then a duel. Gott blocked the blow and said, a surprise attack. How cowardly. MC jumped back and kicked Gott. Gott screamed, the third prince. He's asking him to be noble. MC threw the stick and Gott asked, did he drop his weapon? Yuri quickly rushed at him and kicked him, knocking the stick away. Gott fell to the ground and screamed, and Yuri clutched the stick and held it to his head. He said, Gott Bavar. He thought about it. In his past life, he used his father's honor to sell information to the empire. He said his father is a magnificent count and a respectable knight. Why does he think he has all these titles? What is it for? Gott tried to answer and said, they. MC thought he knows, he just wanted to survive, but this time he will stand firmly on the ground of Briol. Yuri extended his hand and asked, are the questions too difficult? Gott answered, yes, he doesn't quite understand what he means. MC thought, he will not allow dissent from any knight, including himself. He asked, what if he asks such a question? Why is his father a count who gave him this title? Let him try to understand the very essence of the situation. He took his hand to help him up and told him to think about what he said today. God answered, he understood. He got up and started to leave, and Joshua happily said, it was so inspiring. He really fights well. MC asked, did he think he would lose? Joshua answered, yes. Yuri looked at him with displeasure and asked, brother, does he even know who he is? Joshua replied, the worst idiot and swindler that ever existed in the kingdom. MC replied, he's not like that anymore. He should also stop causing trouble. Joshua looked at him in surprise and asked, did he hit his head? After a while, Yuri leaned on his sword and said, done. He fell to the floor and exhaled, and Bernard said, good job. He suggested finishing for today. He turned to the prince and said, I think he's ready to learn about the mana control method. Yuri stood up and asked, will he teach him his control? Bernard replied, no, his isn't that good, considering his potential. He needs to learn the Briol method. MC asked in surprise, why? Bernard replied, it's the best control method. It's quite pure and effective. Yuri thought, in his past life, he learned this method. He was able to master it, but Bernard asked, is he thinking about learning another method? MC replied, he's thinking. He asked Bernard to recommend a knight based on his potential, not his skills. He thought there was one technique he hadn't even tried to learn in his past life. Bernard grinned thoughtfully and said, potential. Based on potential alone, he thought Jared would be a good fit. MC asked again, him? Bernard answered he was strictly based on potential. Yuri spoke up, Jared. Before the regression, he met him only towards the end of the war. He had quite good skills, but he was surprised that he could survive for so long with it. Some time ago, Jared cried out. He was angry. MC asked, at what? His potential was truly special. Jared leaned on his sword and said, he could be much stronger if he trained more, but he didn't sharpen it. And at the time, when the war began, Yuri looked at him and said, that doesn't make sense. They were both still stupid. Presently, MC stood up and dusted himself off, said, okay then, do they need to meet this slacker? He imagined Jared's image and thought it would enlighten him. After a while, he went out to the observation balcony. Rosso turned around and said, Your Highness, what brings you here? Yuri replied, he came to see if everything was all right. Rosso laughed and said, of course, not as good as His Highness, but they were working hard. MC looked around thoughtfully and thought, they looked quite enthusiastic. He asked, where is Jared? Rosso asked again, is he talking about the newbie? There he is. MC looked at him and thought, now he understood what Bernard was talking about. Training should be based on the desire to improve your skills, and he was simply doing exactly as much as necessary. He said, at this rate, he would soon lose ground. Sir Rosso, have him bring him a wooden sword. He will join the sparring. Rosso replied. He understood. Who did he want to spar with? Yuri replied, with that nosy idiot. After a while, the knight shouted, newbie, good luck. Rosso told him to watch his defense. Jared looked at them with displeasure, and MC said, Sir Jared, he had heard that he was quite gifted. Would it be a problem for him to show him what he's made of? Jared replied, yes, of course. Yuri rushed to attack and said, in that case, he hoped he wouldn't disappoint him. Jared quickly parried his attack, and Rosso said, as he thought, Jared, no wasted moves. Someone shouted, His Highness, he's rooting for him. His Highness is quite good, huh? Jared frowned and thought, no, that's very strange. He blocked all of MC's attacks and thought, his movements, they were so unnaturally consistent, as if he was deliberately adjusting to his pace. Yuri smirked and asked, not much fun, huh? It's like they were just playing around. So now, should they get more serious? Jared blocked his punch, and MC thought, he blocked. As he thought, he has animal reflexes. He tried to attack him, but Jared quickly dodged and stepped back. MC clicked his tongue and thought, he wanted to gradually build up the pace. Jared swung and hit Yuri, who thought, nightmare. It didn't work. Even considering his past, Jared is still a pretty good knight. He thought he could beat him, and yet, he looked closely at Jared and swung his sword. He thought, it has to hit him at least once. He hit Jared in the side of the stomach and screamed, that's it. The knight asked, did that attack actually hit him? The guy said, His Highness, he's magnificent. MC asked, he's not being too lenient with him, is he? Jared answered, no. He looked at him and thought, how strange. He attacks, but it feels like he's the one who's driven into a corner. Jared stepped forward and quickly dodged the attack. MC said, what a shame. Jared gripped the hilt of his sword even tighter and thought, that's enough. The knight screamed, Jared? He was covered in mana and everyone screamed, is he crazy? A mana control method? He's sparring with the third prince. He needs to pull himself together. Jared stood up and several strands of hair fell on the floor. MC looked at the frightened Jared in confusion and a scream was heard. His Highness, he's crazy. His Highness, is he okay? Yuri waved his hand and said, everything is fine. Is this their first time seeing sparring? Someone said, but his wound. Yuri tied a rag over his head and told Jared to raise his sword. Now this is really fun. There's no reason to stop now. He rushed to attack and started throwing punches. Jared thought, this prince is different from him. To the limit. No, he's pushing himself beyond his limits. Jared frowned and thought it was like his blood was boiling. He had never felt this before, even when he sparred with stronger opponents. But this young prince, he makes some feeling build inside him. Yuri swung his sword rapidly, trying to hit Jared. He screamed, oh my! He gripped the hilt of his sword, released his mana, and swung. MC's sword, which he had used to block the blow, broke in two and flew off. Yuri exhaled and said, it's the end. Jared looked at him carefully and he said, he realized something, Jared. Jared shook his hand and said, no, it was a good sparring match. He thought he showed a strong determination and perseverance he had never seen before. How could such a young prince do that? MC looked at him questioningly and asked, what is he doing? Jared looked at his hand, which was clutching MC's, and his eyes widened. Yuri asked, what is he doing squeezing his hand like that? He had made the prince bleed, and now he decided to just stand there and do nothing. Jared jerked his hand and asked for forgiveness. He started to run away, and MC said it was just a mistake. He fell to the floor and exhaled loudly. He heard the shouts of the knights, His Highness. He was simply magnificent. The captain entered the training ground, which Rosso noticed. He said, Captain, when did he manage to arrive? The captain of the Betrayal Knights, signed, replied, just now. He looked around and thoughtfully stopped his gaze on MC lying on the floor. A few days later, Jared was walking through the garden when he suddenly heard a voice. His shift is already over, right? He stopped and looked to the side and said, the third prince. Yuri thoughtfully said to go. They need to go somewhere. Jared said, but he needs to train. MC turned around and said, it seems like he has put his thoughts in order now, and all this is thanks to him, so, now he owes him. Jared replied, good. Yuri said, that's great. He smiled and thought, Now he's really putting in the effort, although it is still not enough. But overall, that's enough for now. Jared asked where they were going. Yuri told him to just keep quiet and follow him. Jared said if it was something dangerous. They stopped and Yuri said it was okay. One more person would go with them. Jared asked again, who? MC put his hands to his lips and shouted loudly, Hernando, Royal Mage Briol. Hernando turned around and asked, what's going on here, His Highness? MC replied, they needed to go somewhere. Let him help them. Hernando smiled and said he would be glad to help him, but he had urgent matters. MC said he would forgive his gambling debt. Hernando stopped and asked again, really? Yuri replied, yeah, he will forgive absolutely everything that he lost. Has he ever lied? Hernando folded his arms and said, outside the gambling house, no. Yuri said, exactly. Hernando interrupted him and said, no, he means he's never seen him outside the gambling house. MC wondered if he really was like that. He said, never mind, he'll forgive him the debt, so let him stop talking and follow him. Hernando replied, well, since it comes to that, he wants him to put it in writing. He handed him a piece of paper, and Yuri grabbed his head and thought, what are the words of the third Prince Briol worth? He turned and pointed his finger at Jared. He said, Jared, he vouches for him. He widened his eyes in surprise, and Yuri said, he says he must witness his words, the words of Yuri Briol. Jared replied, he understood him. Hernando smiled and offered to go together then, His Highness. But where exactly are they going with the knight and the mage? Yuri remained silent, and then answered, to the Mountain of Swords. Hernando looked at him puzzled, and MC said that from now on, they were going to rob the progenitor's dungeon. After a while, they walked through the dungeon, and Hernando said that he didn't know there was such a passage under the royal palace. Jared asked, Your Highness, what's at the end of this cave? He answered, it leads straight to Sword Mountain. Jared asked again, Sword Mountain? Is that the place where only legends about the founder remained? Yuri answered, yes. He thought in his past life, after Briol was captured by the Empire, they found a dungeon hidden inside Sword Mountain. He remembered a newspaper headline that said a hidden relic was found on Sword Mountain. It turned out to be the legacy of Briol's founder. Then they made a lot of noise, claiming that they had discovered the legacy of Briol's founder. However, this passage was simply a desperate escape route for him. Because of this, he was unable to claim Briol's legacy, and it fell into the hands of the Empire. But now, compared to the past, when he was just running away, in this life he is tirelessly moving forward, not towards the past, but towards a bright future. True, he will see everything for himself. What legacy did the ancestors leave behind? After a while, they emerged from the cave, throwing open the large doors. Hernando looked around and asked, so, they're on Sword Mountain? But where will they get the key to that door, His Highness? It looks like an artifact. MC thought, it's lying in the corner, just like in his past life. Back then, he didn't even know what it was for, and paid for it. It's not the best memory, he replied. It's none of their business. Hernando caught his hand on a thorny branch and screamed loudly. Yuri turned around and told him to watch out. There are sharp leaves here. They should just follow him and try not to get hurt. He made his way forward, and Hernando watched him. He turned to Sir Jared and asked, did His Highness eat something bad? Jared grinned and answered, apparently, yes. MC turned and shouted, are they coming there? Hernando said, still the same character. Suddenly, Yuri stopped and ordered the guys to do the same. There's a pack of dire wolves. He looked at the creatures from behind the bushes and said, they move in groups. Most likely, there are even more of them here. Jared asked how he figured that out. MC answered, he read it in a book. Hernando's eyes widened in surprise and thought, did he read it in a book? MC said, they didn't notice them. He suggested they quickly pass by. Hernando walked forward and stepped on a branch, causing a loud crack. He laughed sheepishly and asked for forgiveness, and the wolves immediately rushed to attack. Jared shouted, Sir Hernando! He swung his sword and killed the wolf. MC said he knew the dire wolf's fur was quite rough, so he used mana control. Well done, Jared. But now their leader has his eye on them. The huge wolf looked in their direction and howled loudly. Jared clutched his sword and told the two of them not to stray far from him. The wolves opened their fanged mouths and rushed into battle. Jared frowned and quickly attacked them. Hernando said he fought quite well, as expected of the captain of the Briol Knights. MC said, yes, he is truly gifted, but he still has a lot to learn. The wolves continued to approach them, and Jared was becoming visibly worried. MC turned to Hernando and said, it looked like it was time to show off his abilities, which his father believed in so much. Hernando released mana and said that he really puts a battle mage to good use. He released fire mana towards the monsters, and Jared turned around and said, what's so unexpected there? He attacked the wolf and quickly jumped back when he saw a stream of fire flying towards him. There was an explosion, and after a while, Hernando said that he didn't know there would be other monsters there besides dire wolves. Jared said, yeah, that's why they were so late, but now they're finally here. At the top of the Sword Mountain, he looked around and asked, Your Highness, are they really here? There's nothing here, let alone some kind of legacy. Yuri turned around and said, he's absolutely sure it's here. There must be something here. He looked to the side and said, he found it. He leaned over to the bright stone and Jared cried out in fear. His Highness? MC started digging and said, they need to get this thing out. Jared asked Sir Hernando to help them. He replied, but mages can't hurt their hands. After a while, they dug up a sword with a bright hilt, and Yuri said, it doesn't look like the sword that was buried long ago. Hernando said, it's just a new sword. MC read the engraving on the sword. Guilty. Jared asked, well, this sword, is this the founder's legacy? MC replied, he's not quite sure. At that moment, everything started shaking under their feet. MC smirked and said, looks like they're about to find out. Rocks from the mountains started to crumble, and the guys flew down, screaming loudly. They landed on the ground, and MC fell on Jared's body. He asked, did he protect his body with mana control? That's impressive. Hernando looked around and said in surprise, it's much deeper here than he thought. MC frowned and asked, did he not think about protecting the prince at all and protected himself? Hernando laughed and said, it really was urgent. A strange sound was heard behind them, making everyone freeze. Hernando turned around and shouted, Your Highness there! MC said that if he wanted to change the subject, it wouldn't work with him. Hernando screamed, no, there really is! A ghost! Yuri turned around in fear and asked, what? A knight with glowing red eyes was walking towards them. MC thought it was the Death Knight. He frowned and ordered Jared to get up. He kicked him and screamed, he told you to get up. Jared jumped in fear and asked, where are they? He looked at the Death Knight in surprise and shouted, Your Highness, let him move away. He will deal with the Death Knight. Yuri thought, you just need to look at him. He reacted quite quickly. A Death Knight, as his name suggests, is simply a knight who has returned from death. If a knight dies and is reborn as a Death Knight, he becomes stronger than he was in life. However, MC stepped forward and said, it's okay, he's not dangerous. Jared asked how he knew that. Yuri replied, his instincts tell him. It can't be that the knight guarding the ancestor's dungeon would fight him. Yuri Briol, a man with the same bloodline. Don't they think so? The Death Knight grabbed the hilt of the sword, and the guys shouted, Your Highness, be careful. The tip of the sword appeared right in front of him, and then it stuck into the floor. Hernando said in fear, no. The prince's head was cut in two. MC turned around and ordered him to watch his language with displeasure. Hernando said the prince's hair was cut in two. The Death Knight spoke, the same smug demeanor as his. He sheathed the sword, and Yuri asked, who? The knight replied, Eric Briol. Jared said, Eric Briol, that's it. Hernando said, that's the name of the man every Briol resident knows. A swordmaster who conquered the entire continent using only a sword. He is also the progenitor of Briol, the country of knights, and its first king. MC asked, did he come here first? The knight replied, yes. If he is not a descendant of Briol, then he won't be able to lift this sword. Yuri said, that means this is the same unrivaled sword the progenitor used. The knight replied, he used it. He looked at MC, puzzled, and asked, what's with that expression? He looks down on it because he used it. Yuri replied, he just feels guilty because he picked up someone else's thing. The knight replied, a descendant of Briol. Let him state the reason why he came here. MC gripped the hilt of his sword and replied, he, Yuri Briol, the third prince of Briol of this era, and a descendant of Eric Briol. He ordered his legacy to be passed on to him. The knight turned away from him and said, since the time had come, he thought he should complete his mission. He must give him what he wants. MC followed the Death Knight and Jared thought, this can't be. They came to the dungeon of the progenitor of Briol and spoke with the Death Knight. This is not how he imagined the life of a royal knight. MC turned around and cried out, Jared, what is he doing? Jared looked at him in surprise and widened his eyes. He thought, His Highness? MC asked, he's not coming? Jared grabbed his head and thought, it can't be. He was starting to see all sorts of nonsense. He replied, he's coming. The Death Knight stopped near the crystal and sat down next to him. A bright glow illuminated everything around and the knight said, he hopes, he's worth it. Suddenly, MC moved and looked around. He asked, where is he? He saw a silhouette in front of him and asked, is he the ancestor? No, wait. This is not a person. The silhouette with a sword rushed towards him and swung it. Yuri thought, this is a method of mana control. The silhouette pressed his chest, where a round glow appeared. The silhouette's sword began to cover with mana, and Yuri thought, a way to use mana, it is showing him the basics. The silhouette pointed at itself, and MC asked, does it want him to repeat it during the battle? Yuri laughed and grabbed his head. MC thought his ancestor really was crazy to train someone in the method of mana control when he hasn't even learned it yet, and especially during a fight. Only someone who is living their second life can do this. Yuri said, like this. He crouched down on the ground and released mana. He looked at his hand and said something like that. He cried out and said he didn't fully understand everything, but he was ready to try it in a real fight. The silhouette smiled, and Yuri thought he needed to become stronger. In the near future, the Empire would show its greed and capture Briol. He swung his sword and thought he would do everything possible to destroy them. He would not repeat his past mistakes. Yuri said Eric Briol's sword skills. He swung his sword and said he would make it his own. He attacked the silhouette, who dodged in surprise. At that moment, Jared opened his eyes and looked around, where he saw a training ground. He asked, is this a training room? This is not a dream. He screamed loudly, where is he hiding? Let him come out. He turned around sharply and saw his double, thought, a doppelganger? Are these the Death Knight trials? He frowned and asked, what is his name? Is he also Jared? The clone replied, Jared, no need to fight fate. Jared frowned and asked, what? The clone asked if he hadn't become a knight to live a comfortable life, he should stay away from the third prince. He would be unhappy if he continued to fight fate. Jared exhaled and thought he would agree with him if he were the past, but such a show. He smirked and asked, doesn't he understand what he's talking about because he's not real? He can't turn back time and prevent what he did. Thinking about what he did only distracts him. The clone frowned and, releasing mana along the sword, said, the answer is incorrect. He rushed to attack, and Jared thought how predictable the attack was. He uses the sword, focusing it on defense, to avoid all possible risks. He pushed off the floor and thought, the last one really was? Jared smirked and said, it was boring. He swung his sword and screamed, terrifying. He hit the clone with the sword and saw how it began to dissolve. Jared's eyes widened in surprise and looked at it. The creature began to melt, and then increase in size. Jared looked at the creature that appeared in front of him and said, well, of course, the second phase. He thought the clone's size was truly astounding. The prince is most likely also in the heat of battle now. He asks not to lose. Prince! Jared gripped the hilt of the sword and prepared to attack. At that moment, Yuri was sitting near a huge stone and the silhouette was approaching him. It released mana onto the sword and swung it, followed by an explosion. The silhouette swung the sword, but Yuri noticed it and reached for the sword's hilt. He gripped it tightly and swung the sword. He frowned and sharply pushed the silhouette back, followed by a bright explosion of mana. The silhouette stopped, and Yuri rose from the ground and exhaled. He wondered how much time had passed. He remembered a fragment of the battle and thought it was a little dangerous. Questions about how he should use the mana control method and how he should swing the sword. Thanks to the tireless battle, he thinks the mana has finally begun to gradually stabilize. MC looked in surprise at the silhouette whose sword had crumbled. He thought it began to gradually evaporate. The silhouette waved at him and disappeared, and Yuri smiled slightly and said, it seems the time has come. He thanked the silhouette and himself was transported from this space. After a while, MC opened his eyes and looked around. Hernando asked, Sir Jared, how is he? He replied, yes, he's fine. The Death Knight said it seems they had a pretty good dream. MC asked, what was that? The knight replied, it was Eric's order. Something he left to the heir of Briol who would come one day. Yuri thought, in his past life, the Sword Mountain was destroyed by the Empire, to the point that no one from Briol could reach it. MC asked, did the progenitor also use a method of mana control? The Death Knight replied, no. Eric learned it during his journey to the Eastern Lands in his later years. This is his final legacy, created from the culmination of all his knowledge. He is his first successor. Yuri asked, why did all this pass to him and not to the royal family? The Death Knight replied, this dungeon only opens at the right time. When this dungeon opens, it means the time has come to use this power. MC asked, what time is he talking about? The knight replied, he can't answer that. He has to find out for himself. MC looked closely at the sword and asked, what is the name of this method of mana control? The knight replied, he called it a strike to the heart and soul. Yuri spoke, a strike to the heart and soul. The knight told Yuri Briol to kneel. He must give the progenitor's legacy to the descendant of Briol. MC knelt before the knight, and he placed his hand on his head. He told him not to fear his enemies. MC replied, yes. The knight told him to do what he believes in. Yuri replied, yes. The knight said, to the very end, let him fulfill his duty to Briol. MC replied, yes. The knight grabbed him by the hair and told him to keep in mind, Briol do not neglect honor, even in death. Such is the oath of Briol. Yuri looked at him carefully, and after a while in the castle, Aina opened the windows in the room and said, Your Highness, good morning. MC sighed loudly and stood up, and Aina asked, is he tired? He came very late yesterday. He looks like he's gonna fall asleep the moment he lays down on the pillow. Yuri stretched and replied that he simply went to the royal library last night. Anna asked why he suddenly decided to go to the library. MC replied that he wanted to find some records. According to the royal family tree records found in the library, Eric Briol had a brother, a man who disappeared from the annals of history and left no name behind because he renounced his honor. MC wondered if he must have been that Death Knight and the true master of that sword. Ina said, His Highness, he needs to get dressed quickly. His Majesty is looking for him. MC stood up and asked why. Ina replied that she didn't know, but after meeting Sir Hernando, he asked him to come. Yuri closed his eyes and frowned, thinking, Hernando, that guy. He remembered his words, His Highness. He will report to His Majesty about everything that happened today. MC turned around and asked, Is this necessary? Hernando smiled and answered, Yes, at least he thought so. Currently, MC grabbed his head and thought, it seems he reported absolutely everything. After a while, Yuri entered the hall and approached Fiore. He said, he called him, Father. Fiore answered, yes. He learned something from Hernando. Not only did he leave the palace of his own free will yesterday, but he also found the progenitor's dungeon on the Sword Mountain. Yuri answered, that's how it was. Fiore asked, did he find this sword in that dungeon? MC answered, yes. Fiore rose from the throne and said, recently he heard a lot about how he has changed a lot. From his maid Bernard, Sinda, and even from Hernando. Let him speak. Let him tell what changed him so much. Yuri remained silent and grabbed the hilt of the sword. Fiore looked at him and asked, does he not want to? MC answered, not quite. Fiore asked, then why was he retreating? MC replied, because he, the father, was clenching his fist. Fiore asked again, because of this? He ordered them to speak immediately. Yuri answered, he had a dream. Fiore asked again, a dream? MC replied, yes, and in that dream he committed a terrible sin. Fiore asked again, a terrible sin, he says. Yuri, Briol, what sin did he commit in his dream? Yuri replied that it was failing to save Briol. Fiore became wary and frowned. Yuri continued to explain that in his dream, Briol was part of a great war in which many innocent people died, and he tried to save Briol, but he failed. The kingdom fell, and he fled indifferently, and ultimately, he died. He woke up from this dream and realized that the necklace his mother had given him was missing. He wondered if this dream had been a warning from his mother. Fiore paused and asked him what had destroyed the kingdom in his dream. He replied that it had, but at that moment, he fell silent and thought that it was too early to talk about the empire. And besides, there was a chance that the empire would not attack, since he was changing the past. After these thoughts, he replied that he wasn't entirely sure, but there was a dark army there that he didn't know. Fiore grinned and then said, well, it could have been a regular nightmare or a warning from Lily, but he's glad he pulled himself together. The protagonist wondered if he'd pulled himself together. He was just trying to atone for all his sins. At that moment, his father decided they needed to clarify something. Yuri looked at him questioningly, raising his gaze, and his father told him to pick up his sword. Fiore Briol is a genius who has wielded a sword since birth. He holds many titles. He earned a name on this continent with his incredible skills. He is ranked among the top 10 on the continent and is considered the strongest of those 10. Simply put, he is the strongest swordsman on the continent, someone no one would dare look down on. Yuri was startled and replied that this was his first time in his father's training room. Fiore replied that he didn't think any of his sons had talent with a sword. Yuri replied that he thought he was an exception, and at that moment his father exhaled and replied, talent, before extending his sword and pressing the tip to his son's chest. He asked, what is talent for a swordsman? Is it strength, speed, reflexes, or outstanding intellect? If a person possesses all of these, can they become the strongest knight? The protagonist pondered his words, and Fiore replied, that's not quite right. At that moment, Yuri was stunned and surprised. His father continued to say that more important than the things that appear on the surface is what can drive a person to surpass their human limits. Something that transcends crisis or a sense of duty. At that moment, his eyes lit up with a bright magical light, and Yuri froze and thought, wait, what's around him? His father returned the sword to its place and replied that he himself didn't know what it was called. It was something like the sword's call. Yuri was stunned by what he heard, and when he drew his sword, he asked, is this destiny? He replied that it was possible, perhaps so. When Yuri looked at his sword more closely, he considered that in his past life he had not followed the path of the sword. But what now? Fiore asked. What was he thinking, son? Should he hold the sword? Did he hear the sword calling him? When death approaches, did he still hold on to his sword? Fiore considered his words, then frowned and replied that he felt nothing. When he looked up at his father, he glared menacingly, and Fiore became terrified and rolled back, asking what was happening. When he looked around, he saw a multitude of magical eyes enveloping him. His mouth dropped open in shock and suddenly heard a cry that they needed to run. The train must leave here. He continued to listen to the cry for rescue, when suddenly someone exclaimed, Prince Yuri! He saw before him a bright fiery flame that rose stronger and stronger above the palace. A battle raged around the palace, and the knights fought until blood flowed. When he found himself in the past, he wondered what was happening. Looking around, he asked why Briol was on fire. Someone exclaimed, there he is, the third prince. They found the last prince of Briol. He was terrified, and the knights were approaching him. It was the Empire's army, which made Yuri wonder what was happening. When he looked at his hands, he realized that he had returned to the past again, to the time of Briol's fall. Flames continued to rage everywhere, and he didn't understand what it was. The knights screamed at him to die and attacked from all sides. Yuri noticed this and gritted his teeth in anger, then began to fight the attacking knight. He held on with all his might and attacked the knight so hard that blood spilled from his chest. At that moment, he heard someone shouting, Lord Prince, they will hold them off. He must run away from here now. Lord, he asks that he run away from here. The protagonist looked around and watched the battle unfold. The knights fought for their lord, and Yuri wondered if it had all been just a dream. Was Briol destined to fall, powerless? As he touched the pavement with his blade, he muttered that he couldn't stop it and lowered his gaze, along with his sword. Enraged knights approached him, ready to destroy him, and he realized he had sworn an oath never to fear his enemies. Therefore, he would do what he believed in, fulfilling his duty to Briol to the very end, as he had been commanded. At that moment, he raised his sword above himself and continued the battle, slaughtering all the surrounding and attacking knights, destroying them with a single blow. Their blood spilled on his face, but he did not give up and continued to fight. With one hand, he blocked the attack of an attacking knight and groaned with fatigue before grabbing his sword and destroying the knight, plunging it straight into his throat. As the knights collapsed around him, he exhaled and grinned. He heard a cry that Prince Briol was dead. Yuri looked around and saw the knights approaching again, shouting for him to surrender. He grew angry and declared that Briol did not disdain their honor even in death. After these words, he raised raised his sword in front of him and, pushing off sharply, realized he would fight to the very end. Leaping high above the knights, who looked up in shock, he knew he would fulfill his duty to Betrayal. And so the battle continued. After a while, Yuri returned to his real life and realized with a smile that he would do this to the very end. When he stepped outside, he turned to a man and asked if he wanted him to teach him the art of the progenitor sword. It was Bernard, who was very interested. Yuri scratched his head and apologized, as it would be extremely difficult. Although he understood that this was quite logical, given the name of the sword demon. Bernard replied that it was fine, even if he hadn't fully mastered it. He'd already foreseen that. Yuri replied that he was right, but he was trying to say that it wouldn't help him. At that moment, he drew his sword and said that this swordsmanship was related to a method of mana control. As he held the sword in front of him, a bright blue aura appeared around it and spread everywhere. Bernard chuckled and replied that they were one and the same. It was the first time he'd heard that. Mana control is usually used to enhance swordsmanship. At that moment, Yuri closed his eyes and said that's why he said it would be difficult for them. Besides, the method itself was only half learned. When Bernard thought about it, he snapped back that it was good. Yuri's mouth dropped open in shock and he asked, "Is he seriously saying that?" Bernard bowed his head and replied that it was fine, even if he had only half learned the method. In exchange, he would stay in Betrayal. He placed his hand on his chest and continued his speech, saying that even if he hadn't fully studied it, there would be parts he could understand. The protagonist considered this insane confidence in his heart and smiled. After this, he said, "Okay, in that case, he'll stay in Betrayal as promised, right?" He answered, "Okay." Bernard then turned around and asked again, turning sharply, "Would you like to demonstrate this?" He replied, "Okay, he'll show you everything." He cast a spell that struck Yuri Betrayal's heart and soul. Bernard suddenly mentioned that he'd forgotten to tell him something. This unsettled Yuri, who was dumbfounded, until Bernard suddenly said mockingly that he'd originally planned to stay in Betrayal. This greatly surprised the protagonist, who hadn't expected to hear this. Bernard continued saying that His Majesty had said they would be here together for at least another 10 years. Yuri asked, "What?" He wanted to say that, but before he could finish the sentence, Bernard asked again, "He's not going to attack him?" Bernard continued, saying that in that case, he'd strike first. At that moment, a magical aura also formed around his sword, and he lunged at the protagonist, who grew angry, his entire body trembling. He gripped his sword even tighter and asked, "Why are you only talking about this now?" At that moment, he became so enraged that he lunged at his opponent with a blow. Bernard countered the attack, and their swords clashed. Sometime later, evening fell, and Yuri lay down on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He thought about how everything was changing. In this future, Betrayal won't be destroyed because of his mistake. Although no special measures were taken, the fact that Bernard decided to stay in Betrayal proves it. The changes in the future seem so vague and uncertain to him, but little by little, it's definitely changing. But that's not all. This time, he must stop the Empire. When he clenched his fist, he realized it was infallible. He must do it without making a single mistake. Suddenly, he noticed a rustle at the side of the room, and the maid, Anna, entered. He looked at her questioningly, and she said, "Infallibly, he must avoid trouble." The protagonist stood up abruptly and asked, "Was there anything else on the schedule?" Anna replied that he caused trouble every day and therefore didn't even know what she was talking about, right? She said that because he had a meeting scheduled for tomorrow. He asked in surprise, "A meeting?" Anna confirmed that it was a meeting of the elders. His Majesty said that this time they were obliged to attend. Hadn't he heard about this? Yuri was surprised and came to his senses, then grabbed his head and scratched it in bewilderment. Anna replied that he needed to leave the next morning and that most of the elders would be present at this meeting. She grabbed his hand and said with a distressed look that there would definitely be stubborn and scary people there, but he should absolutely not start a fight. Yuri asked her not to worry and replied that he wouldn't do that. Was that really what she was worried about? She asked him again, "Is that true? Does he promise?" He replied that he had already told her about it, so she shouldn't worry. Sometime later, a new day dawned, and many people gathered around a long conference table. One of the dukes slammed his fist on the table and shouted, "No!" Yuri looked at him with displeasure and realized that she was right. Objections began right from the start of the meeting. It was Duke Genard who spoke with displeasure. "Your Highness, he shouldn't be studying an unverified method of mana control." Yuri understood that all the members of the Council of Elders were gathered here, and in general, the governance of the kingdom was usually discussed here. But this place had long since become a platform for struggles for the throne. Now he understood why his father hadn't attended such meetings in the past. Genard continued to say that it would be better for him to temporarily study the Betrayal method than to study some obscure method. Another member of the meeting asked what he was even talking about. An unverified method? It's the progenitor's legacy. He asked how he could be sure it was the progenitor's legacy. The Duke shouted back, had he just doubted the prince's words? Genard smiled and replied that he was trying to say that they must be sure of everything. Wasn't this meeting called because they were all worried about the prince's future? Yuri replied that they even held a meeting of elders to discuss his control method. He is very flattered, Duke Genard. At that moment, he folded his arms and grinned. How shameful. He was the one who first bowed his head to the empire after Betrayal fell. Back then, as now, He always knew how to choose his words. At that moment, Gennard replied, "Okay, Sir Signed, what does he think about this?" After a long silence, Signed replied that he was in no mood to make hasty judgments. They asked him again why he said that. He replied that every method of mana control has its pros and cons, and every person has their own unique traits. Gennard rose from his seat and shouted, "Let them just listen. The son of the Knight Captain in Betrayal says he's not sure about this method of control. It's a deception. That's a very good reason. He thinks it's best to forget about this method." The other Duke continued, saying that Sir Sign didn't say he wasn't sure about this method. He simply meant that every method is valuable in its own way. A close associate of Gennard's shouted that it was the same thing. The Duke was worried that this mana control method could harm the prince. At that moment, the other members of the assembly exchanged glances, and the protagonist noticed this and realized that everything was bad. The members of the assembly decided to confirm this thought, that they also thought so, and agreed with him. Yuri realized that the situation had changed dramatically. If he studied the control method for a short time, it was possible to completely alter the core's operation. But due to his experience fighting in the illusion and the progenitor, the blow to his heart and soul was already deeply ingrained in his core, and he couldn't even explain it. What should he do now? At that moment, one of the people present smiled and said that he knew how to choose his words. Everyone turned to him, as did Yuri, and people asked what he had just said. The man raised his hand and apologized, but he wanted to ask one question. Has anyone here ever fought an orc in their lives? It was Free Lord Calcio Aaron. The meeting participants began to mutter and whisper among themselves. Suddenly, Gennard asked who he was and what his title was. Aaron rose from his seat and replied that his name was Calcio Aaron. He bowed and declared himself a free lord. At that moment, Gennard asked again, "Baron? But how dare a mere baron attend the Council of Elders?" He replied that he himself hadn't wanted to come, but he had nothing better to do. At that moment, he concluded that Duke Saindor had entrusted this to him. Yuri paused. "Duke Saindog. He is definitely the Margrave guarding the borders of Betrayal. As befits his title, he is a lord guarding the borders, as well as the entire front line. He is known as a true soldier who has spent his entire life on the battlefield. He is also known for being completely uninterested in the affairs of the nobility, so what prompted him to attend the meeting of the representative elders?" At that moment, one of the dukes spoke up. Why did Duke Saindog send him to the meeting of elders? He replied that he was a man of few words. But seeing how the appointed nobles played their political games here and indulged in pointless arguments, he understood why the Margrave had sent him here. In a real battle, the type of mana control method matters little, whether it's the Betrayal method or the Imperial Lionheart art. Ultimately, everything depends on the person using them. His Highness, what does he think of this? Yuri replied that, as Prince Betrayal, he didn't quite understand why there was such a heated debate here about whether he would master the progenitor's mana control method. No matter what they said, he would learn the progenitor's method either way. So, the prince, a swordsman, decided to follow in the name of the progenitor and the mana control method. So why do people with no authority or responsibility continue to interfere in the prince's affairs? But usually, such a fuss comes from people sitting behind a desk and never having held a sword in their lives. Gennard frowned and replied, "Free Lord, you speak very rashly." Aaron replied that he apologized for his rudeness, but he couldn't help it. He was an ordinary warrior, fighting orcs on the border every day. He'd mentioned this before, but could anyone tell him who among those present had fought an orc? There was an awkward silence in the office, and he asked again, did they think the orcs would care what mana control method their opponents used? Everyone remained silent, until one of them suddenly said he was right, and yet his highness was very young, so it was up to him to decide. Before he could finish, Yuri suddenly spoke up. Were they really saying he should change his mana control method at all costs, because he'd made the wrong decision? He replied that, if necessary, he would do so. When Yuri suddenly snapped that he was saying such things, knowing full well it was no longer possible. Aaron added that in any case, he didn't think His Majesty would change anything, or were they planning to forcibly extract his core? At that moment, all the dukes started shouting, "What is he talking about?" He chuckled and replied that he didn't think they would. So what was the point of all this arguing? Besides, he assumed His Majesty agreed with this, right? Yuri exchanged glances and smiled at him. They were all just sitting there, ruining His Highness's sanity. The royal palace really was a peaceful place. Gennard became very angry, clenched his teeth in anger, and shouted, "He said peaceful? How rude. How could he say such a thing, when the Margrave himself had been keeping a low profile lately after receiving the budget?" Aaron asked again. So hundreds of people have to die before he realizes that these are turbulent times? He must not have seen or heard reports of soldiers dying daily. The day he left Mark County, 4 people died, and he personally buried a friend with whom he'd been close and had breakfast every day. Orcs never rest, Mr. Nobleman, and they spend their entire lives fighting and killing. At that moment, the boys frowned and thought. The protagonist also thought about the orcs, and realized that, if you think about it, it was around this time that a problem arose between Betrayal and the Klein Principality. Around this time, orcs began repeatedly crossing the border and causing enormous damage. Had the orcs' behavior changed somehow? After some time, they began to discuss how the orcs had become much more sinister than before, And how were things with Klein? At this point, Aaron became wary and asked again. What? Yuri replied. Isn't the Klein army involved? Aaron suggested that border guards had intervened. He asked again. What about the border village? He replied that it was completely enslaved, some people died, some became slaves, and the situation was at a stalemate. The protagonist frowned and realized that everything was happening exactly as before. Was there a civil war or not? At this point, he wondered out loud if the Duke's third child was involved. Everyone around him was stunned by what he'd just said, and looked at him in bewilderment. Yuri realized this, and, clearing his throat, said he thought he'd had enough conversations for today. Jannard asked again. Enough, but His Highness. He was about to object, when Yuri suddenly replied that they had more important matters to discuss than his mana control method. For example, they should discuss defense against the Klein Principality and the Orcs. Jannard grew even more angry and continued to say that it was time to stop interfering in the affairs of a child going through puberty. Sometime later, evening arrived. Aaron was discussing the events with Saindog through a magic ball. He asked, "So that's what the third prince said?" Aaron replied, "Yes, rumors are spreading that he's changed a lot." Saindog asked, "What did he think about it?" He recalled Yuri's words. "Isn't the Klein Principality's army participating in this?" He smiled and said that he wasn't so bad after all. Saindog suggested they keep an eye on him and let Aaron observe him, and keep a close eye on him. Aaron remarked that at first glance, he didn't seem out of the ordinary. Should he look into his background? Saindog replied that he should do so if necessary. Aaron rose from his seat and replied that he would do so if Saindog added that he would contact him again soon. After these words, he disappeared. And Aaron looked out the window and remarked how calm he was, even considering the many soldiers dying at the border every day. When he looked more closely at what was happening outside, he realized it was the third prince in a cloak walking past him. He frowned, confused, and then suddenly said, "No, of course not." In fact, Yuri had sneaked out of the palace just like him and asked Hernando. He thought this was so heartbreaking, because when he was a child, he used to run away from home as often as he breathed. Yuri asked again, "Does he mean he's used to sneaking out?" He replied that he was something of a troublemaker, having been a rather troubled child. He said that young lady was staring at them. Did he think she realized who they were? He asked again, "Why is he so disheveled? He could leave the palace whenever he wanted." He replied that for him it was nothing more than a stroll, but when he was with him, he couldn't help but think he was starting a riot. So what were they planning to do? Was it going to be something indecent? Yuri turned around and replied, "No, even if he was planning to do something indecent, he wouldn't have taken him along." Hernando became upset and said he was upset. But His Highness, where were they going anyway? Yuri, with a smile on his face, replied that they were going to the casino, the most illegal casino in the capital. Hernando was stunned by what he heard and asked again, but he had said they wouldn't do anything bad. He replied that they wouldn't, so just let him take him there. He knows the way, right? Hernando replied that when he gets drunk, he goes there instead of home. But before he could finish this thought, Yuri suddenly turned to him and said that he would tell him in advance, all for Briol's sake. Hernando was stunned and said just not to tell him about it. How much had he prepared? As expected, he had thought everything through to the smallest detail. After these thoughts, he said that he would fulfill His Majesty's request and was glad that he himself was involved. He proposes to turn the casino upside down. In his past life, there were several people in Briol that many people talked about. This was the boss, who was a major loan shark and ran the entire criminal underworld, and also the best on the continent, a giant in the world of trade, and another girl, the one who beheaded a crime boss and terrorized all of Briol. She was no ordinary assassin, and one of those who died at her hands was him, the current major loan shark. It was a man named Goryo. At that moment, Goryo bowed, clutching his chest and saying he couldn't believe such a nobleman would decide to deal with them. Yuri replied that it seemed he already knew who they were. At that moment, Hernando asked him, frightened, "What?" Goryo replied with a smile, "Of course, it's the king's mage and the third prince himself. His power may be limited, but at least someone has to take responsibility, right?" Yuri replied that it was a reasonable decision, but he hadn't come here to play games and have fun. Goryo grinned and looked at him curiously, then asked if they should sit down and talk. He pointed towards the tables, and moments later they joined one of them. Hernando tensely whispered in his ear that he'd said he wouldn't play, but he hadn't told him that. Yuri told him to keep quiet. Goryo joined their table and said he'd heard they weren't there to play. In that case, perhaps they'd come to borrow some money? He replied that was correct. He wanted to borrow money and invest it. Goryo grinned and replied that he planned to start his own charity. And since he was borrowing money from him and not the bank, that meant the prince had big ambitions, right? At that point, the protagonist replied, "Enough. It's not his place to interrogate him," and smiled. Goryo bowed and asked for forgiveness for that, as he'd like to apologize. Yuri replied that it was fine. After all, he was the one who came there to borrow money. They decided to get to the point, and Goryo asked if he'd tell them why he needed the money. He replied that he planned to use the money to buy magrange, a spice from the Klein region. demand for it would soon increase. Hernando was very surprised and asked again what he was doing. Goryo laughed a little and replied that Magranja is used to make high-quality spices, but he wasn't sure it was worth it. Yuri replied that everything would soon be as he said. At that moment, the mage thought he heard that a war had broken out in the Klein Principality and that orcs were roaming everywhere, but he didn't think the price of spices would rise significantly because of this. He simply wanted to buy the Klein Principality's spices in advance. Goryo saw a strange look on the protagonist's face and realized that Yuri Briol was different from those rumors. Moreover, it seemed he was acting not only on the information he had just revealed. At that moment, he wanted to settle the issue of the amount, and Yuri told him that as an investor, not a prince, how much money was he willing to lend him. At that moment, their conversation continued for some time when Goryo suddenly grabbed the table and announced that he was proposing a contract. At that moment, Yuri smiled back. Sometime later, as they left the establishment, the mage revealed that Goryo had indeed lent him money, a fair amount at that. The protagonist read the written contract, crumpled the paper, and put it in his pocket. Hernando said, "This is too much, Your Highness." Yuri turned and asked, couldn't he have at least told him about this beforehand? He really wasn't planning on playing, was he? Yuri replied that if he had told him everything, he would have taken him to his father right away, wouldn't he? Hernando made a disgruntled face and then asked, "Are they heading to the trading floor now?" Yuri replied, "Yes, he wants them to do something. In fact, Magrange is guaranteed to be profitable, and the only alchemist who knows the recipe, Duke Klein's attending physician, will die in the coming war. It's a product that won't have a fixed price, at least until a replacement is found. He can't trust anyone with this." So he arrived at an abandoned house where the light was on. He and the mage looked at this in surprise, and Yuri announced that they were there. Hernando was startled and asked again, "What? You meant that crumbling place?" Hernando pointed, when suddenly Yuri approached the entrance and opened the door. He shouted, "Ilian Wood, is he there?" Hernando was terrified and asked His Highness to wait, as they could entrust this to a large firm. When the girl emerged from the house, she asked who was there. It was Ilian Wood. The protagonist introduced himself and said that he was the third prince of Briol, and he wanted her to do something. Ilian asked in surprise, "A prince?" He offered her his hand, and after a while, Hernando asked, "His Highness, have you lost your mind?" Yuri replied with a displeased expression that he wouldn't tell him anything. Hernando continued, saying that anyone who saw him now would say the same thing. He entrusted the purchase of Magranda to some crumbling company. The sum was considerable, after all. Yuri thought she was a merchant in a declining company, but very soon, Ilian would become the greatest merchant, and unlike Goryo, full of honor and praise, who resorted to all sorts of dirty tricks, she kept her promises to clients as if protecting their lives. Besides, she was a legendary merchant in his past life, and he would make her a mythical merchant who would surpass all legends. Hernando asked, "He's finished for today, right?" Yuri pointed sharply upward and said no, they still had one more thing to do. Hernando, frightened, asked, "What?" A moment later, he shouted at the protagonist again, "No, Your Highness. Where are they going?" Yuri didn't respond and walked silently, thinking about how the major underworld merchants were all willing to help him, and that there was only one thing left to do. When he reached a dark place, he passed a distressed man sitting on the ground in torn and dirty clothes. Around him were many similar beggars, arguing among themselves and shouting incessantly. When Yuri found himself in such a neighborhood, he thought he was sure this was it, and a moment later, he found what he needed. In the distance, he saw several girls and greeted them. They turned around, and he announced that his name was Yuri Briol, the third prince of Briol. The girl, hearing this, turned around and asked, "Prince?" He replied, "Yes." He understood that this was the assassin who had mercilessly killed Goryo and survived the assassin academy. Her name was Asana. She turned in his direction and looked at His Highness in surprise. After that, she asked why he was there. He said she could calm down. He'd simply decided to stop during his patrol to make a small donation to those in need. She looked at him silently, when suddenly, Yuri turned to the mage and asked him to give it to her. His whole body shook and he became nervous, but he still handed him the bag of jewels. The protagonist noticed a little girl hiding behind her and he asked, "Is that her?" In his past life, she borrowed an obscene amount of money from Goryo to cure this child. Just like everyone else who borrowed from him, she fell into debt, and that's when the legendary assassin was born, and he desperately wants to change that. He asked her to use the money to cure the girl at the temple. Asana accepted the bag and asked what he wanted in return. He asked again, what does he want? He only wanted one thing. He, Yuri Briol, the third prince of Briol, let her remember that name. After these words, he turned and walked toward the exit. Hernando caught up with him and asked why he decided to give this money to the homeless. He replied that it was an investment. Now everyone he needed was connected to his destiny, but he needed one more person. And when he turned to Hernando, he said he had one question for him. He asked, "What?" The protagonist asked, what did he see in the ancestor's dungeon? After a brief silence, Hernando smiled and replied that it was a gamble. Yuri asked, "What?" He replied that he had played the game of life in the Empire, at the Basregas casino. Yuri considered that this suited him well, and then decided to tell him that regarding what happened today, he should be careful. With these words, he slapped him on the chest as a sign of friendship and smiled. Sometime later, they returned home, and a new day dawned. Fior let Hernando into his office, who approached him closer. Fior said that he heard that he had been on patrol with Yuri last night. He answered yes, and his father asked him to tell him what happened. Hernando replied that the prince had told him to leave the palace with him, and they had gone to the casino, the largest casino in the city. The king asked if Yuri had played there. He confidently answered yes, they had. Fior asked again. Yes, he thought he was good at card games, but it turned out he wasn't, and he ended up losing all the money he had given him. His father asked again, what happened next? Hernando thought for a moment and realized that he had given the money he had borrowed from Goryo to the unknown merchant, and he had also given a lot of money to an orphan he had never seen before. He had been walking around and observing how ordinary citizens lived. Because of this, he decided to say that he was interested in their way of life. And Fior asked, and then they returned to the palace, right? Hernando bowed and answered, yes. After that they returned, and that was it. Fior thought for a moment. Just like that, he silently looked at the floor and pondered, then asked Hernando if he would attend the ball. He smiled and replied, yes, after which Fior thought he was saying he wasn't interested. He smiled and replied that human desire is fickle, and he hadn't danced in a long time. Sometime later, a new day dawned, and the protagonist continued to fight Saint in the arena. He fell to the ground and thought for a moment, then pointed to the side and said that Bernard was quite popular. He asked again, yes. Yuri replied that the maids were staring at him. He should go to the ball, and he thought there were people who would like to see him there. Bernard replied with a frown that he wasn't interested. Besides, what he said about swordsmanship, it seems he was right, Your Highness. This sword has no specific form. Yuri rose from his seat and replied, yes, the movement of this sword is like a flow. Bernard continued to say that mana control, which is also a form of swordsmanship, is something he couldn't learn on his own. He needed to see it in real combat to learn more. It turned out not to be so easy. Incidentally, his students had improved quite a bit, and he had an exceptional talent for mana manipulation. He was surprised to see how well he was handling it. Yuri looked at his sword and thought he felt guilty now, as he'd tried to erase traces of the Betrayal method he'd learned in his past life to experiment, but it had only intensified his feelings. Bernard replied that he needed to slow down a bit, but he was worried. Yuri asked again, was he worried? He replied, yes, it felt like he was rushing. He'd already achieved a lot for his age, but his body wasn't strong enough yet. Yuri smiled and told him not to worry, as he'd figure that out later. He offered to begin the next round, and Bernard asked in surprise, are you sure? Yuri replied, of course. At that moment, he tossed one sword aside and told him to use a real sword this time, as he needed to get stronger. Bernard also threw down his wooden sword and said he understood. And Yuri proposed a bet. He'd go to the ball if he could hit it at least once. At that moment, Bernard sharply replied, no, and Yuri asked again, why? He said he'd win either way, and he never kept his promises. He was known as the last person to argue with, and Yuri was upset about this, then told him to watch. After these words, magical power formed around him and his sword, and an aura began to spread everywhere. Suddenly, a bright flash of light occurred, and he decided to prove him wrong. Their swords clashed, and that day, he failed to hit it even once. A few days later, the day of the ball began. Many chariots arrived at the palace to attend. In one of them sat a young man and a girl. The man said that she truly couldn't take her eyes off the beauty here. It was the second prince of the empire, Georg Ivarna Granzian. He turned to Katerina, who was a little nervous because she hadn't been here for so long. Besides, she really wanted to meet someone. After a while, Ina asked, how does he like it, His Highness? He tried on a new suit and replied that it was a bit too much. It looked a bit chaotic because of the many accessories, and that she should please take it off. Ina replied that she really liked it. He used to like that kind of thing. Had his preferences already changed? A moment later, she replied that everything was ready, His Highness, and he addressed her by name, after which he asked if she would dance with him. She turned around at him, startled, and asked again, what? He offered her his hand and said he'd like to practice, but he didn't have a partner, so he was offering it to her. She asked again, should she do it? Yuri was surprised. What was that expression on her face? When they held hands, she said he was trying to step on her foot or trip her. He replied, no, he wasn't trying to play a prank on her. Suddenly, they were facing each other very close, and he asked her to follow him slowly. At that moment, she became extremely shy and couldn't react to what was happening. At that moment, Aina asked, His Highness, is he interested in her? She was a very good dancer. He asked again, has she danced a lot? But with whom? She replied that he might not say so at first glance, but she was quite popular, and it was the first time she had such a small partner. He told her to just watch, because the height difference shouldn't be a problem. By the way, Ina, she just stepped on his foot. She apologized and said she'd slipped, and at that moment she stepped on his foot again. And Ina, smiling, replied that she'd simply made a mistake. After a while, the musicians began performing new pieces, and the ball began in the enormous hall. The partners began dancing to the music, and Fior watched from the sidelines, sitting on a throne and sipping a glass of alcoholic wine. He watched Yuri's behavior as he chatted with passing men. Yuri, meanwhile, looked carefully ahead and realized that Duke Signdog had also arrived. As expected, he was very different from the average knight. Only Baron Aaron had come to the last meeting. He watched him closely when suddenly his brother approached him. Yuri Yuri asked if he had been having problems with his eyes lately. He had begun wearing his glasses more often. He replied that it wasn't so bad that he needed to worry about it. At that moment, a loud sound erupted, and the gates to the hall swung open. George entered with a confident expression and approached the king himself. He shook his hand and thanked him for coming to this humble place. George was grateful for his hospitality and announced that he had come today with his younger sister. When he pointed to her, Yuri was stunned by what he saw. Katerina, whom he remembered from his past life. He realized he could not betroth her and would never make the same mistake as in the past. He noticed her gaze on him. She was incredibly beautiful. After a while, everyone in the hall was chatting among themselves, and Yuri noticed Katerina. He mused that, as expected of his brother Cedric, he treated people with respect, and that this was the makings of a good king. In comparison, he was nothing like that. At that moment, he saw Katerina pass by him and look him in the eye. He greeted her, when suddenly she turned her attention to his brother. He clutched his head, wondering if he still had feelings, even though he knew it would end badly. Suddenly, Ina approached him and asked if he wanted a cookie. He thanked her for working so hard, and she replied that it cost her nothing. He asked again, "It's hard, right?" She replied, "No, compared to cleaning up the mess some people leave behind every day." But before she could finish, Yuri replied that it didn't matter, that she should just give him a cookie. When she turned around, she replied, "Please, if he needs anything else, just let her know." He wished her luck and watched her go, then leaned his elbows on the table and looked up. At that moment, a person approached him, and he felt it and opened his eyes. It turned out to be George, and the protagonist realized that it was the second prince of the George Empire. In the past, he was a commander on many battlefields. He bowed and announced that he was the third prince of Betrayal, Yuri Betrayal. At the same time, he was the one who personally brought Betrayal to its decline. He should calm down, and he cannot show hostility towards him. At that moment, George said, "Yes, indeed," when he suddenly froze and smiled, finishing his sentence, and Yuri also froze in shock and felt unknown magical rays pierce him. George said that this year he turns 13, as expected of the son of Fior. What a magnificent talent. After that, he stepped aside and the protagonist became angry and clenched his fist. It was quite threatening, and he thought he was young, but at that age, he was already so strong. This guy is simply a frightening freak. Both brother and sister are birds of a feather. At that moment, he passed by Anna and knocked her down. She fell to the floor and broke several wine glasses, spilling everything on the floor. He said that this was a symbol of the imperial court and she had done such a thing. Anna began to shake and asked him for forgiveness, when suddenly George said, "My God, this child." When suddenly Yuri overheard their conversation and was dumbfounded by the realization. He realized she had made a mistake, and George raised his sword to her head. According to the laws of the Empire, such an offense should be beheaded. Yuri realized that this freak had deliberately quarreled with Ina to spite him. At that moment, Fior approached them and asked, "Have you come to disrupt his royal ball? If he wanted blood, then let him do such things on his own land." At that moment, George turned his attention to him and, after an awkward silence, replied that he would like to ask for his understanding and bowed to him. His Majesty, the Empire, and Betrayal had always respected each other. Fior replied that everything was correct, but he believed that they had no such intentions. "Does he remember what happened in Gatensh?" George smirked, and Fior continued speaking. "When he executed an imperial knight on Betrayal's soil, His Majesty stole his honor and didn't hold him accountable for his actions." George replied that it was the same thing. It must be done to preserve the honor and dignity of both nations. He reflected on how his father had once executed an imperial knight of his own free will. He wasn't doing it because he wanted to, so he proposed ending it quickly. And seeing how he recalled the past, it became clear to him that the honor of the imperial family depended on it. There wouldn't be much bloodshed. In other words, stopping this now would be tantamount to challenging the empire. However, duties and conditions, ideals and reality, justifications and power. Betrayal does not disregard honor even in death. Such is the oath of Betrayal. At that moment, he cried out, "His Highness, she is his subordinate." Why was he thinking so hard like a mouse? Therefore, her mistakes are his mistakes. In a moment, he forgot about it. And while that may not be enough, he's still a prince. And if they'd taken that into account, everything would have changed. He was a sinner in the past, and this life is his punishment, and he couldn't choose it. He asks him to forgive her mistake, and in exchange, let him fight him. After these words, loud laughter erupted in the hall. George continued to laugh loudly at him and didn't stop until he suddenly replied, "Okay, he's Yuri? The third prince, right?" Yuri replied, "Yes, His Highness." George asked again, "Could he just call him Yuri?" He answered, "Of course," and everyone around him was stunned. George turned, feeling that since the third prince had made a good offer, he would accept it. Did he agree with this offer? Fior frowned and replied that everything would be as he wished. He thanked him for this, and George announced that normally he would participate in this duel himself, but for the sake of the dignity of the imperial family, he would appoint a challenger. He would send the youngest knight of his age, and he would duel him. Yuri bowed and thanked him for his forgiveness. George said that in that case, they would see each other at the duel. Meanwhile, he looked at the frightened Ina, who was trembling with fear. He ran to her and grabbed her hand, telling her to get up. He lifted her up and told her to go and rest, causing Ina to ask, How could she? After all, this had all happened because of her. He told her not to worry, and the other servants helped Aina to her room. The protagonist turned around when suddenly he found himself in front of Katerina. She silently looked into his eyes, and he realized that this was just another unnecessary thought. As he passed, Hernando, who was sipping an alcoholic drink off to the side, noticed everything. Sometime later, night fell, and Yuri walked down a dark corridor alone. His older brother was waiting for him and asked him what he was thinking. At that moment, the protagonist turned around and expressed surprise at his older brother, explaining that he couldn't just stand by and watch Ina die. He replied that he was truly incorrigible and patted his head in praise. Yuri was surprised and thought it had been so long since he'd received such a gesture from him. At that moment, his brother grabbed his hair and suggested that maybe he needed help. His opponent might initially think this was an act of goodwill, but in reality, it wasn't. If both parties' skills were on par, then even in the event of an accident, Yuri's response was clear. Before he could finish his sentence, Yuri told him he knew what he was worried about. His brother replied that they didn't need to talk about it anymore, and that he would take care of everything. Yuri snapped back, saying no, it was his choice, and he would deal with it. He knew his older brother could do something about it, but he simply smiled and replied, fine, he believes in him, Yuri Briol. Yuri responded with a smile, of course, and then asked, by the way, what's up with the score? His older brother replied that the situation had gotten a bit worse, but he'd deal with it and he should go and rest. He thanked his brother and realized that if only the Empire had captured them, he'd be ruling Briol now. What a nation they would be then. This time, he had to see what would happen. For this, he would fight and win, and no matter who his opponent was. The next day, he found himself back in the arena facing his opponent, with all the important officials and dignitaries gathered to watch. Hernando said he never would have thought the prince would participate in such a duel. Who did he think would win? Signed replied that the prince's opponent was quite calm, and a knight who wielded a sword with the skill expected of a knight of the Empire. He wondered if their prince could handle him. At that moment, Hernando laughed, and seemed asked why he was laughing. He told him he would see everything soon. Everyone began to watch the unfolding battle intently. At that moment, the protagonist stretched and yawned, then flexed all his muscles, and Hernando noted that they should not worry about him. Great Mage, among all the ranks awarded to mages by the Mystic Tower, is a rank that no one has ever achieved. A title granted only to those who have mastered an exclusive mystic path. Among all the exclusive mystic paths that allow a complete understanding of the fate of the world, this is the study of fate. Only Hernando, who had received permission from the world itself, was able to master this. Suddenly, he froze, and the protagonist asked what was wrong with him. He'd just been bragging and talking about big deals. How could he even win a single game? He really didn't know how to play at all. This was the first time he'd lost money in a serious game since mastering the exclusive mystical path. Could this really be just a coincidence? He could read subscribers and even their luck with a quick glance. But he saw nothing in this child. The figure he could discern through the Sword Mountain's illusion was black hair and eyes, the symbol of the Briol royal family. That arrogant gaze was definitely that of the third prince. He swung his sword, unwilling to give up, even as his entire body bled and the illusion ended with him collapsing to the ground in despair. It was in this timeline that the situation he'd been led into by a simple misunderstanding became extremely suspicious to him. He should forget about it and behave well. However, when the prince acted strangely during their patrol, he used fate investigation, a miracle he now knows when he'll be able to use again, and everything was confirmed. The fact that Prince Yuri has no fate is very curious. At that moment, he smiled, and when asked why he was laughing, he replied that Yuri was nothing to worry about. A moment later, Yuri announced that he was ready. How much longer would he simply swing his sword at him? George asked if he was sure he didn't need any more time. Yuri confidently replied that he was ready to begin right now, and his opponent replied that he was ready too. Fior declared, okay, then they will begin the duel now. At that moment, the knights tensed and stood facing each other, after which Yuri, with sharp and agile movements, reached his enemy and pounced on him with incredible speed. The latter was very surprised and dumbfounded by what he saw, so he wrapped his hands around his sword and continued to fight off the attack. The battle raged on, and Yuri didn't give up, smiling as he looked at his opponent. At that moment, Fior addressed Hernando by name, and he replied, yes, your majesty. He asked what his prognosis was. Hernando, looking at the protagonist, replied that he wasn't sure. At that moment, the bloody battle continued with incredible zeal from both opponents. Fior remained silent, then asked, he said he came to Briol by chance, right? He replied yes, and then asked, is it time for him to leave yet? He replied, no, after which Fior said what a relief, glad he had no intention of leaving yet. Hernando replied that he was honored that he thought so highly of such a humble mage. Fior replied that overdimensioning leads to problems, and in that case, could he take his answer to mean nothing special would happen? The mage asked again, who is stronger in his eyes, your majesty? He looked at his son's opponent, who was confidently attacking him, and said that this man is stronger. Hernando replied that that was precisely his opinion, your majesty. He had come to Briol for the first time, and it was truly by chance. Since the strongest man on the continent capable of influencing the fate of the world was here, he was. However, the sword couldn't be easily drawn, so he thought there was no longer any reason to stay. However, at one point, he actually considered leaving. He informed Fior of this, and at that moment, the knight pounced on Yuri, who was standing waiting, but it seemed that now was not the time to leave. Yuri smiled and, gripping his sword, used magical mana, declaring that he thought he'd had enough of testing the waters. He raised his sword and decided it was time to end this. As his aura continued to spread, everyone noticed that he had suddenly become faster. Yuri's eye glowed brightly, and his sword was already at his opponent's neck. He held it with ease, and his opponent realized he was dead. A moment later, it was all over, and George and Katerina were stunned by what they saw. Fior was also stunned and surprised. Saint also cried out in surprise, and at that moment Hernando smiled. People shouted, could he really turn the sword in such a situation? What did they think of it? The protagonist's opponent's sword was shattered in two, and the tip of the weapon was near his throat. Yuri smiled, and his opponent said that he had lost. Everyone in the palace rejoiced at the outcome, and Hernando realized that fate had brought him here, and he had met someone who defies fate. From life to death, from death to life, the third prince's sword changed this man's fate and the fate of the maid. His every step is always against fate. Yes, he who lives in defiance of the fate of the world. Yuri Briol, unconquerable by fate. He said, it was simply magnificent, your highness. He would like to see how he changed the fate of this world. 5 years later, a maid ran through the palace, disappointed in herself because everything was going so well, but she had seriously screwed up. If she got caught, it would be the end for her. At that moment, someone called out to her and asked if she was new. She looked at the prince and realized it was his black hair and the symbol of the House of Briol. The prince asked, what is she doing here? She exhaled in disappointment and thought that she should calm down and answer as she had been taught. He asked, what is she doing here? The maid thought that firstly, if he had a dull face, then he was his majesty, and secondly, the crown prince always smiles warmly. Thirdly, if he had sly eyes and soft steps, then, but at that moment, the prince became angry and asked, does she ignore him? She realized that he was definitely the third prince and said so out loud, saying that she needed something here. He was surprised and asked again, the third one? So what? Does she even know how to treat them? Or is he on the list of those to be avoided? The maid was terrified, and suddenly the prince announced he would teach them a lesson. At that moment, his brother called out to him and asked what he was doing here. He and the maid were surprised and turned around, and she realized there was someone else left, a confident face, always carrying a sword. It was Yuri, who asked with a smile, is he mocking her? He was the third prince. Sometime later, Yuri was walking in the garden, eating cookies. When he turned around, he remembered his conversation with his brother and asked why he always mocked the maids. He shouted that he hadn't, and the servant thanked him and asked her to take this one as a token of gratitude. She gave him a truly delicious cookie. At that moment, he clapped his hands to clear away crumbs and thought that this was the perfect limit for his hands. He could use mana while holding the sword to reduce the strain on his arms. He'd come so far in that time. 5 years had passed since his death at the hands of Roland and the regression. The days of peace were ending, and he knew it. They were probably discussing it right now. Meanwhile, a loud conversation was going on inside the palace. One of the people was shouting. Hadn't he heard what he said? Yuri approached the door and knocked, but the shouts continued, claiming he wasn't listening. He remained silent until the guards suddenly blurted out that he thought they were too busy arguing to hear the knock. Yuri clenched his fist, and the servant continued to say that he thought they would definitely hear the next knock. At that moment, he asked him to wait, but Yuri slammed his fist on the door with incredible force, shattering it into pieces. When he entered the office, everyone was stunned by the crack and the roar, and Yuri declared that he had knocked too hard because no one heard him. The knight knelt and declared that it clearly wasn't knocking, and that he would ultimately be punished. Yuri turned to his father and said he would like to join the discussion. Fior bowed, and when Yuri sat down at the table, they decided to continue. One of the dukes said he was trying to say that they didn't have enough men to assist with the allied forces. They asked him, so he means they should simply ignore the Empire's request? In that case, another house might send more men. That's completely irresponsible. While they were shouting and arguing, Yuri thought they were trying to gain an advantage for themselves. Yes, it happened around that time. The request to reinforce the Empire's allied forces. The Empire requested people from various countries and sent them east to kill orcs, but the plan failed, and enraged orcs began crossing the borders of nearby countries. These were all countries except the Empire. Then they realized that this was the Empire's plan. Because of this, they lost many great knights, including the Lianas. Now, he wouldn't let that happen. One of the dukes announced that they wouldn't send anyone, and another shouted, did he really think their knights were just hanging around doing nothing? At that moment, Yuri shouted for everyone to stop, because he was leaving. He would join the allied forces, and they must do something to prevent anyone from tarnishing the name Briol. They must do what nobles are supposed to do. Dior smiled slightly and wondered, so that's what he was planning? Sometime later, he arrived at the arena, fought his opponent, and trained. At that moment, his brother waved and asked if he really intended to join the allied forces. He confidently answered, yes. And his brother asked, but why? Members of the royal family don't have to do that. Yuri replied that, as he always said, it was the duty of members of the royal family. His brother was stunned and said he understood. Yuri, now he understood what was going on in his head. Yuri asked, now? His brother clutched his heart and begged him to return alive. He would protect the palace in his absence. After these words, he ran back inside the palace, and Bernard remarked on what a wonderful brotherhood this was. Yuri hoped he wouldn't cause them any trouble. He turned around and asked if he wasn't worried about him. The swordsman replied that he believed he would return safe and sound if he didn't get into trouble. Yuri said he was good at thinking positively, and Bernard asked him to be careful. Orcs were very difficult to deal with, and they were much stronger and more bloodthirsty than he thought, especially those with a flag visible behind them. Those are orcivals. They are especially ferocious and bloodthirsty. Yuri asked him not to worry, because he could handle everything, and he asked again, does he have a plan? Suddenly, Ina opened the doors and shouted, Your Highness, a guest has arrived with the items he requested. She was in a great hurry and trying to catch her breath as she spoke this phrase. Yuri turned to her with a smile on his face and asked the teacher again, a plan? Of course there was one, and it was a very special plan. He smiled, looking into Bernard's eyes, completely confident. After a while, Guillermo was sitting on the sofa at the table. He took a sip of the offered drink, and then the protagonist entered the room. He rose from his seat, straightened his jacket, and said that he welcomed him, His Highness. He was the vice master of the Ilian Guild. Then the protagonist sat down across from him and asked how Ilian was doing. Replied that she was on a trip, so he came in her place. He asked if she still traveled alone. He should tell her to hire a cab. He said that she preferred traveling on her own. Then he placed the chest on the table, and the protagonist said, She's like that. Okay, is that why he was looking for it? In response, he laughed and said, Of course, that's not true. They got all the items he requested. The protagonist looked at the contents of the chest and said, Good job, Guillermo. He smiled and thought that he finally got it, the Sword of the Four Paths. Then Guillermo asked, Your Highness, is this really that precious? To him, it looked more like some kind of decorative daggers. Then MC took one of the daggers and said that it was very valuable. He concentrated energy into it and added, Since these are artifacts containing ancient magic. At that moment, Guillermo cried out in surprise, The sword is moving on its own, and the protagonist said, It's okay, he won't die. He asked, Does he move it with mana? He never would have thought he was so strong, His Highness. And the protagonist folded his arms and asked, Did he think he just spent his days doing nothing? Then he looked away in surprise. Guillermo asked if something was wrong. He replied, No, nothing. Well, he should convey his gratitude to Ilian. He should also report on the progress of their affairs at the Empire's branch office the next time they met. Guillermo rose from his seat and replied, Okay, in that case, he may take his leave. After a few seconds, MC leaned on the sofa and said, Come out. Asana stepped out of the shadows and appeared behind him. Then he looked away and asked what was going on with Goryo. She said as he ordered, she gave him a warning. She removed her mask and added that she left a note on the headboard of his bed while he was sleeping. The protagonist said, Excellent work. He still tries to get his hands on Ilian's money whenever the opportunity arises. Then Asana added, Your Highness, will he really join the allied forces? He replied, Yes, and she told him to be careful. He said, She says it like it doesn't concern her. She wondered what he meant. He replied that she should go too. She didn't want to lag behind him, did she? And she smiled and said that no matter what she had to do, this was better than her past life. He said, Great. He would contact her later. The next second, she vanished into thin air. A few days later, the departure day. The protagonist was adjusting his armor. His brother came up to him and said, Yuri, he should be more careful. MC, smiling, looked at him and told him not to worry. He was invincible after all. He would raise Briol's reputation to the skies. And he, brother, should at least take a little break from studying, and he needed to take care of his eyes. In response, he laughed and said that he understood. And then he hugged the protagonist and said, Have a safe trip, brother. He replied, Yeah, he'll definitely come back. After that, the knight blew his horn, and Fiore stood behind the podium and said that they were beginning the departure ceremony. The protagonist came up the stairs and asked if he was worried. He answered no, and Fiore told him to look behind him. The protagonist turned around, noticing the huge number of knights, and his father said that all the soldiers he saw were precious lives that rested on his shoulders, Yuri. Then MC closed his eyes and thought that they would all be able to return home alive, but he would try to ensure that they were not doomed to a miserable death like him in the past. Then Fiore asked if he was sure, and he looked at him and said, Yes, father, I'm sure. Before he could finish speaking, he told him to take it in that case. At that moment, he released a powerful energy, and the protagonist thought a murderous aura. His body, he can't move a muscle. He instinctively felt that death was coming for him right now. If he tried to avoid it, he would die anyway. So he couldn't avoid it? No. He concentrated energy in his weapon, then held it out in front of him and blocked Fiore's attack. He smiled in response and noted that he had succeeded. And then the protagonist looked at the hilt of the sword in his hand and thought, just now, Fiore said this instead of parting words. He will say no more. He must return alive. He replied, Yes, sir. Then he turned and followed, raising his sword up, shouting, He, the third prince of Briol, Yuri Briol, they must believe in him. Soldiers, forward. The knights began to encourage them by raising their weapons and shouting, Hurrah! Meanwhile, in the dungeon, the orc held onto the bars and shouted. And Haim Theodore approached him and said that he would be able to see him again after 5 years, the third prince. After some time, MC and his squad took a short break. He drank some water and then wiped his mouth. After that, he rose from the stump and said that they were already quite far. So Raymond, where are they now? He looked at the map and said that they were now at the entrance to Sindor. If they walked a little further, they would reach the border town of Sindor, after which they would pass through Gid and head to the gathering point in Balshad. The protagonist replied, okay, they are moving quite quickly, yes? He replied, of course. At that moment, MC heard, His Highness. He turned, noticing the knight's disfigured face, and he said that he alone was to blame for this. The protagonist thought, Laurent Flandre, the idiot who killed him in his past life. He was the eldest son of the Margrave. Then Laurent knelt and said that it was an honor to meet him. His name is Roland. The protagonist said, surprised? Yes, of course. Then the knight put his hand to his chest and said that even before their meeting, he wanted to tell him something, His Highness. He asked what it was, and he looked at him with admiration and said that he admired him. The protagonist asked, surprised? What? And he added that after the incident that he learned about from his father, which happened 5 years ago, he, His Highness, became his idol. When he raised his sword to protect the maid, he is a living example of a true knight incarnate. He did not stop smiling happily, and the protagonist lifted him up and, horrified, said yes, he also heard something about him from his father. They should get along. He shouted, yes, it is a great honor for him to serve. Then Raymond said, His Highness, it is time for them to move. The protagonist replied, all right. And then he told him to be aware that Duke Sindor wasn't known for being the kindest or most hospitable person, so he shouldn't take his less than warm welcome to heart. After a while, they arrived at the right place, and notices were posted on the palace gates. Welcome, His Highness the Third Prince. The troops lined up, and MC smiled and said, a very warm welcome. He would even say, very warm. At that moment, Haim bowed and said, he has arrived, His Highness. At that moment, the protagonist dismounted and thanked him for the warm welcome, Sir Haim. He said that they were simply showing respect for someone who at such a young age was already preparing to fight on the front lines. Had he ever fought orcs? And the protagonist closed his eyes and said, of course not. He hadn't, but he had read about them. Then he turned around and added, most of the soldiers here have never fought orcs, so he should at least train them all. Haim said, good, very good. He bowed and added, in that case, His Highness, would he mind if he gave him something? After a while, they stopped at a door, and the knight undid the lock, then opened the door slightly. Haim, holding the torch, walked forward and said, it's inside, His Highness. The others walked forward, and then the door closed behind them. The protagonist asked, what do you think he's doing, Sir Haim? And he set down the torch and said, don't be surprised. MC continued to look around while the soldiers screamed in fear. It's an orc. They stopped near one of the cells, and Haim suggested they just call him a prisoner. He needed to study them to survive. Everything, from their little habits to their instincts. Absolutely everything they could use in battle. The protagonist asked, Haim, was this the gift he was talking about? He answered, yes, indeed. Considering they had a battle with them ahead of them, a better gift couldn't be imagined. MC smiled and thanked him. He thought he was even crazier than he thought. Torturing an orc? Then he glanced back, noticing the knight's upset face. He asked his name. He replied that his name was Simon Reshu, the son of Baron Wolf. The protagonist asked him to answer honestly. What was going on in his mind right now? He said he didn't think they should have gone that far. In his opinion, it was too much for a prisoner of war. And the protagonist said, right, he can think like that now. Then he added, Sir Haim, he must open the door. He answered, yes. MC looked back and asked, he said his name was Simon, right? He answered in the affirmative, and the protagonist said that now there would be a real fight. He must fight the orc. Then the orc walked out of the dungeon, and Simon stood in front of him, pointing his weapon forward. Then the orc screamed loudly and started banging his head on the floor. Simon, perplexed, looked at him, and then shouted, as he thought, this is simply ridiculous. Fighting a prisoner who has lost the will to fight. With these words, he turned around, and the orc, noticing his back, sharply pointed his hands at him, then punched him in the head, destroying his helmet. The others cried out in alarm, Simon! And the next second, the orc grabbed him by the head, and one of the knights shouted for everyone to prepare for battle. But Haim stepped forward and said, calm down. They've cut most of his tendons, Your Highness. That's what orcs are like. If you open yourself up even for a split second, he'll immediately try to kill you. The others shouted, Your Highness, they have to save him. And Haim added, they have to calm down. They've cut most of the orc's tendons, so he won't die. At this point, the orc continued to scream and restrain Simon. The protagonist asked, have you taken him hostage? And Haim said he'd call a translator. He should translate Corey. At that moment, he came out from around the corner, and MC, noticing him, asked, Corey? He answered, yes, that's right. Then Corey covered his ears with his hands and said that if they didn't drop their weapons right now, he would start breaking this knight's bones one by one. At that moment, Simon screamed in fear, and the protagonist said, Hernando, he has to figure this out. He walked forward and, concentrating energy in his hand, said that he understood. Then he directed the energy at the orc, binding his hand. He said, now. The protagonist ran forward and noticed, well done. He snatched Simon from the orc's hand, and then the orc screamed loudly, clenching his fists. The protagonist asked, Sir Haim, this is no ordinary orc, right? He replied that he was not. He was very small, but he had plenty of experience. During his capture, he ate the knight whole. This orc killed many people, and then one of the knights shouted, "Idiot! It doesn't matter if he's a prisoner or not, he will kill him." But at that moment, the protagonist approached him and told him to calm down. He responded, "Your Highness." He said he wasn't trying to stop him, but first, he needed to look behind him. They were all waiting for them to open up. This orc was no exception. Those he was about to face were even more cunning and evil. So he had to focus. This was training. He had to learn how to kill an orc. After a while, the knights advanced, the knight clutching a weapon imbued with energy, and the orc grabbed a torch and threw it at the men. But Hernando stood forward, erecting a barrier protecting the others from the fire. Raymond ran forward and struck the orc's shoulder. The creature then fell to the ground. He turned slightly, and at that moment, the orc had already risen to his feet and swung his arms to strike. He struck in front of him, but the knight held his sword out in front of him, blocking his attack. At that moment, Simon looked at the sword stabbed into the orc, and MC clapped his hands and said, "Excellent. They don't feel any satisfaction?" As expected, this was just training, and the enemy couldn't even respond. However, this training will help them increase their chances of surviving a fight with the orcs. They should thank Sir Haim. At that moment, Haim placed his hand on his chest and said, "They may think this is not in keeping with the knightly code, but these evil creatures do not deserve nobility." He walked forward and asked them to follow him. He wanted to show them something else. The orcs here are nothing more than copies of the real thing. Far more horrific things happen in the orc camps. Then he opened the next doors and said, "What they are about to see is the consequences of these actions." The protagonist looked ahead and thought, "I see." The knight next to him cried out in surprise, "It's them! They are half-orcs." The chained creatures stretched their hands toward them, and MC noticed there were far more of them than he thought. Haim must have brought them, and creating them isn't that easy. Orcs enslave humans and use them as toys, and they're a product of game time. At that moment, Simon left the room, holding back the urge to vomit, and the protagonist looked at Haim and asked, "Does he hate orcs?" He looked away and said, "With all his heart, and it will be so until his death." After that, they left the room. The protagonist, placing his hand on the hilt of his sword, thought he was so calm, as if he were completely familiar with all this chaos. Everyone has a sworn enemy, his empire for example, and for Sir Haim it seemed it was the orcs. He had heard that he found the body of his dead son in an orc village. It seemed that the image was still imprinted in his memory, just like his own. He still can't forget the destruction of the kingdom. When morning came, the protagonist was standing outside the city, and Haim approached him and asked to take him with him. He directed Corey to him, and MC said that he saw him in the basement yesterday. He answered, "That's right, his name is Corey." The protagonist smiled, looking at him, and said that being able to speak the Orcish language is a very useful skill. And he said, his lord, he would like to say something. But the protagonist held out his hand in front of him and said, "No need, he knows." He looked at him in surprise and asked, "Excuse me," and Haim said that he knew what he was worried about, but he shouldn't worry. He put the glove in his hands and added, "Of course, he will tell him everything, so he hopes that they can work together." Corey said, "But something so precious." At that moment, MC shouted, "Sir Raymond." He approached him and asked, "Will they head to the border from here?" He replied, "Yes, there will be several hordes of monsters there, but he shouldn't worry about that." Then the protagonist closed his eyes and said, no, he didn't understand. Hordes of monsters are as much a threat to the border as orcs. They need to be eliminated too. After a while, the merchants stopped their horses and bandits rode out to meet them. Their leader drew his sword and attacked several merchants at once. Meanwhile, MC rode forward with his squad. Then he turned around and thought that if the squad found out that Corey was a half-orc, there would be problems, although he had ordered Hernando to keep an eye on him, so he thought he could handle it. Then he looked at the map and after that, waving his hand, shouted, "Jared." He rode up to him and said, "Yes." The protagonist showed him the map and said that from now on, he was in charge of reconnaissance. He would tell him where he needed to go and check everything out. He asked, "Reconnaissance, sir? But aren't there hordes of monsters roaming around there? If the squad approaches them, they'll just run away, and he still wants to fight them?" He replied, "They'll have to chase them anyway. They're bothering the merchants near the border." Why was he asking? He hoped it wasn't because he lacked confidence, especially for a man like him. He couldn't delegate this task to other soldiers because they were nervous, and he was still too young and inexperienced. Besides, he was a genius when it came to swordplay, but if he couldn't even hold them off. The next second, Jared turned and galloped ahead, shouting that he'd be back soon, and the protagonist smiled and said, "Well, that's different." Then Raymond rode up to him and noticed that he was treating him quite well, and he asked, "Is that what it looked like?" He just likes to take him around. Then he looked to the side and asked Sir Raymond if he could ask one very boring question. He answered, "Of course." He asked, what was he fighting for? He looked at him in surprise and then said that he hadn't heard that question for quite some time, but he could only give him one very old answer. He answered that he was listening. Then Raymond answered, "For the safety of Betrayal." MC looked at him in surprise and then smiled and thought, well, not such a bad answer. Then he said, "Squad, they should not lag behind. He'll go check on Jared." Then he rushed forward. Meanwhile, at the camp, the tied-up bandit was thrown to the ground, and then the protagonist approached him and said, "Quiet, he doesn't want to die, right?" With these words, he showed him a knife. At that moment, Raymond looked through binoculars and said, "Your Highness, they have found them, the bandit camp." He pointed his finger forward, and MC said that he was a good boy. It looked like he was patrolling the area alone. He's saying the leader sent him alone? The boy responded fearfully, "Yeah, right, he's just a lackey, so he doesn't know much." Then the protagonist noticed something glittering around his neck. He then snatched the pendant from his neck, looked at it, and asked, "What is that, Giz?" He replied that it wasn't. Their leader told them to wear it when they went out on patrol. Then the protagonist reached for his sword and said, "It looks like some kind of artifact. What spell was cast on this?" And he cried out in fear that he didn't know. He asked, "Really?" Well, he thought there was nothing he could do about it. He'd have to personally catch the leader and find out everything from him. After a while, the sun began to set, and the protagonist was sitting in the bushes, looking through binoculars. Jared rode up to him and shouted, "Your Highness." He said that, as he ordered, they had positioned their forces along their retreat route. They had also sent several scouts to determine the enemy's combat strength. He said, "So if he's causing chaos, they can deal with the rest, right?" Jared asked in surprise, "Excuse me." And after that, MC saddled his horse and said that they had to go. If they were late, there would be no one left to fight. Jared continued to look at him in surprise and said, "Your Highness, Your Highness, he's asking. He must wait. It's dangerous to go there alone." But at that moment, the protagonist shouted, "Soldiers, forward!" He rode up to the camp, and people came out of their tents, wondering what all the noises were. Then the man looked up in surprise, and at that moment, the protagonist ran forward on his horse, swinging his sword, destroying their dining table, and, stopping next to the man, said, "Well, hello, fellow bandits." As night fell, Jared ran up to the camp with several knights and shouted, "Your Highness." At that moment, the protagonist was sitting on the bandit leader near the fire and noticed that they were late. Jared came closer and asked him not to act alone. It was dangerous, and he said that they just needed to keep up with him. "Sir Raymond, what about the escapees?" He replied that they dealt with them. Besides, they didn't lose anyone. When MC smiled and, getting to his feet, said, "Great, then they should take all their meat and cook dinner." He picked up the skewer, and Jared said, "It doesn't smell very good." And the protagonist asked, "Does he know how delicious it is?" "He still has a lot to learn. They'll stay here today and move on tomorrow." "Sounds good." At that moment, the bandit leader stood up, and Raymond said, "By the way, Your Highness, the next destination is Gid. Before arriving in Balshad, where all the allied forces are gathered, they'll most likely encounter the army of another country, since they have similar paths." At that moment, the protagonist looked at the bandit leader and asked, "Really? Which country?" He answered, "The Holy Kingdom." MC closed his eyes and said, "A country that uses sacred scriptures. Good. Well, if they can find a common language with them, they'll be able to heal their squad." But Raymond said that wasn't quite true. He heard that this time, the princess of the Holy Kingdom became the commander of the allied forces. Rumor has it that after losing the battle for the throne, she's desperate to achieve at least some results to strengthen her position. So now no one knows what she can do in this battle. The protagonist said thoughtfully, "Princess of the Holy Kingdom." Raymond asked if he should find out more. He folded his arms and replied, "No need. He would simply meet her himself." Sometime later, the gathering place of the allied forces, a past city for travelers heading to Balshad, Gid. This city was responsible for supplying the allied forces. Raymond said that if they did anything out of the ordinary, they would be in trouble. They would be judged by Gid's laws if they were found guilty. Gid is an isolated city, so they would have to follow their rules. The protagonist said, "Sir Raymond, he must make sure their people are taught manners before letting them into the city." He replied that he understood. They stopped briefly near the city to make sure their men were prepared. The protagonist said he would go meet the Lord. After a while, Philip smiled and, extending his hand forward, said it was a great honor to meet Prince Briol. MC extended his hand and thanked him for his hospitality. Briol expressed his deep gratitude for his help. He replied, "No problem. They are always ready to assist allied forces." When King Briol was still very young, he made a name for himself by slaying orcs. The orcs should run in fear now that he's with them. The protagonist smiled, looking at him, and then walked to the sofa and said he would give it his all. At that moment, a subordinate called out to the Lord, and he looked at him. Then the subordinate whispered something to him, and Philip said, "The Princess of the Holy Kingdom has arrived. Does he want to meet her?" MC replied, "Of course." A few seconds later, Sybil Arsene entered the room, and Philip, rising from his seat, said, "Welcome." The second Princess of the Holy Kingdom, Sybil, walked forward. She then introduced herself, and the Lord approached her and said that it was a great honor to meet her, Princess. Then she turned her gaze to the protagonist and asked, "Is he the Lord's servant?" He looked at her in surprise. She said that she needed to discuss something with the Lord, so she asked for him to leave them alone. At that moment, the Lord awkwardly said, "Princess, he." But before he could finish, the knight clenched his hand and shouted, "Silence! The princess is speaking. He still dares to just sit there. He should show her respect." At this moment, the protagonist said he is the third prince of Briol. Those present looked at him in confusion, and then an awkward silence fell, and the protagonist added, "Also responsible for the Briol forces." At that moment, the knight said in fear, "Prince, him." But MC grabbed his head and shouted that it was his own fault. He should have dressed appropriately. Now he looked more like a homeless person from the street. And the knights bowed and begged for forgiveness. They shouted that they had screwed up. "Please, he must forgive them, Prince." After some time, the protagonist asked, "Does he really look like a homeless person in this?" Sybil put the cup with the drink on the saucer and, laughing slightly, said, not really. She apologizes for that, and the protagonist smiled and asked maybe they should greet each other again. He is Yuri Briol, the third prince of Briol. She shook his hand and said that it was nice to meet him. Then he asked how old she was, Lady Sybil. She answered that she was 20. He said that he was 18, only a 2-year difference, so now they were friends. In that case, we can do without formalities. It's nice to meet her too, Sybil. She looked at him awkwardly. Then he added, wonderful. It will be useful to have connections before the battle with the orcs. Everything is fine, right, Sybil? She answered awkwardly. Well, yes. Then MC added, he didn't see any other troops on the way here. Sybil, was she here first with her knights? She answered, yes. The main troops will arrive tomorrow. He said that he hoped that all will be well with them. She frowned and said that the Holy Kingdom has very strict martial laws. Does he think something could go wrong? He turned his gaze to her and said that he meant the situation from outside. Sometimes orcs go abroad. Besides, despite their size, they are very good at setting ambushes. At that moment, Philip smiled and remarked, that's right, they are very complex creatures. And the protagonist said that overall, there shouldn't be any problems. After all, these are the troops of the Holy Kingdom. But he thinks she should remember that. Their gazes met. After a while, Hernando asked, so what are the Knights of the Holy Kingdom like? They were walking down the street, and the protagonist said, old-fashioned. The princess must have a hard time with them. Hernando thoughtfully asked, did he see anything good in her? And he answered, perhaps. With that, he took the pendant out of his pocket and asked, are you sure you bought it here? Hernando stopped by a shop and replied, absolutely. Only here could they sell such things. He said he was more than sure, as he had said back then, that it could be used to lure orcs. More precisely, he said that as soon as the orcs smelled the pendant, they would furiously attack the owner of the pendant, something like a pendant with a substance. So it was an artifact? But that was too much. Before he could finish, Hernando said that he knew it was fragile. He didn't think it would help. At that moment, the shopkeeper looked at them indignantly, and then Hernando stepped forward and said that he didn't see anything like that here. They must have sold out already. The MC said, what a shame. At that moment, he heard a shout. Ah, your highness. Hernando pointed his finger at the establishment and shouted that he thought they were gambling in that bar. The protagonist asked in surprise, Briol's soldiers are gambling? He wouldn't allow that. He stepped forward and added that they couldn't be considered proper forces while such shameful things were happening within their ranks. Hernando said, that's right, your highness. Meanwhile, Fennec approached Sybil and asked if the meeting with the Lord had gone well. She replied, yes. He added that he had heard that the third prince of Briol couldn't be trusted. He was the deputy captain of the Knights of the Holy Kingdom. He asked, how can he lead people? He thinks it's just an old belief that Briol is a kingdom of knights. And Sybil said, Fennec, you can't talk behind others' backs. He spoke. He was dressed like some kind of mercenary, and besides, he had heard that he had behaved inappropriately. When this whole thing with the orcs is over, he thinks Briol will have one less prince. He continued to smile as he said this, and Sybil said, enough chatter. He replied that he understood her. Then she asked, were the main troops all right? He replied, of course, she had nothing to worry about, princess. He walked forward and added that he would sort everything out. They would go on patrol. Sybil watched them go and sighed loudly. Sometime later, in the establishment, Fennec went inside, and those present asked who it was. The man said he thought they were Briol soldiers. Fennec was indignant. They let ordinary soldiers through from the city. What disobedient troops? Are they playing cards or something? Do they even know what the rules are? The knight behind him said he thought they were just like the captain. Fennec declared that this was unforgivable. He would not simply sit by and watch this. Then he shouted, what are they even doing? Do they think they came here just to play? It was none of his business, but he couldn't just stand by and watch such inappropriate behavior. He raised his index finger and shouted, do they think they're joking around here? At that moment, the protagonist put a hand on his shoulder and asked, what did he just say? Yes, him. What's his name? But Fennec brushed his hand aside and said, your highness, the third prince. This behavior isn't just hurting him, his highness, but his soldiers as well. It seemed he still hadn't realized that he, his highness, should be holding a sword, not cards, although he wasn't even sure he'd ever held a sword in his life. In response, the protagonist chuckled and said, Knight, he asked his name. Don't the Knights of the Holy Kingdom know anything about hierarchy? He shouted indignantly. This! At that moment, Sybil entered the establishment and asked what they were doing here. Sir Fennec, shouldn't he be patrolling right now? He bowed and apologized. She told him to leave. Fennec and his soldiers went outside, and then Sybil approached the protagonist, sighed, and apologized, saying she would apologize for him. MC smiled and said, no need. She said, I have a hard time controlling all my subordinates. Then she walked to the exit and turning around, said she would repay this debt later. He agreed. Yeah, later. At that moment, the protagonist remembered Raymond's words. He said she was very worried about her performance since she lost the battle for power. He thought, so that's what he was talking about. Then he put his hands in his pockets and walking forward said that it was none of his business. He returned to his soldiers and asked if they were ready for another round. One of them said, this time he goes first. And MC smiled and said, what a mood. Meanwhile, Fennec stood near the establishment and, looking at Sybil, asked irritably, Has she already become friends with the third prince, Betrayal? She asked in response. Is that such a big deal? And he said, Princess. He told her, he has no dignity. At that moment, a soldier ran up to them and shouted, Princess, Sir Fennec. They looked at him, and he dismounted from his horse, and, kneeling, apologized for interrupting their conversation so unceremoniously. An urgent letter had arrived from the main forces. Sybil asked, What's going on? He shouted, The main forces were attacked by orcs. They looked at him, puzzled. After a while, Sybil saddled her horse, and Philip approached her and asked, Princess, have you decided to move out immediately? He apologized for his presumption, but did she not want to ask for help from the Betrayal army? She looked ahead silently, and he added, if she wanted to minimize allied losses, that was the best option, right? At that moment, Fennec rode closer and indignantly shouted, what the hell was he talking about? The affairs of the Holy Kingdom are decided by the Knights of the Holy Kingdom. Or does he think they'll lose to some orcs? He replied that he hadn't meant anything of the sort, and Sybil said, It's fine, Lord. She understood his worries and accepted them with pride, but they could handle it themselves. Then she shouted that they were moving forward, and Philip watched them go. Roy approached him and said how stubborn the Knights of the Holy Kingdom were. He added, especially that second in command. You must go to the Betrayal army barracks immediately and meet with the third prince. Roy bowed and said, okay. Philip added, hurry up, they don't have much time. After some time, Raymond approached the protagonist and asked, Your Highness, what is this message? He held a letter in his hands and said that the main troops of the Holy Kingdom were attacked by orcs. This is a request from the Lord, asking them to help the allied army clear the area. Raymond asked, does he mean to say that this is a request from Gid and not from the Holy Kingdom? The protagonist remembered Fennec and said that they were quite stubborn. Sir Raymond, he must prepare for immediate departure. He bowed and replied that he understood. And then MC looked at the knight and asked what his name was. He replied that his name was Roy, His Highness. He said, Roy, he should go to the bar next to the amulet shop and gather the Knights of Betrayal. He should say that only the first 10 people will go with them, and that they were in a great hurry. He replied that he understood. Then he saddled his horse and rode away. After that, the protagonist put the letter down and dusted his hands, saying that it looked like they were heading out for a night ride. After a while, they set off, and then he turned around and asked, he sees that they are not fully awake yet, right? And the knights shouted, no, sir. He said, that's good. Jared, he is not very active, and his face is a little pale. He said that he is fine, sir. At that moment, Roland rode up to him and said, Your Highness. He replied, yes, Laurent. He said that he admired him again, Your Highness. He not only forgave the Knights of the Holy Kingdom who insulted him, but also personally went to their aid. He is impressed by his kindness, the fact that he is not as petty as these knights. His Majesty's deepest wisdom always sees the whole picture, not just the individual parts. And the protagonist smiled awkwardly and said that it wasn't like that. He thought Laurent had always been like this. Then he said, Knight, his loyalty is truly wonderful. He thought, he's so different from his past self. It's so strange. Well, he himself has changed dramatically. In response, the knight shouted that he was grateful for what he noticed. He thought, apparently, he had some influence on him. Then a knight rode up to them and shouted, His Highness. He seized them. He pointed his finger forward and shouted, This is the Holy Knightly Order of the Holy Kingdom. And MC said, they must listen. This is their first time fighting the orcs. From now on, he will be the first to enter the battle and the last to leave it. Yuri, the third principal, he commands them not to die. With these words, he concentrated the energy in his body and urged the horse forward. Sometime later, Holy Knights of the Holy Kingdom. Sybil thought she had been too careless. She should have expected an ambush. She remembered the protagonist's words and, frowning, thought that she should have been more vigilant. Then she looked ahead and shouted, They're still fighting. She urged her horse forward and thought, good, they haven't lost yet. Then she turned and said, Sir Fennec, they're heading straight for the commander. He replied that he understood, and then he shouted, fall into formation. They will break through. Forward. They charged forward, and at that moment, Sybil, grasping the cross hanging around her neck, said, Oh my God, his wretched servants are afraid. She asks him to give them strength. The next second, her body was enveloped in energy. She pointed her sword forward, shouting, faster. Then she slowed down, noticing a skeleton rising from the ground. The skeleton's eye sockets glowed with a bright light, and then a magical symbol spread around. The next second, the ground around her began to crack, and Sybil screamed, trap. She, along with the other knights and horses, began to fall and screamed, no. And then she thought, was she wrong again? Everyone had believed in her when she awakened her powers as a child. Their warm voices, she began to study swordsmanship, to send their expectations away. After defeating her brother with a sword, she realized that radiating swordsmanship had been the worst decision of her life. She remembered being told, Sybil, she must join the allied forces. It is God's will. She thought her brother had forced her to fight, afraid she would become the heir instead of him. Then he placed his hand on her head and said that her soul would be freed and go to heaven if she fought for their lord. In the present tense, she closed one eye and said, damn. She held the sword with a trembling hand and said he just wanted her dead. The other knights tried to rise and she shouted, everyone, gather. She rose to her feet and then, noticing the substance on her hand, asked, is that oil? She frowned, then looked up. Orcs had gathered around the pit holding torches. Then she noticed one of them swing his torch, and she thought, first an ambush and now a fiery trap. What should she do to survive? The next second, she closed her eyes and wondered what she lived for. She heard a voice. Sybil, she must open her eyes. An orc's head flew off, and the protagonist, holding a torch, asked if asking for help was so difficult. Then he dropped the rope and helped her up. She thanked him and said that now she was in his debt. He replied that it was not worth it. She rose up, and the next second, Fennec approached them and said, "Your Majesty, Deputy Captain of the Knights of the Holy Kingdom." Fennec greets the third Prince of Betrayal. He apologizes for his rudeness at the bar. He, Fennec, will never forget this day. Then the MC smiled and said he accepted their apology. Now he expects the Holy Kingdom to help Betrayal if they are in danger. Then he heard a loud shout and turned around, noticing one of the orcs start blowing his horn. He reached for his sword and said that they were retreating because they didn't look to kill the Holy Kingdom Knights. He shouted, "Follow them. They mustn't let them escape." The others shouted, "Yes, sir." Then the protagonist looked ahead and thought, "It's Orcval." A particularly large orc appeared from the front, and Sybil, noticing the protagonist's reaction, asked, "Yuri?" At that moment, Orcval aimed his bow at them and then fired an arrow wrapped in powerful energy. The protagonist concentrated the energy, then with one swing of his weapon, split the arrow into two. He said, "It seems the orc commander is a little upset with him. He thinks he should answer him." He smiled and slung the sword over his shoulder. He then concentrated his energy and said he'd be back soon, and Sybil, standing behind him, said, "Yuri should wait. He's not going to run into trouble alone, is he?" But the next second, he was already rushing toward the orcs, and one of them threw a spear at him. The protagonist noticed the blades approaching him and thought, 5 years ago, Bernard had explained to him how a strike to the heart and soul works. He'd said back then that there are countless variables in combat. For example, the environment, the terrain. There are too many things. Training is aimed at increasing the possibility of a counterattack. But his strike to the heart and soul is different. He instantly orients himself in space and finds the best opportunities to counterattack, transforming all this into swordsmanship. Then the protagonist looked at him and asked him to explain it in a way he could understand. He said that when the time came, he would understand everything himself. He would instinctively react to attacks, allowing him to kill enemies in the most effective way. In the present, a spear flew past the protagonist's head, and then another spear flew at him. He ducked sharply, then pushed off the ground and jumped up, dodging the spear. Then he swung his sword, aiming at an entire group of orcs, and then flew forward, cutting down every monster in his path. Then he heard the screams of the monsters and, turning around, noticed several more. He thought, so there were 3 of them attacking. He couldn't just attack them head on, but he hadn't fought in too long. He wanted to feel that feeling of satisfaction again. Then he noticed the lines on the orcs' bodies and thought, he sees it. The best way to counterattack. Then he struck, cutting down the monster in front of him. He did the same to 2 more. He thought, his strength still hasn't fully adapted to this. Well, this will have to do for now. Then he looked away and taking up a spear, shouted, "Orcval." He looked at him, holding his axes in his hands, and then the protagonist threw a spear at him, to which the orc crossed his axes in front of him. He deflected the spear, and the other orcs glared at him. Then Orcval said something, and MC thought they would all attack him at once, but they decided the losses weren't worth it. He smiled and said that he hoped he had already paid for that arrow. At that moment, Sybil ran up to him and shouted, "Yuri, are you hurt?" And he turned around, smiling, and said that he was fine. "Well, it looks like everything is settled." "Well, Sybil, how does it feel to win for the first time as part of the Allied forces?" She smiled and nodding, thanked him. It was all thanks to him. Meanwhile, Orcval and the remaining orcs were walking through the forest. He punched a tree, destroying it, and said something in a disgruntled voice. After a while, the knights asked, "Is this true?" And Jared, sitting at the table, put down a cup of beer and shouted, His Highness rushing forward and snatching up a torch that had been thrown into the pit. It was simply unbelievable. One of the knights said that, according to rumors, Prince Yuri had very little strength, so he thought he was just constantly gambling, and that was all. But Roland said that this was an absolute lie. He was more than sure that His Highness had the strongest blood in the entire king's lineage. With these words, he put his hand to his chest and his face turned red from the alcohol. Then he shouted, "No, this will not do. He will tell them in detail about every feat of His Highness." The others shouted, and he was dead drunk. Who even poured him any drinks? At that moment, Asuna was sitting at the next table and thought, Prince Yuri, he's too strange to be a simple nobleman. His insight, he'd read her assassination technique, which she'd hidden her entire life like an open book. Plus, he'd just charged right into the epicenter. No matter what task he was given, he'd always be a few steps ahead as if he knew the future. Then she called the innkeeper and said she was looking for someone. He approached her and asked who she was looking for. She replied, "A man with dark brown hair and a sword at his waist. He was quite skilled in swordsmanship." The innkeeper folded his arms and said, "Well, no one immediately came to mind." She added that he didn't speak the continental language well. He had an accent. He said, considering those details. He snapped his fingers and added that he wasn't sure he had brown hair, but he did remember someone with an awkward accent, ordering plain risotto. He also asked how to get to Balshad. Asuna handed him a coin and said, "Okay." She thanked him for the information, and he laughed slightly, reaching for the coin, and said he wasn't insisting, but since she was offering, he'd do it. Then Asana looked out the window and thought, Balshad is the rallying point for the allied forces. It looks like he's heading the same way as His Highness. They need to hurry and find him. One of the 10 strongest on the continent, a swordsman from the east. After the battle in Gid, they set off for their next destination. And although they had to set up camp at night, they had made careful preparations, considering what had happened to the Knights of the Holy Kingdom. Then the protagonist approached Raymond and said that it seemed like everyone was already used to this kind of work. He was worried that he would have to explain everything to them from the very beginning, and he said that they had set up camp at night many times. They remembered perfectly well what to do. He said, Sir Raymond, it's all thanks to him. He did a great job. Then he walked forward and said that he would go and look around. He would leave the management of the soldiers to him. He replied, His Highness. After that, MC walked into the forest and thought, deathly silence. Although there are many people here, the chances of a night ambush are much higher than he thought. Then he heard a scream. The little idiot. He peered out from behind the bushes and noticed the knights standing next to Corey, sitting on his knees. They were screaming. He told him not to leave his side. Damn Orc. At that moment, a tear rolled down Corey's face, and one of the knights said, he's definitely a spy. He's deceiving His Highness and spying on them. And he held out his hand and shouted that it was all a lie. How dare he? It was a complete lie. Then the warrior grabbed him by the glove and shouted, what the hell is a lie? He took off his glove and added that he was more than sure that he had stolen this too, and he replied that he hadn't stolen anything. They must give it back. And the knight, clearly mocking, shouted, we'll have to break it. The next second, the protagonist emerged from the bushes and said, what are they doing here, while the others are busily setting up camp? He came closer, and the confused knight said, Your Highness, this guy, well, he understands? MC said seriously. It seemed they didn't understand what he said. He offered to repeat. They must get out of here. They shouted, Yes, sir. After apologizing, they ran towards the camp. Then the protagonist sat down next to Corey and asked if he was okay. He replied, Yes, he's grateful, Your Highness. After that, the protagonist sat down next to him and, smiling, asked if he wanted him to make a serious choice for them. He replied, No, that's not necessary. Everyone loves beautiful things, but not disgusting ones. That's the way things are. Even if he helped him, he might be fine for a while, but that would only push him further away from his dream. MC asked if he could ask what his dream was. He replied that he wanted to be recognized by people and live among them. With these words, he lowered his gaze, and the protagonist thought what an unattainable dream. Now he could be among the soldiers, acting as an Orcish translator, but as soon as this sortie was over, then he placed a hand on his head and asked, Corey, he's with Hernando now, right? He replied, Well, yes. He said he needed magic. His unique skills would be useful if he wanted to live among humans. After a while, the moon rose in the sky, and MC, sitting in the tent, asked how well they had prepared for the night ambush. Raymond sat next to him and said that all the food supplies were covered with fireproof cloth to prevent combustion. They also posted sentries near the palisades and barracks. Jared added, But do they really need to go that far? He had drawn many more soldiers to this than usual. Then the protagonist pointed at the map and said, Well, after all, they were in Orc territory. Something's probably going to happen. They might use fire arrows again, like they did with the Holy Kingdom Knights. At that moment, a soldier ran into the tent and shouted, Your Highness, breaking news! They're under attack by orcs. Those present suddenly jumped up from their seats and ran outside. MC looked in surprise at the burning area and the faithful soldiers fighting the orcs. He said the situation was dire. At that moment, a barrel flew past him and exploded in a bright light. He asked, Are they using gunpowder? And Hernando said it wasn't gunpowder. It was some kind of sorcery. The mana was moving. He said that was too much. He had nothing more to say. Hernando, do they have any countermeasures for this? He extended his hand and replied, Most likely, they're just throwing bombs at them, pre-made with magic. In that case, they just need to stop the orcs throwing those bombs. After this, the protagonist shouted, Jared, Sir Raymond, they must concentrate and take command of their units. In the meantime, he would look into the face of the one behind these spectacular stunts. Then he asked, Hernando, where is the flow of magic coming from? He pointed his finger forward and said, That's where. MC moved forward and said, Okay, he'll be back soon. He abruptly ran to attack and, frowning, said, That's it. Ahead, he saw Orcval, looking at him with determination. He approached him and, pointing his sword at him, asked, So it was him? In response, the orc held his axe in front of him, blocking his attack. The protagonist jumped back and, sighing loudly, thought, He's incredibly strong, and he moves unusually. It looks like he's been in many battles. He certainly doesn't like retreating, but this distance needs to be increased slightly. The next second, Orcval attacked him with his axe, and MC began to dodge from side to side, avoiding each blow. He blocked the last blow with his sword, and then attacked, moving backwards. He thought, Okay, he gets it. He's much stronger than those he'd fought before. Then he said, Okay, then they'll see what he can do. With these words, he ran forward, extending his weapon, and Orcval swung his axe again, destroying the ground in front of him. The protagonist stopped and said, That's a mana control method. The orc's entire body was covered in powerful energy, and MC thought he should have realized this immediately when he heard they were using magic. If an orc mage can use magic, then an orc warrior can most likely use it too. He smiled and asked, So he's an elite warrior, huh? Then he shouted, "Soul Rip." Lines appeared on Orcval in front of him, and the orc attacked with his hand in front of him. But the protagonist frowned, then plunged his sword into the enemy's neck. Orcval grabbed it with his hand, and then the sword in the protagonist's hands began to tremble. He thought, "Idiot." He focused mana on the neck to minimize the damage. Then the orc shouted something incoherent and then ran his hand along the tip of the sword. MC swung the sword, cutting off several of the monster's fingers. And then Orcval grabbed an axe and struck, leaving a wound on the protagonist's shoulder, to which he smiled and said that apparently weak attacks won't work on him, meaning he concentrated the energy in his sword and said, "Okay, then they'll fight at full strength." He prepared for the attack. Orcval did the same, and the next second, two powerful energies collided. At the moment of collision, a powerful explosion occurred, and they flew apart. The shattered axe lay on the ground, and MC approached the kneeling Orcval. He swung his sword and shouted, "It's over." Then he plunged the sword into the monster's eye and stood on top of it. Then he stepped aside, and, drawing his sword, thought, "He's still alive. He's an elite warrior, so he probably knows a lot more than the others. We can't just kill him yet." Then soldiers ran up to him and shouted, "Your Highness, he's fine." Orcval. The protagonist looked at them and asked, "Yes, what's going on with the camp?" One of the knights put his hand to his chest and said that they'd killed almost all the enemies. He replied, "That's excellent. They should gather all the surviving orcs in one place and capture this one too. Today they'll begin studying the orcs." They returned to camp, and Hernando immediately began treating him. He said that the shoulders are the most vulnerable part of the body. They need to be constantly stretched. Yuri asked him to stop whining. He knew it was because of the orc. He smirked and asked, "So that means the orcs can beat him, right?" This angered him slightly, and finally, Hernando finished treating him, smiled and said he was lucky the wound wasn't serious. MC tried stretching his shoulder and gave a satisfied smile, and just as he was about to get down to business, the mage asked him to wait and ordered the soldiers to bring it here. Yuri watched their actions in bewilderment, and when they placed a luxurious chair in front of him and asked him to conduct the interrogation sitting on it, he was slightly taken aback. The mage smugly wiped his nose and said that a commander always has to be tough. It turned out that one of the soldiers was a carpenter, so they made him make this chair. A satisfied smile immediately spread across MC's face, and he said that since it was already done, nothing could be done. He sat down on the chair, and feeling the soft seat sink under his weight, said that it was quite good. After that, he cleared his throat and pulled himself together, declaring that he would now begin interrogating the prisoners. Let them drag them here one by one. The interrogation did not start very pleasantly for the orcs. One of them was dipped into a bowl of fire in front of everyone. He screamed loudly in pain. The soldier released him and threw him to the ground, and the orcs felt uneasy at this sight. Yuri said that they could only answer once, who ordered them to conduct a night ambush. One of the orcs shouted something furiously, and the translator awkwardly turned to his highness, and he told him not to worry. He realized that he had insulted him. He ordered Jared to deal with him, and he immediately grabbed the orc and dragged him to the bowl and dipped his head into the fire, but did not let go for a long time. The orcs were nervous watching his suffering, and they were simply waiting for one of them to speak. Finally, Jared let him go, but unlike the first orc, his whole body was already damaged. MC used magic and covered the blade with water, saying that he would ask each of them only once, and, depending on their answer, he would decide whether to take their life or not. He plunged the dagger into the orc's body, instantly extinguishing the flames, and ordered Jared to remove it. One of the orcs shouted something loudly. Yuri asked Corey what he was saying, and he answered that he said that they were simple soldiers and did not know anything. But Orcval gave the order, so he asked to punish Orcval, not him. The orc behind him became nervous. Apparently, he was Orcval. MC laughed contentedly and remarked that he had such aspirations. After that, he stood up and approached Orcval and asked, "Was this Okua's order?" At the mention of his name, the orc flinched and the soldiers began to whisper, as they had never heard this before. Okua, the Orc King, was the reason these allied forces were formed, and it was he who killed many knights in his past life. He definitely must be destroyed at any cost. The translator said that he was asking if he would spare him if he answered. He asked him to tell him that he would spare him, and Orcval said something else. Corey looked at his highness and said that Orcval was asking for an oath. He frowned, asking with displeasure what that meant, and Corey said that he believed that breaking his oath and attacking the enemy would show that he had no honor. He smirked and said that it looked like he had fought with many people. To think that an orc who only cared about strength would ask for something like that. Fine, he would swear an oath. Jared objected, asking what he would do when they let him go. Yuri said that everything was fine, let him calm down. He asked the translator, so this was Okua's order? He answered him that according to him, it was so. More precisely, the order was given by the chieftain of his tribe, after receiving an order from Okua. He asked, what about the allied forces? How did they know their route? Corey said that Okua had his own ways of obtaining information, but he didn't know what. Jared asked his highness to wait and asked, so it turns out that the orc named Okua somehow knew their routes and ordered an ambush, right? He confirmed this, most likely. He was also involved in the attack on the night of the Holy Kingdom. So, the last question remains, how strong is Okua? Orcval became nervous, said something with a grin, and then laughed out loud. His words made Corey very nervous, saying that even a dozen orcvals like him wouldn't stand a chance against him. He guaranteed that Okua was the strongest and most brutal creature in the world. MC reached into his pocket and said that was probably true, but he needed to know something. Humans were far more slippery and cunning than he could imagine. He pulled out something that made the orc very angry, a crystal. Seeing his look, he asked mockingly, so he changed his mind? Actually, he was considering keeping his oath. At that very moment, Orcval freed himself from the rope. Seeing this, the soldiers immediately raised their swords, and the orc jumped up and attacked Yuri with a loud roar. The soldiers immediately rushed to stop him, surrounding him and pointing sharp blades at him, and MC said he was unlucky. He dared to talk about honor when he himself was not worthy of it. After that, he turned away from him and stepped aside, ordering the soldiers to kill him. Time passed, it was deep night, and the priest of Betrayal, Germain, was still busy treating the wounded. He used magic, quickly healing wounds, and when another victim called out to him, he immediately jumped up from his place. Hernando entered the infirmary and asked him to deal with that patient first, and he would deal with this one. He thanked him for his help, and Corey said that he brought water. The priest praised him, then asked him to step aside and began casting a spell. While he imbued the water with healing properties, Corey was surprised, thinking it was just ordinary water. But after his spell, he felt a strange energy radiating from it. Germain asked him to clean the wounds with this water. It's holy, so it will remove all the infection. He soaked a rag in the water, and the priest was called to another victim. He looked at him and thought it was incredible. After the priest's incantation, the pain on their faces gave way to calm. He looked with delight at the rag in his hands and quietly said that it was magic. Finally, the sun began to rise, and the difficult night ended. They left the infirmary, and Hernando noted with a smile that at least they had somehow dealt with the victims. The priest thanked him for his help, and he told Corey with a smile that he had also done a great job. Embarrassed, he immediately pulled his hood over himself and said that it was not so at all. He had practically done nothing. Germain said that they were lucky that the damage was not that extensive. They were able to stop the fire before it spread throughout the camp. He thinks things will only get worse in the future. He folded his hands in prayer, turning to God, and Hernando said that at least there will always be hope, even in the worst situations. The priest did not understand what he was talking about, and he pointed to the fire around which the soldiers had gathered to have fun, and said that not long ago they were fighting for their lives, and now they were helping each other. He snapped his fingers, launching a bright flash high into the sky that illuminated everything with a glow, and said that their magic could help their hearts a little. The soldiers' gazes turned to the sky, their souls warmed by such a beautiful sight, as did Corey. Looking at this beauty, he thought for a moment, and then decisively turned to Hernando and asked him to teach him magic. He was even surprised at first. He hadn't heard such a thing in a long time. He stroked his head and asked why he wanted to learn magic so much. He shyly twiddled his fingers and replied that His Majesty had given him an idea, so he wanted to learn it. He liked people always smiled when they saw magic. He just wanted to be able to do what he could. Hernando smiled and said that a half-orc using magic on people would look really cool. Morning came. Yuri was sitting on a rock resting, but suddenly one of the soldiers called out to him and told him that the Knights of the Empire had arrived and that they wanted to meet him. He stood up, and the knight asked if he would go to the meeting. He replied that he should. It seemed they had decided to meet him since they were almost to Balshad. He asked the soldiers to bring them here, and soon they were here. The knight approached him and said that it was a great honor to meet him. His name was Rapio Artem, a knight and the second son of Count Xenon. He greeted him with a smile and asked if the Empire had arrived in Balshad before them. He confirmed it. They were the vanguard. They've confirmed the presence of orcs in the Balshad district, so they're notifying every unit in the vicinity. MC's gaze fell on the knight behind him, who was in no hurry to introduce himself, so he decided to find out his name himself. Rapio didn't know what to say, and then the knight stepped forward and apologized for not greeting him properly. Unfortunately, he doesn't have any honorary titles at the moment. He removed his helmet, and Yuri smiled nervously, thinking, so that's how he met him again? He's a symbol of his past, one he doesn't want to forget. Graham Hartfall. Graham introduced himself to him, saying he was a knight who had lost his title. In his past life, MC begged him for mercy, begged him not to kill him. He said he was pleased to meet him, and asked him not to treat him with such respect, as he was not a knight at the moment. He asked, since he said he had no title, did that mean he was participating in this war without one? He smiled awkwardly and confirmed it, even though it was humiliating. Rapio said he had done nothing wrong. He had just gotten the wrong senior. Graham asked him to stop, and he asked discontentedly, wasn't he right? There were no other knights in the world as famous as him. Yuri thought he had heard that Graham had lost his knight title due to certain reasons from the Empire, and he would never have thought that he would meet him like this in the Allied forces. This thought made him smile. However, the wise and chivalrous man he knew was now doubting his own worthiness. He smiled and said that he had heard a lot about him. It was a great honor for him to meet him. Graham felt awkward and said that he did not need to flatter him, and he extended his hand to him, saying that he still always wanted to ask him something. Would he like to come to Betrayal? He remembered the past. He hates the Knights of the Empire, but he is different. In his past life, he spared him and let him go, and he had to pay for it himself. That is why he is so kind to him now. He said that if he comes to Betrayal, he guarantees that he will be treated well. Graham smiled faintly, then bowed his head and refused him, asking for forgiveness. He responded that there was nothing wrong with that. He respected his choice. In fact, he knew that he would say that. After a while, they finally arrived at the gates of the city of Balshad, the assembly point of the Allied troops. MC examined the majestic walls and noticed that this city was much larger than he thought. Hernando agreed with him. The city was indeed large, despite being located in the middle of an open field. Yuri asked if they built this wall with magic. The Balshad dukes had been mages for many generations. The mage smiled and confirmed this. There were many mages in the entire family. By the way, he should be careful. He would be eaten alive if he let his guard down for even a second. MC asked if he was talking about a mage duke. He wondered what this duke looked like and imagined an arrogant old man, which made him uneasy. Well, he would find out everything when he met him. The gates opened and they entered the city, and soon the reception began. Many aristocrats had gathered in the banquet hall, and the Duchess of Balshad, Mary Rose Entree, came out to greet them. Yuri noted that she was not an arrogant old man at all, and Hernando laughed and said that the ruling generation had recently changed. She approached them and said that she was extremely happy to meet the Betrayal Knights. She sat down next to Yuri and asked, "He must be the third prince of Betrayal?" He coldly answered her that he was the commander of the Betrayal troops, and she said that she had heard that he was quite handsome, and these rumors were true. She asked him not to consider her question rude and asked how old he was. He told her that he was 18, and she moved closer to him, noticing that he was only 4 years younger than her. She thinks that they have a lot in common. He said that he wouldn't be sure of it, and seeing her smile, he thought that she knew how to use her beauty. She uses her smile to charm people and take possession of them. However, he doesn't get along well with such people. Whatever her intentions, he can't treat them positively. He said that age means nothing. If two people have the same values, then regardless of age, gender, or background, they can still become friends. She grinned and asked, "So that's what he thinks?" After that, she stood up and asked the Brucen Knights to take a break for a moment. These honorable guests were in front of them, the Betrayal National Army and the Third Prince. They would fight alongside them against a common enemy, and they could get to know each other better. Jared turned to Hernando and whispered, asking what she had suddenly started doing. He laughed and said that he didn't think there was a good reason. She just really liked making friends. Jared asked, "Is Brucen also here? Isn't it a small country on the outskirts of the Empire?" MC confirmed this and said that, moreover, there were a lot of sailors there, since the country was located near the ocean. They were strong and unyielding. A man suddenly approached him with a bottle of wine in his hands and introduced himself as the commander of the Brucen forces, Jonathan Eagle. He decided to fill his glass and he allowed him to do so, saying that he would be very grateful to him. When the glass was half full, he said that what he was seeing now was quite unexpected. "Is he sure it's wine?" He chuckled and said that such an exquisite liqueur was not suitable for a rural place like Brucen. Their expressions immediately changed. All of Jonathan's goodwill evaporated, and he said that he was glad that they knew it themselves. One of the soldiers named Proin exclaimed. He decided to make fun of them because they were from the village? He would have attacked him if not for his comrade, and he told him to let him go. He looked down on them. Jonathan waved his hand and told them to stop and calm down, then asked the prince if they should take what he said as a mockery of Brucen. He asked in response, what if that was the case? Should he apologize? Jonathan smiled and said that there was no need. He thought he did it for one of two reasons. First, he, the third prince of Betrayal, is, as people say, an extremely rude and ill-mannered man. And second, he is testing them because he wants to know if they are truly suitable for an alliance with him. The soldier got angry and told the captain to step aside. He would teach him a lesson, and Yuri stood up and said that there was nothing more terrible on the battlefield than an ally he couldn't trust. So, were they ready to prove themselves? Jonathan agreed and said that a knight proves himself through his sword. The Duchess clapped her hands, drawing attention to herself, and said that in that case, she would accompany them to the training grounds. They went outside, and the two knights prepared for battle. Meanwhile, MC, the Duchess, and Jonathan took their places to watch them. Mary Rose asked if he had started this fight on purpose, and yet, whatever the case, she didn't mind, since now she had something to watch. Yuri asked with a smirk. Was she pretending to be innocent now? Hadn't she set this all up from the start? She pointed out that he was the one who took advantage of this opportunity without thinking. He thought that testing the skills of the Brucen Knights was very important. There's one more thing he wants to check. In the future, one of them will receive a title given only to the strongest on the continent, like his father. The top 10, one of them will be on that list, and it wouldn't hurt him to know in advance who it will be. Meanwhile, the two knights introduced themselves to each other. Proin and Laurent were about to fight. They shook hands, and Proin mockingly said that his respect ended there. He wasn't expecting any fun. Laurent remained silent, and everyone prepared for the spectacle. And after a short pause, he said that he looked forward to the opportunity to learn something during this duel. MC thought about the top 10. On the entire continent, where many people live, the top 10 was a kind of confirmation granted to those who came closest to the title of strongest. Their names wield unimaginable, overwhelming power, in all the national conflicts and wars that flare up across the continent. He will undoubtedly have an advantage if he can win over those with a promising future. By the way, male friendship usually begins with a fight. Proen told Laurent that he had heard his name many times. He seems to be a genius, having won several tournaments. Did he just win some simple ceremonial events and games of nobility? He pounced on him and exclaimed that his swordsmanship was the same as that of a common nobleman. Laurent easily dodged his attack and quickly moved behind him. Proen thought that, as expected, his swordsmanship and movements were similar to those you could read in textbooks, but they were extremely predictable. He smirked and swung his sword, confident of his victory, and Laurent at the same moment slightly ducked and struck back. A loud clang was heard. Jonathan jumped up from his seat in surprise, and Yuri thoughtfully touched his chin. Laurent won by catching Proen off guard. MC smirked and thought that Laurent usually never opened up, but this time he deliberately showed his vulnerability, enticing his opponent to attack his shoulder. Immediately after the attack, he twisted his wrist to parry it. Then he shifted his center of gravity and parried the attack, simultaneously preparing his own attack. Of course, the knight from Brusen also fought magnificently. A normal knight would have lost, exposed, and unable to keep up with Laurent's speed. However, Laurent accurately read the attack and created an opening in his opponent's defense for an attack. The knight put away his sword, and Proen smiled and said he'd caught him. He accepted his defeat. He'd done well. Laurent replied with a smile that he'd enjoyed their sparring, and they shook hands. The knights from Brusen applauded joyfully, and Jonathan said that, as expected of Betrayal, the country of knights, he'd done magnificently. Yuri said there was no need for praise. The knight from Brusen had fought well too. Now the score was 1-0, and don't let him say he'd retreat after one defeat. Jonathan told him that, of course, that wasn't true, then called Jose and said it was his turn to spar. Jose said he understood and slung the heavy sword over his shoulder, and MC remarked that he looked quite strong, and the Duchess was delighted by his muscles. Jose Aratour stepped into the center of the arena, awaiting his opponent, and Jonathan said that Jose was the strongest in their division, and that he also wanted to become the strongest in all of Brusen. Yuri grinned and ordered Jared onto the arena. He grew nervous and asked, confused, "Are you sure?" He ordered him to move, and with a heavy sigh, he put on his helmet and stepped forward, supported by his comrades. Jose was so tall that he had to duck to shake his hand. He introduced himself and said he was looking forward to their sparring, and Jared, confused, responded by telling him his name. He grew nervous and thought that everything was bad. His face, no matter how he looked at it, was the face of a warrior who had won many battles. Jose noticed his intense gaze and remarked that he seemed to enjoy sizing up his opponent. He waved his sword, saying that he would attack first, and the knight flinched in fear. The next second, he saw a huge warrior above him with a sword raised above his head, and thought that he should block this attack. He was very confused and realized that he wouldn't be able to block it, and at the last moment he took a step to the side and almost fell, and the heavy sword hit the ground. After that, Jose launched another attack, and he stepped back, dodging. The blade passed so close to his face that it cut a couple of strands of hair, and Jose said that it was not the time to be distracted. Jared was scared. His opponent unleashed a whole series of blows on him, which he was able to parry, and blocking the last heavy blow was difficult for him. MC thought that Jose's strength was comparable to an orc, and at the same time, his swordsmanship was owned to perfection. Moreover, he moved perfectly. Of course, in the future, he should deserve the title of top 10 strongest. Meanwhile, Jose effortlessly grabbed Jared and threw him over himself, causing him to fall face down on the ground. The fight stopped, and Jared stood up, trying to clear his throat, and Jose offered him his hand and said with a smile that it was a good sparring. He was surprised that he could last so long. He accepted his help, and in return said that he learned a lot from this sparring. Yuri stood up and said that now the count was 1-1. They both did well, and that was where he proposed to end it. His knights were happy, and Marirose said that she thought they could now say that they knew each other. He agreed with her. In combat, it was extremely important to trust your allies. She said that, to be honest, she was a little disappointed. She touched his shoulder and sat him back down, noting that he said that they should get to know each other better. But in doing so, he completely forgot about her. She ran her hand over his cheek. Her charms were right at his eye level, but he did not give in and remained unfazed, which disappointed her. Jonathan interrupted the awkward moment by reminding her that she had said she would show them her office. She tiredly ruffled her hair and turned to him, noting that she had actually said that. He asked, could she show it to them right now? Many people were very interested in this. She half-heartedly agreed and turned to Yuri, asking, what about him? Will he join them? He hastily stood up and declined, citing that he needed to deal with his knights, after which he quickly ran away from her. Her face turned red with anger, and Jonathan laughed, after which she loudly exclaimed that this was so annoying. Sometime later, all the allied forces arrived in Balshad. When word spread that even the commander-in-chief of the Imperial Army had arrived, each knight began to assess the strength of their allies, except for the Betrayal knights, of course. MC was training outside when Hernando approached him, asking if he was sure they should focus on training. He confirmed it, and worriedly noted that the other squad leaders were already sharing their strategies and grouping up. He smiled and said that of course, it was just a farce. Only the strongest from each country were forming groups. It was obvious that their pride simply knew no bounds. Everyone thought they were stronger than everyone else, so words were useless here. Hernando remembered how they had behaved and agreed with him, and he thought that in the end, it would be best for them to simply demonstrate their strength. He turned to the knight and asked if he was ready to spar. Laurent approached him and said that it was a great honor to spar with him. He pointed his sword at him and ordered him not to retreat, and Laurent smirked and prepared for battle, saying that he understood everything. Seeing his mana, MC thought that, as expected, his was very pure. He really is an extremely suitable partner for sparring. Laurent pounced on him first, swung his sword, and he blocked the blow, after which his opponent imbued the sword with mana and lunged. He made several thrusts, trying to hit Yuri, and he, looking at the blade right in front of his face, thought that his accuracy was excellent. Such a precise trajectory of the sword, not a single mistake, he was always like this. Even when he killed him, his sword was just as pure as if its purity contradicted his emotions. Therefore, he wants to know the future in which his sword will cover his back. Then he too will be able to protect him. MC began to furiously swing his sword, parrying his strikes, which even forced him to retreat. But after that, he immediately rushed to attack, and Yuri ran towards him with a smile. Their swords and gazes clashed. The knights cheered joyfully, supporting both of them, and Jared asked if they really needed to try so hard during a regular sparring match. Suddenly, a voice behind him said that the prince was not bad. He turned around, and his eyes widened in surprise. Jose was in front of him. He smiled at him beamingly, then loudly addressed His Highness and said that he had a favor to ask of him. He turned to him, distracted from the fight, and Jose said that he would also like to spar. He smiled and said that he understood everything. He would lend him Jared. Jared was very surprised, and when Jose threw him over his shoulder and carried him somewhere, he indignantly called out to the prince, and the prince wished him luck. After that, Laurent bowed to him and thanked him for the opportunity to learn something from him. He said that he looked forward to the next sparring match, and they parted. MC decided to rest a bit in the shade of a tree. He sat down on the grass, sighed heavily, and asked Asan with a serious expression what news there was. It seemed she had improved. She appeared from the shadows on the other side of the tree and answered him that perhaps that was true, although her skills were much more effective in all sorts of valleys. He asked how her investigation into the stranger was going. She told him that his traces had been found in Balshad, and he thought that the stranger was a man from the east, one of the top 10 strongest on the continent. In his past life, he fought Okua alone. It is still unknown why he fought him then, but the enemy of his enemy is his friend. He said that they must find him before the battle with Okua. She told him that she understood everything, and he thought that they had little time because in the battle against Okua, he would be ousted from his place in the top 10. The Emperor's half-brother and the current commander-in-chief of the Allied forces, Ragnar Gustav Granzayan. He had met him in his past life. One day, he and Catherine decided to have some privacy. They went into a room, and Catherine asked him to stop. What if they got caught? He said with a playful smile that she was worrying too much. Everything was fine. There was no one around. She sheepishly objected, and when he said that he would take full responsibility, she finally allowed him to do so. But suddenly someone's voice rang out. Her uncle, lying on the couch, called them brats and told them to go to another room. Yuri immediately retreated, and Catherine fearfully called out to her uncle. MC asked, "So it was him?" Ragnar sighed heavily, telling them to stop making noise. It irritated him so much. Actually, he wanted to ask him something. Yuri immediately became agitated, and patting his niece on the head, asked if he really liked her. He confirmed it, and Ragnar didn't press him further, telling him to forget about it, that they would handle everything themselves, and he would leave. At that moment, MC smiled and thought that he had realized at first glance he is a professional. Right now, they were all gathered in the meeting room, waiting for the commander-in-chief. One of them said that it wasn't that easy to meet him, but it was good that he was here. This is a great opportunity to make a new acquaintance with someone from the imperial family. Yuri thought that even during a war, they constantly try to play politics, and at that moment, Ragnar's voice was heard behind him, and he flinched in surprise. The commander-in-chief walked past him with a grin and said that they looked like they were having a lot of fun. He took his seat and added that despite this, if they relaxed even a little, they would have no end of problems. He would say right away that he hates cowards. After that, the whole room filled with incredible pressure, and MC thought that this was the lion's heart of the imperial prince. Such an impressive performance. Ragnar menacingly said that if anyone decided to escape, he would personally execute them. Moreover, he considered them all knights, so they would be rewarded, taking into account their skills and achievements. Do they have any questions? The knights exchanged glances, hesitant to ask anything, but since Yuri knew his inclinations well, he decided to ask him a question. He liked those who carry themselves with pride, people who are confident in themselves, even if they lack skill. He asked how the Empire assessed the strength of orcs. Ragnar smiled and asked who he was. He introduced himself with the same smile and thought that he liked those who possessed skill and composure most of all. The commander-in-chief liked him immediately, and said that he had been wondering who he was, but it turned out he was the one Jorg had mentioned. He stood up and remarked that it was a good question. At the moment, they confirmed that an orc calling himself Okua had appeared, having absorbed 3 orc tribes. He approached Yuri from behind and, placing a hand on his shoulder, reached for the map on the table and said that his strength was growing at a terrifying rate, and the enemy vanguard had set up camp near Balshad. The day after tomorrow, they would begin the battle. It would be the first battle of the allied forces. He turned to Yuri and asked if he would like to join the vanguard. He remained silent. An oppressive silence reigned in the room, and he, taking a deep breath, answered in agreement. He was honored to have the opportunity to fight in the vanguard. Night fell, he returned to camp, and while he was resting by the fire and thinking, he saw the Duchess and asked what she was thinking when she came here. She sat down next to him and said that he had managed to take the position in the vanguard that everyone had dreamed of. He didn't look too strong, so she was curious. He noticed that she seemed very interested in him, and she said with a smile that she couldn't help herself. After all, he hadn't given her a chance to get to know him better. The lives of the Balshad residents were at stake, and she couldn't just trust anyone because she was too worried. So, instead of these empty words, let him give her a serious answer. If he answered her, she would definitely help him on the battlefield. He asked how she would help him, and she asked if he had forgotten. She released the flames from her hands and said that she was a mage, and she assured him that she would be much more useful than Hernando. He remained silent and looked thoughtfully at the fire, after which he said in a cold tone that they would not do without casualties. He stood up and looked around the entire camp, saying that the vanguard on the battlefield was the most visible place where many soldiers died. The people they were eating and talking with right now would eventually die because he had made this decision. He doesn't want to seem sentimental. He just wants to shoulder this heavy burden properly. Her eyes widened in surprise. She immediately jumped up from her seat and exclaimed that his answer touched her deeply. Of course, she didn't like the fact that he was looking at the soldiers and not at her. She extended her hand to him and said with a smile that she would help him in his first battle. He shook her hand and thanked her, saying that he would count on her. A few days later, the battle between the Allied forces and the Orc army began. The commander-in-chief and Maryrose, along with the rest of the soldiers, took places in the back, and MC and his knights, as befits the vanguard, were in front. He told the soldiers to prepare for battle, while the commander-in-chief said that the time would soon come to bring out their vanguard, and turned to the Duchess, asking what she was doing here. She answered him with a smile that she had been asked to do something in the name of Prince Briol. One of the soldiers blew a horn, warning of the approaching enemies, and Yuri, looking at the Orc army running towards them, turned to the soldiers and asked if they were ready. They confirmed this, and he urged his horse forward at full speed, exclaiming that they were starting. The commander-in-chief was watching them closely. Prince Briol was ahead of everyone, and it was reckless to do so. He could die. Maryrose suddenly asked him to step back, and waving her staff, created a huge fireball in the sky and said that this is what she was asked to do. She pointed her staff at the Orc army, and the fireball immediately rushed there. But the soldiers were close to the enemy army, and because of this, there was a risk of hitting them. This didn't escape the commander-in-chief's notice, and he worriedly told her that they were too close. Their soldiers were about to come under fire, but the Duchess wasn't worried and said that this was exactly what Yuri had asked for. Along with the fireball, he approached the Orc army and, with a smile, struck the first blow and stopped. And a second later, an explosion occurred in front of him. He pulled his sword forward, used magic, and doused each soldier with water so they could walk through the fire. The commander-in-chief carefully watched the progress of the battle. The entire battlefield was ablaze, but they didn't care. MC rushed forward, ordering everyone else to attack as well, and they began to chop down the orcs weakened by the explosion, but some of them were still full of strength. Then Yuri picked up someone's spear and threw it at the head of one of the monsters, and at that moment, a lizard jumped at him, but his soldiers dealt with it. Jose smiled and said that, as he thought, they deserved the title of national knights. Isn't it time for them to prove themselves? He jumped off his horse and swung his sword, killing an orc, while Sybil ordered her knights to protect Briol's soldiers. With their combined forces, the enemy formation was destroyed, and the commander-in-chief smiled and remarked that it was very interesting. Because their commander was crushing the enemies at the front, the soldiers' morale reached its peak. Moreover, he asked the Duchess to hit the enemies with magic, while creating a water barrier to protect his soldiers. He told the Duchess that it was still extremely reckless. Did she help him, knowing it would happen? She replied that when she first heard the plan, she also tried to stop him, but in the end he handled everything perfectly. A man with a surprise, isn't it wonderful? The commander-in-chief agreed with her. It wasn't so bad for the Allied forces' first battle. In the end, this battle resulted in the complete rout of the enemy. Night fell. Maryrose was sitting in her office and working, and suddenly she felt someone's presence. She looked away and frowned, saying that it was certainly good that Prince Briol was able to win this battle, but who said that he could enter her room without permission? Fernando appeared before her and awkwardly scratched the back of his head, saying that she did not need to be so cold. He was her teacher, after all. Didn't she at least want to ask how he had been doing all this time? She grinned and asked, what kind of teacher would abandon his student like that? What was he doing here? He sat down on the sofa opposite her and answered her that he wanted to see his student's progress. He was talking about what she was currently studying, the formula of transcendental interpretation. She said that she was able to figure out something. Originally, this magic was intended to connect languages and understand their meanings. They had now managed to link their language with ancient magic. Fernando asked her to let him know if she could go any further, and she asked, dissatisfied, why she needed it. He asked in response, wasn't she interested in Prince Yuri? It was connected to his destiny, which was why he needed her help. She became slightly nervous and noted that he seemed very concerned about his fate, but he knew that a great wizard could not interfere with human history. He replied that he knew this, but many people were already involved in his fate, including the commander of the Imperial Knights. At this time, the commander-in-chief summoned Yuri to his tent and assigned him to a reconnaissance mission, which confused him. Tomorrow, they would enter the eastern lands into Orcish territory, and he expected ambushes there. The entire army would be moving under great pressure. MC explained that this meant he wanted to form separate units responsible for protecting the allied forces. Ragnar remarked that he was quite smart, and he thought for a moment, then said that he was grateful for this. But Briol's troops had already been in the vanguard in the last battle, and he should give another army a chance if he wanted to maintain justice. Ragnar replied that they were the best of them all. He only trusted skills he had seen with his own eyes, and he would prefer Briol to participate in this mission. Yuri cut him off and offered him another option. After this, news spread through the camp about the creation of a reconnaissance unit to protect the allied forces. He decided not to take just anyone, but to select people, holding a competition among all the soldiers who applied to join the reconnaissance unit. Sybil was surprised by this, and Jonathan and Jose were very interested. While the two discussed this over a glass of beer, Jose said that it seemed His Highness was taking this task seriously. Jonathan noted that he didn't want any mediocre soldiers to end up in the reconnaissance unit, so he decided to do so. He hadn't felt such a competitive spirit in a long time. And now, Hernando was reporting this news to Yuri. His Highness told them to find the orcs along the route they would take and cut off their right ears. Future orders would be based on their results during this competition. He finished reading the commander-in-chief's order and looked at Yuri with confusion, asking if he had suggested this idea. He confirmed it and said that since it was the commander-in-chief's order, absolutely every country would participate, and through this competition, they would be able to fully understand each other's strengths. Jared worriedly said that a reconnaissance mission was very different from regular battles. They were not experts in this. He told him that everything was fine. He had a plan. The next morning, the commander-in-chief called everyone together and said that he would move forward with the allied forces. They were to go ahead of them and deal with the orcs. The country that brought back the most ears would be prioritized when issuing orders next. All three prepared themselves. Then the commander flipped the hourglass and announced the start of the competition. They all immediately dispersed in different directions, and Ragnar smirked, and one of his soldiers said that it seemed like he was relying heavily on Prince Briol. He asked, "Is it that obvious? He's still young, but he already sees potential in him. If he succeeds this time, he'll probably take a closer look at him." Meanwhile, MC and his troops ran forward along the route, saw it, and Jared worriedly asked, "He does have a plan, right?" He answered that they needed to find the orcs first, and he irritably noted that they didn't just need to find them. This made Yuri laugh and assured him that everything was fine. He had a plan. One of his soldiers noticed the orcs to the northeast and warned the others. The orcs ran right in front of them, ignoring them, and then he took out a crystal to lure them here. Noticing the bright light, the orcs immediately stopped and stared at the crystal in fascination, after which they ran straight towards them. While waiting for them, MC told the soldiers to remember one simple thing: they need their right ears, so don't overdo it. He ordered everyone to attack and struck the first blow, while Jared jumped off his horse and pounced on the rider in the air, piercing his body with his sword, and then joined the other soldiers. Yuri at this time encountered the leader of this squad. He quickly approached him on horseback and, just as the orc was about to strike, he swung his sword and decapitated him. After that, he stopped and looked around the battlefield. All the orcs were dead. He had prepared a couple of things for this mission. The first was the crystal necklace taken from the bandits, and a few other things. Jared approached him with a bag in his hands and said that they had killed 10 orcs. At this rate, they could win this competition. MC took out a dagger and said with a smirk that this was not enough, and he completely did not understand what he was talking about. Then he plunged the dagger into the ground. A bright beam of light shot into the sky, and now Jared understood what he was planning. Yuri told his warriors that they would hunt all the orcs in the area, and only after killing them all would they return. Soul rupture is a strange method of control that can become anything, depending on the owner's desire. By detecting vibrations with the earthquake sword, imbued with the power of the soul rupture, and then distributing it into this power, he will be able to recognize everything on the ground, even if he cannot see it. Evening fell. The commander-in-chief glanced at the hourglass and said that the time had come. He would now announce the results of the competition. Let them bring him bags with orc ears. Representatives of several countries approached him awkwardly, and he, taking one of them, discovered it was empty. He asked with displeasure, whose side was this bag? And was this what they wanted to be part of the reconnaissance? He tossed the bag aside, saying it was simply pathetic, and called the next one. But the next bags were also empty. He was disappointed that so many countries hadn't managed to kill a single orc, and then they brought him Bruson's bag. He emptied the contents onto the table and said that there were 6 ears, the best result so far. Jonathan said with a smile that they were just lucky. They managed to find their scouts. Ragna smiled contentedly and noted that luck is also a skill. Many people died simply because they were unlucky. Besides, their imperial army had also sent scouts. He realized that they shouldn't just stand by and decided to participate too. He emptied the ears from his bag. There were 12 of them. Jonathan thought that he knew the imperial army was strong, but they managed to collect twice as many ears as they did, and he was still silent about the fact that they started an hour later than them. Sybil was also unhappy and thought, are they now openly showing that they are some kind of cannon fodder? Ragna noticed their reaction and told them not to be upset. Their future results were more important now. After that, he turned to the soldier and asked, is that all? He answered him that there was one more country left, after which MC put the bag on the table, and everyone was very surprised to see that it was completely full. Ragnar smiled nervously and asked what that meant. What was his secret? He answered him that there was no secret, they just tried very hard. At night, they returned to the camp. Jared was supervising how the soldiers were carrying various boxes. A knight from another country passed by, rudely pushing him with his shoulder. He turned around and saw how disdainfully he was looking at him, thought what was wrong with him. After that, he went to His Highness and told him that knights from other countries were increasingly trying to start a fight with them. He stood up and asked, is it true? They went somewhere, and the knight said that it seemed like they were spreading some rumors about them. They were clearly hostile. Yuri noted that nothing could be done about it. After all, they were in the center of attention now. They're probably jealous of them for being able to snag a spot in intelligence. Let him just ignore them and everything will be fine. Right now, the fact that they caught the orc mage is far more important. They approached the huge cage where Corey was already waiting for them. MC asked him if he'd managed to find out anything, and the mage stopped him from saying anything, shouting something loudly. Corey nervously said that he was saying black dog. Apparently, there's a rumor going around among them that there's a knight in their ranks who can smell orcs like a dog. Jared almost burst out laughing, but held back, and Yuri asked if that's what they called him. Corey said that the mage was telling him to be proud of himself, since not every enemy of the orcs has a nickname. He said that he understood everything, of course, but why dog and not wolf? Hearing a quiet chuckle behind him, he immediately turned to the knight and asked with displeasure, does that mean he thinks it's funny? He looked away and said that it wasn't like that at all, and MC smiled and asked, so, has his terrifying reputation spread among the orcs now? It's understandable. After all, he's been doing very well lately. Corey confirmed this and said that, more precisely, they say that the Empire's black dog has recently set his sights on Okua's life. The mention of the Empire immediately made him lose all his joy and angrily asked, does that mean they think he's the Empire's dog? He was so angry that he drew his sword to punish them for it, and Jared immediately began to calm him down and excitedly said that he would conduct the interrogation in his place. At this rate, he would simply kill them all. He calmed down, and the knight breathed a sigh of relief, and Corey said that there was information about orc barracks found in the Gurung region. Okua's direct subordinate, the head of the Gurung tribe, Kurui, had already completed preparations for the attack of the allied forces. Moreover, Kurui, who united the tribe by force alone, is considered an extremely powerful warrior. He says that he defeated them before they could even reach Okua. Yuri patted him on the head and said that he had done an excellent job, after which he told Jared that he would leave the rest to him, and he himself would report everything to the commander-in-chief. When he came to his tent, the first thing he did was ask if he had a lover. He was slightly confused by this question and answered him that he did not have a lover, and he asked how old he was. He answered him that he was 18 years old and asked what he was getting at. Ragna said that, of course, such things shouldn't be said during a war, but as he'd already seen, he had a very pretty niece. MC was shocked, and Ragna patted him on the shoulder, telling him he could go now. They'd talk about it another time. Yuri came out of his tent in the same shock and thought, his niece is very pretty. He immediately remembered Catherine and ruffled his hair, shouting that this would never happen. He must avoid her at all costs. Concerned about his condition, Sybil approached him and asked what happened. He didn't look very well. He looked up at her and immediately had a great idea, and she asked suspiciously why he was looking at her like that. To avoid this conversation, he needs to pretend that he is dating someone, anyone. He needs someone who not only loves him, but is in his debt, someone who cannot refuse him, and the perfect candidate for this role is Sybil. He put his hands on her shoulders and asked with a smile if she remembered that he once saved her. She confirmed this, and he said that he would soon need her help, Only she could help him with this. She didn't understand what he was talking about, and he quickly said goodbye to her and ran off, and she worriedly asked him to at least explain himself before leaving. She looked after him in bewilderment, not understanding what was wrong with him. And suddenly Sir Fennec appeared behind her and called out to her with an enticing smile. She was even scared from surprise and asked what happened. He smiled broadly and remarked that they looked good together. He would sincerely root for the two of them. Realizing what he was talking about, she felt sick. The next day they set out, and Jared told His Highness that he had heard something. He knew the reason why the prince kept calling him to his place. There was a rumor that they were discussing marriage. He irritably asked what nonsense he was talking about. Let him finally come to his senses. He looked at the other knights who were smiling and asked, were they apparently bored to believe such ridiculous rumors? A raven flew overhead, and he looked up to see a flock of them circling in the sky. The horses started acting strange, and he asked what was going on. Jared offered to ride ahead and find out what was going on, and he decided to go with him. He and the commander-in-chief rushed forward into the gorge, and what they saw made them uneasy. Bodies impaled on stakes were ahead, and Jared's face darkened. Ragna chuckled nervously and remarked that this was an amusing welcoming ceremony. MC immediately covered his nose from the foul smell and thought that the orcs were using the human bodies as decorations. They hadn't even finished eating them and did it only to show off. They were literally saying their worth. He turned to His Highness and said that this would greatly undermine the soldiers' morale and that he should let them deal with it. Ragna left it to them. And then Yuri turned to his soldiers, ordering them to prepare torches. After this, they dismounted from their horses and began to pile the bodies into one pile and burn them. One of them was uneasy at the sight and kept wondering how they could have done such a thing, and MC advised him to just not think about it. Looking around, he noticed Guinness and Duke nearby and told them not to go too far. They told him they would be back soon and began collecting arrows. One of them asked if this place seemed strange to him. The arrows were aimed at the ground, but the orcs didn't pierce the bodies with that end of the arrows. It was as if they were shooting them from somewhere above. And he was right. Right then, there was a squad of orcs on the cliff, and an archer fired an arrow at one of them. Hearing a wheeze, Duke looked at his comrade, and when blood spurted from his mouth and he fell, he screamed loudly in fear. Jared immediately drew his sword, warning the others that the enemy was attacking, and the archers no longer hid and began firing. Duke froze in horror, thinking that they were finished. He had to run, but what would happen to Guinness then? What could he do? Yuri rushed to their aid and ordered him to step back, then pushed him aside and swung his sword, deflecting the arrows. After that, he looked at Guinness and said that it looked like he was still alive. He turned to the soldiers, ordering them to request help from the Holy Kingdom. When they asked for help, they should say his name. It would help them. The soldiers took the wounded Guinness away, and MC glared at the orcs with hatred, thinking that they had caught them out. And then there was their attitude towards them. They were leaving as if they had given all the necessary warnings. So they were showing that they could kill them at any time? Gritting his teeth, he said he would accept this provocation, but he couldn't just let it go. He returned to camp and reported what had happened to the commander-in-chief, who remarked that it was all very sad. There were no other options. They needed to eliminate them. What would he do about it? Yuri smiled and asked what he thought. He simply needed his archers to suppress the enemy in ambush so they couldn't escape. Meanwhile, they would occupy the top of the gorge. After some time, the battle continued, and the orcs waited. One of them noticed something was wrong and looked into the distance, frozen for a moment. Suddenly, several arrows flew past the orc, and he froze and cried out. The knights continued firing at the creatures, and Ragna ordered them to simply not let the orcs escape, or things would go badly. After these words, the knights climbed the cliff face directly behind Yuri, who was confident in his own strength. He was hunting them. As they crawled, the knight turned to His Highness and said that he was rushing too much. Since they were going into the thick of things, they needed to conserve their strength, but he was incredibly tired and tried to catch his breath as he uttered these words. Yuri understood that he should take care of himself first. Such a young man had such pitiful stamina. He thought about how the students were buying them time, so they must act. If they were late, something bad would happen. Suddenly, he was stunned by what he saw and heard the knight's cries. "Your Highness!" A huge boulder, foreshadowing danger, began to loom toward them from directly above the cliff. The protagonist used his magical powers and drew several daggers around himself to try to protect his knights. He thrust these daggers into the cliff and spread them out in a circle so that he could use them as a ladder to climb up and stop the enormous approaching boulder. He looked confidently ahead and continued the struggle, grabbing the dagger and trying to climb up. He was hanging by only one hand and was very tired, after which he shouted, "Are they all right?" His knights replied, "Yes, sir." He replied, "Everything is fine. They should keep climbing." At that moment, he threw himself upward and, with a high leap, finally climbed the cliff. When he landed safely, he pushed off the ground with his hand and said, "God, he doesn't even know how to thank them." He didn't expect them to greet him so warmly. He found himself surrounded by scores of orcs, who were getting closer and closer, growling loudly in hostility toward their opponent. Yuri was confident in his abilities, muttering with a smile that it was him, the bastards. One of the orcs began to growl even louder, and Yuri rushed forward and slit the creature's throat, followed by several others. Orc blood spilled directly onto Yuri's face, but he didn't stop fighting, engaging each approaching monster. Yuri, he muttered, probably thought this blow would only cost him an arm, but how could it feel? Now he couldn't even put all his strength into the blow, and yet, it was quite problematic. He smiled and continued his fight with ease. Slicing off the limbs of one monster after another, he gradually destroyed them, until suddenly danger appeared, when one of the orcs pointed a sharp spear at him from behind. The protagonist barely managed to parry this attack with his sword, and gritted his teeth from exhaustion. He asked the knights how long they would be there. His entire body shook with exhaustion, and they shouted that they were almost there. At that moment, one of the knights grabbed the edge of the cliff and climbed up with another. Despite being incredibly tired and trying to catch their breath, they immediately began attacking the remaining orcs and defending their master. The protagonists, determined to win, shouted that they had no time to catch their breath. They must attack now. One knight after another approached their target, all shouting as they attacked the orcs. The knights grew in number and fought all the arriving monsters. Ragnar watched the events below, calmly pondering them, his gaze filled with confidence in the outcome. After some time, the entire regiment returned to their camp. They lit a fire, and Yuri reported that because they had taken care of the hidden enemies, the main forces were able to cross the gorge without losses. The knight mentioned that the fortress of the Kurui, a subordinate of the Okua, was ahead, and Yuri added that they had done a great job. The knight continued by saying that the princess of the Holy Kingdom also wanted to convey something to him. He was surprised and asked, "Does he mean Sybil?" She wrote to him that she was sad that he was doing all the work alone, so if he needed priests, they could send them. That's what she said. The knight also asked, "His Highness, do the two of them have some kind of relationship?" He was simply assuming. Yuri snapped, "No. That assumption is incorrect. That's all. If there's nothing more to report to him, then let him go." Yuri became very angry, and the knight bowed and replied, "Yes, let him get some rest." The protagonist looked at the map and thought for a moment. He thought he'd get some rest, but suddenly he saw Asana behind him and asked how long she'd been here. She replied that she'd found the pagan, and Yuri smiled and asked, "What? Just in time," he asked. "But where is he?" She replied that he was here now and pointed to the mountains on the map. Yuri was surprised and asked, "So she means the pagan is in orc territory? Is he working with the orcs?" She replied that it was more likely the other way around. She couldn't go far due to the increased danger, but the pagan had been captured and imprisoned. She understands his interest, but please let him be careful, Your Highness, because it seems he was captured for some reason. If the allied forces had interfered with him, he would likely have simply turned against them. This stranger deliberately became a prisoner of the orcs, right? Should she go and investigate again there? He replied that there was no need to do that. It would be better if it were as it was. He would meet him himself. In any case, the stranger was targeting the Okua, and since they had the same goals, he could be lured away. He turned to Asana and said that when the battle began tomorrow, she should immediately infiltrate the orc's territory before his arrival and simply monitor the situation. Asana looked at the floor silently and didn't answer. Yuri noticed this strange reaction and asked again, "What was wrong?" She replied that if he was going to meet the stranger, she would go with him, since he was dangerous and she wanted to protect him, His Highness. He looked at her in surprise, then stood up and, calling her by name, accepted her not as a bodyguard. He could protect his own life. She hid her face with her hood and remained silent, and after a while, replied that she understood everything. Yuri breathed a sigh of relief, then turned to her again and asked if she'd like a snack before leaving. Someone had passed him something. It tasted simply amazing. He pulled out a plate of goodies and was about to set it on the table, when suddenly Asana vanished, and he spoke this out loud. When it became completely dark outside, some knights came out to the fire to talk among themselves. One of them began to tell a story about a death knight who suddenly appeared, but he decided he must sacrifice himself and go into battle to protect the prince. Only knights can withstand such a test. The knights looked at him in surprise and were delighted by such a story, but the protagonist knew he was lying. He lay on the battlefield until he kicked him aside. This made Yuri laugh, but he continued eating and paid no attention. Another knight asked, "Is Jared lying?" He replied, "Yes, he tried very hard." They were delighted, because this was incredible. How did he even come to the point of openly confronting the terrifying Death Knight? Jared replied that a Death Knight has a physical form and can parry sword blows and fight. However, the most terrifying enemy is perhaps one without a physical form. They exist as ghosts, which can be slashed but are of no use. Yuri observed this conversation and realized they had become friends, which pleased him. Suddenly, he looked away, his expression surprised. Who even wears such rags these days? An unknown figure approached Jared from behind. It was a huge ogre with bright red eyes, which left Yuri dumbfounded and frightened. He rose abruptly from his seat and shouted for everyone to draw their swords. The knights were alarmed by such a sudden reaction and asked again, "What's going on?" Yuri pointed to the side and said there was an orc. All the guys turned around and saw no one in the forest. Jared was stunned with horror and didn't understand what was happening, then said, "Your Majesty, he must be very tired because there's no one there." Yuri tried to catch his breath from such fear and didn't understand what was happening. Suddenly, Jared fell to his knees, and Yuri screamed. What is he saying? He was standing right in front of him, and he didn't see it? That creature. Yuri continued to see the orc, which suddenly vanished right before his face. Yuri rushed after the creature, and the knights asked where he was going. He shouted back that he was going to hunt the orc. It seemed to him that only he could see this creature, a scout, invisible to the eye. He used magical powers and swung his sword at this terrifying creature, so he couldn't just let it go. Sharp fangs were visible from the monster's mouth, which abruptly turned towards the protagonist, causing him to become wary. A moment later, he shielded himself from the bright light with his hand and asked, "What is it?" Magical forces were spreading everywhere, illuminating the entire forest. He wondered if it was some kind of impure energy spreading throughout his body, and he instinctively tried to use the manometer to relieve it. But what was happening to him? He looked at his black hands and didn't understand what to do. When the protagonist returned to his camp, they began questioning him. An orc, invisible to the eye, he says? That was highly suspicious. Yuri frowned and replied, yes, and it's extremely dangerous. There's an enemy roaming the military camp that no one can see. That's why he came to the subordinate royal house of Betrayal, and he was in a hurry, by the way. But apparently he arrived at a very bad time, right? He sat down at the table with cards and poker spread out on it and laughed. Across from him sat Hernando, who said that the orc must have been under a spell to prevent detection, but he apparently noticed it thanks to his extremely keen intuition. The problem is, it might appear in the upcoming battle. Will he be able to handle it? For example, like Marie Rose, by casting fireballs on it? Then such an attack was possible since they were near the Balshads, and besides, such blatant magic isn't easily neutralized. Yuri asked again, by the way, what about those suspicious aspects of their magic? Hernando replied that he couldn't say for sure, but it seemed they were using the power of a forbidden source. It seemed they mixed it with dark magic. Yuri asked again, isn't that dangerous? Hernando replied, no, don't worry. They've long studied this area of magic in the magic tower. If they react quickly, they can counter it. He focused on dispelling the magic caster's tricks. Yuri replied, fine. He'd rely on him. Yuri remembered something and turned to the mage again, who replied, yes, Yuri said he'd let him get away with it today, but if he gambled next time, he should definitely invite him along. Hernando smiled and said he'd keep that in mind. After a while, the knights warmed up and discussed whether anyone had won anything. One of them replied, of course, he'd swept everything off the table. His friend asked how he'd managed to lose to him. He chuckled and replied that he'd only played half-heartedly. When night fell, the black eagles again flew over the dark forest, where numerous slain bound skeletons lay. The orcs cast their spells and approached their king, who reigned over them. He was a huge skeleton, sitting on a throne made up of other skeletons. The orcs listened attentively to this creature, and the monster extended its hand and began spreading dark, magical powers everywhere, attracting many orcs who appeared in the creature's path. All these orcs were engulfed in these magical powers and responded to their commander in a special language. They would be ready to carry out the order. The next day, at the Kurui base, the knight blew his horn to begin a full-scale attack. Ragna was fully prepared and stood confidently, looking into the distance. Yuri was in the same mood and shouted, Betrayal, attack! All the subordinate knights rushed on horseback to attack the orc fortress and approached them, while the orcs, in turn, hurled arrows at the approaching enemies. Numerous arrows began to fall directly on the knights, and Yuri became frightened and shouted that they must retreat. Most of the knights were seriously wounded by arrows directly to the chest, and the protagonist realized that he could not retreat and they must attack. While they were acting as bait, the creatures were distracted. Ragna shouted for everyone to rush in and break through their defenses. The series screamed as they used a special weapon and smashed the main gate, which was now open. With this enormous mechanical machine, they shouted that they needed to move forward for their empire. Suddenly, Yuri stopped his entire squad and said that it looked like His Majesty had begun to break through the main gate. That completed their baiting mission, and now they needed to join them. The knights asked if they really needed to return there. Sir Jose. He reported that the main gate had been attacked, so the orcs wouldn't have a chance to take care of the rear. If they were attacked from behind at that moment, they would collapse even faster. Yuri smiled and said that was a good idea, but there were no siege weapons here, and unlike the main gate, these walls were extremely strong. He laughed and said they wouldn't need siege weapons, and Jose decided he'd figure it out. He grabbed his sword and channeled the magical powers that enveloped his entire body. As he approached the gate alone, Yuri thought it was amazing to look at him. His entire body glowed with magical power, and he swung his sword, realizing it was a literal tsunami of mana which he was about to shatter. The impact resulted in a loud bang and a multitude of stones flying everywhere. When the dust settled, the orcs roared with anger and hatred. Yuri declared, that was good, Sir Jose, and at that moment, the entire army broke into their city and began destroying one enemy after another. Yuri shouted again to raise the team's spirit, Betrayal, this is their chance. He raised his bloodied sword and shouted for them to clear the way. All the knights rushed after him, and he continued to shout for them to destroy these monsters with the allied forces. Everyone rushed inside the fortress, attacking the prepared orcs who were waiting for an attack. But suddenly, the protagonist was able to destroy the tips of several spears of the monsters that were trying to attack. One of the knights approached with incredible speed and shouted, "For the glory of Betrayal, they must do this." Yuri turned to Jared and said that he was too excited and that this was unlike him. He remained silent, then said that he should join them. At that moment, Yuri looked ahead and asked, "Laurent?" He stopped, and at that moment the fight continued with incredible force, and the orcs were attacked by a bright beam of light. Jared easily defeated several of these opponents, causing his sword to quickly become bloody. He raised his fist and shouted that they were doing this for Prince Yuri, for his highness. Jose, with a smile on his face, remarked that it seemed Betrayal was doing all the great work. The knights shouted that they simply couldn't lose to them. They charged and continued to destroy one monster after another. After some time, when all the surrounding orcs had been destroyed, Yuri said it was good that their defenses were weakening and the Tell's strategic alignment had changed slightly, but it was strange to him that they hadn't seen their main forces. They should have reached the camp by now. Suddenly, the remaining orcs arrived at the battlefield with their flags and roared loudly. The knights realized they were orcfalls and should be careful. These orcs began to attack the knights, eliminating them one by one. Knights were dying right before their eyes, and Jared asked how this had happened and why there were so many of them. The orcs didn't stop and approached every knight they saw. Suddenly, when an orc swung at him, he realized they had simply been caught, but Yuri suddenly called out to him to come to his senses. At that moment, he tried to protect his friend and created a bright flash of light to hinder the orc. Jared shouted, "Your Highness," and Yuri asked again, "Have you decided to die after that heroic story? He should wake up right now." Jared gritted his teeth in anger and tried to come to his senses. The orc shouted loudly at the protagonist, who shouted back and continued the fight. When Jared exchanged glances with Yuri, they managed to defeat their opponent. The bloody battle continued, and Jared turned to Yuri and asked for forgiveness. But Yuri told him not to relax. He understood that there were definitely more enemies here. He sensed a huge, terrifying creature inside the room that had destroyed several of the arriving knights. It was a huge orc skeleton monster, completely covered in human blood. Jose understood that their formation was broken and they must push back. He would not allow Betrayal to overtake them. They continued to fight, and Yuri, noticing this, turned to Jared and said that he felt it too. "He wants to go in there?" Yuri told him to follow him. They'd go into that hut. Jared followed him and asked if he thought the main forces had already encountered whatever was inside. He replied that they could only hope they weren't too late, and that those people were alive. At that moment, one of the knights fell out of nowhere, straight to the ground. His body flew between Yuri and Jared and slammed right into the wall. This all happened because the orc threw the poor knight aside with his huge hand, destroying it. When the monster suddenly pushed off the ground and jumped, Jared didn't understand what was happening. Yuri realized they were in a bad situation and cursed because they'd missed the terrifying creature, which had rushed to destroy the surrounding knights. Yuri shouted at them to calm down immediately, but many didn't have time and were destroyed. The orc's axe was completely bloodied by the protagonist's knights. When the monster rose from its place and turned around, a pile of destroyed knights lay around it. Jared turned to Yuri, who told everyone to retreat immediately, because he wouldn't be able to control his power now. He approached the enormous creature alone, sword in hand. Jared was terrified and shouted, "Your Highness!" But Jose approached him and told him not to waste time, as he likely couldn't hear him. Jared asked again, "Sir Jose, what does he mean?" He replied that he would fight alongside the prince. Moments later, Yuri pounced on the terrifying creature, and their forces clashed. Yuri stared confidently into the eyes of this terrifying monster, and suddenly a bright beam of light was directed toward the monster. Yuri said that if even one blow from the monster hit him, he would fall instantly. But what was going on now? At that moment, Sir Jose entered the battlefield, grinned, and said that he seemed to be in trouble, so he would help him. Yuri replied that he would not refuse his help, and they decided to fight together. At that moment, Yuri thought that he knew that look, like a mother driven to the edge of a cliff, who has something to protect. These were the eyes, after all, completely suppressing internal fear and terror. Despite its young age, it already knew what war is. The monster grinned and pointed a finger in its direction, signaling for the attack. Jose exchanged glances with Yuri, and together they began the attack, deciding to encircle the bridge from different sides. Jose was confident and charged at the monster from the left, but their swords clashed, and a bright flash of light erupted between them, pushing it back. Jose realized it was a real monster, roaring loudly and defending itself, repelling all attacks. Yuri appeared behind the monster at that moment and tried to destroy his opponent with a blow to the head, but he missed because the monster managed to dodge and, turning sharply, grabbed Yuri with its hand. The knights were terrified by this and cried out, Your Highness. The monster simply threw Yuri to the far side with its bloodied hand. When Yuri landed, he smiled, realizing everything was clear to him. But isn't this troublesome? Their knights will definitely destroy their great oracles. He suggests finding out how long it can hold out against the two of them. Jose also smiled, and together they pounced on the monsters, once again using their magical powers. When they tried to strike, the orc managed to shake off both of their attacks and grinned again. But suddenly, the orc began to roar so loudly in terror that even thunder rumbled in the sky. Jose looked up and asked what was happening. Yuri was also frightened and didn't understand what kind of energy it was. A blue-tinted magical force appeared around the orc, and Yuri realized it was real. At that moment, he shouted at Sir Jose to retreat immediately, but before he could do so, another knight's head flew off his shoulders. Yuri was terrified for him and shouted again at Jose to dodge. His eyes showed both rage and fear. He knew he couldn't handle this, and defended himself by raising his sword. He was in great pain and cried out in exhaustion, just as the protagonist pounced on the orc from behind to help Jose repel the attack. When the protagonist looked the orc in the face, he struck again, then backed away a little and asked, Jose, is he alright? He shouted, yes, he can fight. They stepped aside again and stared in bewilderment at this enormous orc they couldn't defeat. Jose remarked that after the appearance of the black smoke, this creature's physical abilities had increased dramatically. Yuri noted that he felt it too. He had the same sensation he had felt from the ghost of that shaman last time, but now he was supposed to dispel the black magic. But he still didn't understand what was happening. As dark forces enveloped them, one after another, one of them looked at his opponents in horror, as the monster's eyes glowed with a bright, fiery flame, and Yuri couldn't understand what was happening. Suddenly, lightning exploded in the sky, and all the orcs returned to work, when suddenly, something surprised them. Strange molecules began to flow from their bodies. One of the monsters stomped loudly on the ground and approached the frightened Mozar, who couldn't move. It lunged at him with a sharp weapon, and the knight screamed in fear. But at that moment, Yuri noticed everything and shouted at Jose that he was leading them to him. He shouted back, yes, and at that moment, Yuri defended that very knight. He rose from his seat, and Yuri continued to fight in anger. A bright spark erupted between the opponent's weapons. The monster roared loudly in pain and terror as the protagonist cut the creature's body into several pieces. Blood spilled, and the protagonist covered his face with his hand from the dark forces that appeared. He was terrified when he saw a terrifying orc with a severed arm before him. Suddenly, he realized something was wrong here. Perhaps it was regeneration, or magic. What even was this? At that moment, another monster emerged from the monster, pulled out its hand, and began casting a dark magic spell. These dark forces enveloped the protagonist in such a way that he became frightened and realized that he was in a terrible situation. Suddenly, an unknown voice told him not to resist. Yuri realized that the aura was much more sinister and dark than before, and that it was definitely black magic. The voice continued to ask, why is he alive? Why only him? Yuri turned around and saw many people behind him, and the voice said, His Highness, he wants to live. Please let him save him. Yuri, why did he abandon them? It was his fault that the kingdom was destroyed. He should be ashamed of himself for still living. He is nothing but a disgrace to the Betrayal family. He ran away, leaving behind his duties and honor, and still dares to use that name? Yuri Betrayal. He can't do anything. This is his fate. When Yuri calmly listened to all these phrases, he said that this was nonsense. Right before his eyes, magic began to spread everywhere. But he stamped his foot and asked, a predetermined future? A fixed fate? He grabbed the sword along with his friends and asked, what, doesn't he know what time they're living in? He's still relying on this fate nonsense, huh? After these words, he made one sudden movement, and the ogre froze, after which, a bright beam of light flashed past them. Yuri tried to stay on his feet in the strong wind, but landed on one knee. He then leaped sharply upward, and the monster directed its magical powers at Yuri. While he was in flight, he swung his sword to defend himself and destroy his opponent again. When he broke it in half, he landed and listened to the screams of the slain. A mangled, bloody body appeared before him, continuing to roar loudly as blood spilled from the creature's mouth. A moment later, it fell face first into the ground. Yuri watched the scene unfold, thinking that the black energy was fading, and this was his chance. He shouted to the others that their magic had been destroyed, when suddenly the orcs exchanged glances and the knights decided to attack immediately. All the knights rushed into battle and began to fight the ogres. One after another, they did not give up and destroyed their opponents. One of the ogres killed the knight, who began to bleed. Yuri watched in horror and shouted, Sir Jose. At that moment, the monster threw him aside and pounced on him with its huge paw. At that moment, the ogre made another sharp movement, when Yuri suddenly shouted for the others to stop and stay back. Jose turned to him, bleeding, and at that moment, the ogre was aiming to kill Yuri, who had come to his aid. He realized that he would no longer run away until he died. He would not lower his gaze until the very end. He looked into the monster's eyes, and a moment later, blood spilled, and the creature's hand was severed. The monster screamed loudly in pain and horror and looked at its hand. Yuri was stunned by what he saw, and Mo Yunshan declared him a genius and smiled. Yuri looked at him in surprise, and Mo Yunshan continued to say he liked it. A moment later, Mo Yunshan continued to destroy monsters and paused, looking ahead. The ogres were screaming in pain from their severed limbs. Mo Yunshan grabbed one of the monsters with his bare hand and yelled at it to shut up right now, as it wasn't even amused. Yuri watched in bewilderment, thinking that he had an alien's manner of speech and a strong build. Furthermore, he used a sword technique completely different from theirs. Yuri spoke up, looking closely at him and the approaching monster, which he destroyed again with a single blow. He was exactly what he was looking for. Mo Yunshan struck down all the monsters, and Yuri watched him silently. Mo Yunshan said he only attacked because he'd done something amazing, but in the end, he'd only made things worse. He'd spoken earlier, but before he could finish, Yuri suddenly bowed to him and shouted, "Thank you for saving me." Military prowess that had subdued the orc general with a single blow, a masculine demeanor, a handsome face, and outstanding abilities. Mo Yunshan looked at him questioningly, and Yuri guessed he must be the one from the continent's famous top 10. Mo Yunshan asked again, "So he knows him, so what's he up to?" Yuri replied that he knew he'd deliberately allowed himself to be captured by the orcs for a specific purpose. He believes he's hunting the Orc King, Okua, so he's proposing they work together. Mo Yunshan asked again, "What?" After Kurui's death, the orcs quickly lost morale. These creatures began to die quickly. A massive massacre began, and only after killing most of the Uruks in the camp did Ragma place Kurui's head on his spear. In their past lives, the allied forces had never sustained such crushing victories. And now, predestined history has changed. They did a great job, Your Highness. Yuri entered the tent and asked Jared how many casualties they had. He replied that they were currently counting them, but they weren't that many. More importantly, the number of soldiers who had seen the inside of the orc barracks and suffered psychological trauma as a result was increasing significantly. Yuri realized this was entirely expected and similar to what had happened in the Sidor domain. There were many unfortunate people there, standing alongside the monsters, screaming that they wanted to live and please let them kill them. And yet, things could have been even worse. Yuri asked his subordinate to try to calm them down so they wouldn't panic too much. He replied that he understood his orders, after which Yuri asked, "By the way, what about the stranger?" Jared replied that, as he had ordered, all his demands were being fulfilled. But after his meal, he washed, shaved, and began eating again. Yuri was dumbfounded and realized that he was very capricious. Jared continued to explain that at first he said the soup was cold and they heated it up. And now he says the soup is salty and knocks over the table. He even refused to eat if there were less than 5 plates of food on the table. This really unsettled Yuri, and thoughtfully he said, "Okay, he'll deal with him." "Where is he now?" Jared replied that he probably knows where it is. Most likely, he is sitting by the central fire. And indeed, Mo Yunshan was outside, staring at the flames. Yuri approached him and said, "There he is." He chewed discontentedly, and Yuri asked again if he enjoyed the food. He replied that it was so-so, then leaned back and declared that he was finally full. Yuri replied that since he was finished, he wanted to ask him something. Mo Yunshan asked him to wait and said he would ask first. How did he manage to track down the orc mage? Yuri looked at him in bewilderment and didn't know what to say. After which Mo Yunshan said that he knew his target, so he should tell him everything and hide nothing. At that moment, he grabbed his sword and said that depending on his answer, he could kill him. Yuri smirked, looking at him and wondering why he had suddenly started speaking without an accent. He didn't know for sure, but his mana technique had reacted, and he had followed suit. Mo Yunshan replied, "It's a mana technique, so it's an internal technique." When magical rays appeared around the protagonist, he declared that this was a mana technique passed down to him by his ancestor, Eric Briol. Mo Yunshan was stunned by this, then abruptly turned away and said it seemed they were destined to meet. Yuri asked what he meant. He replied that it was an internal chi technique in the name of his ancestors. Both of them meant nothing special to him. At that moment, he slammed his fist into his palm and declared that the last disciple of the walls, the head of the Cheongsong school, their protector, Myungchan, paid tribute to the flow of the old benefactor. The Cheongsong school had not forgotten the friendship shared by the swordsman who conquered the heavens. Yuri gaped in astonishment and asked, "Benefactor?" Mo Yunshan replied that he shouldn't be so surprised. All that was long in the past. His ancestor, Eric, they called his swordsman, the one who conquered the heavens. He was friends with the leader of the Pure Star sect at the time, and had put a lot of effort into eradicating the demonic cult. Yuri muttered, "Who's a demonic cult?" Mo Yunshan added, "They're the ones who sacrifice human lives. The Pure Star sect exterminates demons to rid the world of evil, and he came here to cut down the ominous star that had appeared in the west. He speaks without an accent only when he needs to say something very serious." Yuri now understood. Demon hunting is why he was so obsessed with killing Okua in his past life. But his sect had long since disintegrated anyway. He couldn't let such an important person go alone. At that moment, he said that then it would be all the more reason for him to go with them. Mo Yunshan was surprised by this offer and asked again, "What?" Yuri replied that they were offering him the title of Honorary Knight of Briol, he could join the allied forces and finish the demon hunt. Mo Yunshin paused, and Yuri explained that food, a bath, and anything else he desired would be provided. His knighthood would not be ignored anywhere on the continent. He was embarrassed by this and realized he liked it, after which Yuri explained that after the war, they would offer him a place in a major trade caravan. He was delighted by the prospect of such a position and overjoyed. He cleared his throat and said that since he was offering, he could agree to this condition. But he still had one more condition. He liked him, so from now on he could call him mentor, Meng Yunshan. Yuri asked, "What?" He continued, saying that starting today, he would become a disciple of their Chongsong sect. Yuri was stunned by this, and his face twisted in confusion. Yuri asked, "What do you mean, disciple?" Mo Yunshan replied that it would cost money, but he'd make an exception for him, so he should be grateful. Yuri thanked him for the offer, but he had a teacher. His nickname was Sword Demon. When Mo Yunshan heard this, he shouted that he could be his disciple at the same time. He couldn't even imagine how lucky he was, and he needed to meet the captain of the allied forces. He should take him to him. Yuri looked at him in surprise, and Mo Yunshan continued, saying that he'd said he'd help him with his goal, so he needed to know something about orcs. Human sacrifices were another topic of discussion in the knight's tent. Ragna said, "So this Okua sacrifices people, right?" Mo Yunshan replied that he sacrificed human lives for their magic. Human sacrifices when worn were proof that he was already immersed in evil spells. In the previous battle, the orcs' abilities had sharply increased, and they believed it was related to their magic. If the orcs could consistently use magic, they needed to prepare. Ragna realized they were definitely up to something, and Mo Yunshan continued to say that was precisely why he wanted to pretend to be a victim and come to him. But the guys, had ruined his plan. Yuri addressed him as a commander and said that the stranger had decided what would happen. This was the destruction of the lessons, so he would be useful to the allied forces. He paused for thought and suddenly froze. After a brief moment of reflection, he said, "Okay, he understands everything. They will search for information about magic." He entrusted the stranger to him. Yuri thanked him for this and reflected on how he had finally managed to persuade the stranger to join the allied forces. At that moment, Ragna turned to him and said that he had heard that there was something important in the Betrayal army. He replied that it was, and Ragna exhaled and said that the orcs they'd managed to capture had been handed over to Graham, but they didn't yet know what to do with them. He wished he'd decided. The protagonist reflected after a while that it was certainly good that Ragna trusted him, but it looked as if he'd shifted the troublesome work onto him. Suddenly, someone shouted, "Are they just going to let Betrayal overtake them?" He heard the knights standing nearby discussing, and one of them asked another, "Why are you shouting like that? If they used these half-orcs, the empires would have even more Orcish translators." Many survivors had suffered because of these half-orcs. They needed to listen to the voices of the victims, but they couldn't let this opportunity slip away. Many frightened people were shaking with fear and didn't believe in the best. Yuri realized that this was it. He'd asked just one question. Were they sure these half-orcs would help on the battlefield? One of the knights retorted sharply, "Of course they're obedient, and if properly trained, they could become good soldiers." Yuri asked in surprise, "Really?" Then, in a critical situation, he could trust these half-orcs with his life? The boy didn't know what to say. And Yuri continued that fighting together on the battlefield requires trust. They must be able to protect each other, even when one of them is more vulnerable. At that moment, everyone around him fell silent, and Yuri exchanged glances with one of the girls standing nearby. He turned to her and asked if she could tell him what she had seen. She saw how demons treated weakened people. Her sister, who couldn't walk due to illness, was torn to pieces by an orc. She recalled the remains of her sister's body and described it as being torn apart. It was like tearing a fly's wings apart, piece by piece, enjoying her screams and laughing. To them, her sister was just a toy. They were terrible monsters. She screamed terrifyingly, tears in her eyes, and Yuri asked her to state her name and where she was from. She replied that her name was Jane of Sidor. Jane asked again, "This hair, is he Prince Betrayal?" He replied, "Yes," and she asked him to avenge them. He replied confidently, "Revenge." At that moment, he turned to Graham and said that he was not speaking as an army officer, but as Prince Betrayal. They had killed innocent people in his country and left unhealed wounds on the survivors. Leaving alive those who destroyed humanity was out of the question. Orcs do not change, and he demands that they destroy every last one of them. He bowed and replied that by the authority granted to him by his majesty, he would execute the half-orcs. When a new day dawned, the knight made a loud sound and announced that the orcs were approaching. All the knights were frightened and wary when they saw the flags of the arriving monsters. They didn't understand what they were planning. Ragna wondered if the orcs had come with a report. The knight replied, "Yes, your majesty," and they were asking for the gates to be opened to convey a message. He asked again, what were they thinking? "Let them open the gates now." One of the orcs walked through the gates and smiled, looking his opponent in the eye. Yuri and Ragna glared at the creature. The orcs exchanged glances and chatted, while the knights watched them closely. Meanwhile, Yuri approached Ragna and said, "Your Highness, may I ask what this is all about?" He grabbed his head and replied, "Yuri, why does he think he became supreme commander of the allied forces?" He asked. "What, perhaps because his highness is an excellent strategist?" Ragna replied that it was obvious. Yuri asked, "Is he asking about political reasons?" Ragna replied that he didn't know whether he knew about it or not, but he didn't have a very good relationship with the emperor. As a prince of the empire with the power to lead the allied forces, he decided to lead them. But empires aren't that simple. Even if everything seems to be going as planned, there are always some machinations of the emperor behind it. Of course, if he wins the war, he will become a hero throughout the continent. A brilliant path, guaranteeing glory and support, but only if he wins. Yuri reflected on how, in his past life, Ragna had taken responsibility for the failure of the allied forces and resigned, and that was when the emperor had completely seized power in the empire. After all, the allied forces were originally designed to fail, and ultimately, he was removed. Yuri asked, "Does this mean a trap?" Ragna handed him a document and told him to look at it. When Yuri saw the papers in front of him, he asked, "What?" The emperor had made a secret agreement with the Okua. He mustn't be a fool and should retreat. Yuri wondered if the outcome of this war had been decided from the start. What a dirty trick. He frowned and grew angry, after which Ragna said that people were saying that the only force opposing the Okua had asked him to deliver this letter. It was all a setup. There was no way the allied forces would survive from the start. So what does he think, Yuri? He silently looked at the documents and said, "Your Majesty, can he offer him a plan?" He replied, "Go ahead," and smiled. Yuri swept up the paper, stepped on it, and declared that it didn't matter whether the letter was true or some kind of shady scheme, but they had to return victorious. The war, which had been so difficult, had just become a little more difficult. That's all. At that moment, Ragna laughed loudly at him and replied that everything was correct, standing up and leaning his elbows on the table. No matter what the emperor had planned, they simply had to win this war. Now they just had to talk to those who brought this letter. Yuri said, "Your Highness, can he trust him with this?" He smiled back and entrusted him with the matter. Meanwhile, outside, the orcs were talking to each other and suddenly began to shout loudly. They saw Yuri approaching them, pointing a finger at him. Yuri shouted at them to be quiet immediately and began swinging his sword, severing the heads of the monsters. He destroyed several with a single swing, and they fell to the ground in unison. The surrounding knights watching the scene were amazed that he killed 3 orcs with one blow. He had no idea Prince Briol was so strong. Ragna also remarked that this was quite impressive, right? He was only 18, but his skills were simply astounding. He thought he had become even stronger. The knight asked again, "But isn't that too cruel? People say he made a promise." After he destroyed the monsters, he looked toward the open gates. He would take revenge and make them pay in full. After some time, sunset came, and Ragna looked into the distance with confidence, telling his subordinate to bring Aizen here. He answered, "Yes," after which Aizen approached his highness and asked, "He called him?" Ragna asked him to tell him everything he knew about black magic. He replied that it was now a taboo art, and that there were almost no practitioners left. Plus, it was very easy to block. Ragna asked again, "What is the most powerful black magic?" He replied that there were rumors that it could once resurrect the dead, but that was now considered superstition. Ragna mentioned information that the Okua performs a ritual using black magic and was dumbfounded. They say he becomes stronger through human sacrifice. They had already encountered their magic in that battle, so the orcs would likely become even stronger. Aizen thought for a moment and said that if that were the case, perhaps the orcs had obtained the forgotten ancient books through black magic. Ragna asked again, "Books of black magic?" He replied that there was still much unexplored in these lands, such as a country called Adelwine, which shouldn't have existed in the first place, and the birthplace of black magic, one of the 10 most powerful, the Death Knight Gert, who still guards these lands. Ragna then asked, "So if Okua really does use black magic, what does he think he plans to do about it?" Aizen replied that it was just a guess, but perhaps he wanted to summon something. Ragna asked again, "Summon? This means he delays them at the cost of his troops in order to gain time." Yes, if he had already obtained the Book of Black Magic, he was most likely searching for a dungeon among the ruins of the Old Kingdom. Ragna assumed that meant there was something down there. Sometime later, a new day dawned, and Yuri and his army set out. A subordinate approached him and said, "Your Highness, they received a message that support from the supply unit in Balshad has been suspended." He asked again, "Seriously? But there's nothing to be done about it. They must be under frequent attack." He answered affirmatively. After all, they'd been ordered to pay more attention to guarding their supplies. Yuri thought that even though they had plenty of supplies, the situation would quickly get worse. And right now, they were practically in the enemy's lair, near the Okua. So, at any moment, a horde of orcs could attack them, and if these creatures decided to engage in a war of attrition, they needed to finish them off before that happened. Suddenly, the horses began acting very strangely, and none of the knights could hold them. Yuri shouted for everyone to dismount immediately. When the knight himself stepped on the ground, he asked if this was a sudden earthquake. Yuri replied that it didn't feel like an earthquake. It was something else. He felt magical forces emanating from underground and realized that something was rising in front of them. Something straight from the depths of the earth. Indeed, the earth began to expand and crumble, and an incredibly enormous fortress emerged from beneath. This fortress formed directly in the knight's path. Numerous knights and mages all stared in bewilderment at the growing palace before them. Yuri informed his majesty that they had arrived, and Ragna noted this. He asked what these ruins were. Ragna replied that they hadn't been able to connect them to the orcs, and that these ruins were no different from any ordinary ancient monument. They couldn't see what was inside, So, how suspicious was that? Yuri suggested that in that case, they should go and check. Since they had suddenly appeared before them, there was a high probability that there was something inside. They'd better check everything personally to make sure nothing happens. He replied with a smile, "Okay, then let him take the Imperial Knights with him. By His Highness's orders, he will accompany the prince." A knight of the Rhodine Empire introduced himself and said it was a pleasure to meet him. The protagonist's subordinate whispered in His Highness's ear, "Do they really have to go with them?" Yuri replied that there were no other options. Orders were orders. Still, introducing Imperial Knights so suddenly was rather strange, and he hoped he wasn't up to anything. When they reached the fortress, they stopped and considered it. It looked like this door, but it wasn't moving. They decided to see if there were any mechanisms around it. When the knights began looking around, Yuri touched the door with his hand and said that everything was fine. If they didn't find anything, he would simply break it slightly. He held his hand against the wall for a long time, and white magical forces appeared around his hand, and he sensed something was wrong. Suddenly, he was frozen with horror, and those around him asked what he'd done. He shouted back, "No idea." He'd simply placed his hand on the door, and it had opened so easily. It was as if the ruins had been awaiting their arrival. As he walked a little further, he watched in silence and decided they should go inside. It was incredibly dark, and he turned to Jared and asked if he had a torch. He replied that he hadn't brought one, and Yuri turned around, wondering if the others had either. He suddenly paused, thinking that, if he thought about it, the doors seemed to have reacted to his mana control method. If the structures inside the ruins were designed similarly, then... But before he could fully process this, his mouth fell open in shock at what he saw. The knight asked if he'd been here before. Yuri replied, "Of course not. They're simply magnificent." A multitude of magically tinted torches appeared in the corridor, and suddenly Yuri shouted to the other knights that they were entering, and that they shouldn't relax. They shouted that they had heard his order and followed him. Yuri looked confidently ahead and suddenly stepped on a bone, crushing it in two. There were numerous skeletons and skulls scattered around on the ground. As they approached the room, they saw something unknown, and all the knights looked around in fear. One of them decided to go and see what was going on. A moment later, he shouted, "Your Highness, the way is blocked." He knocked on the door next to the skeleton, and Yuri mused that besides these human remains, the only other bones here were orc bones. Given the signs of battle, it seemed he had died defending this passage. One of the knights turned to him and said the door wasn't responding to mana infusions. He replied that there was nothing to be done about it. They would go back and check to see if they had missed anything else. Just in case, he must be prepared for any danger. Did he understand? He replied, "Yes," when suddenly this skeleton grabbed his hand and scared him. The knight was terrified and screamed, "What is this? Your Highness!" All the knights gaped in shock, unsure what was happening. A bright wave of light formed around Yuri and the skeleton. He tried to cover his face with his hand, and suddenly heard a voice telling him to remember that this was their salvation. The skeleton drew ever closer and continued to chant the phrase. Yuri found himself in an unknown space and wondered where he was. At that moment, he saw a young boy turn to his teacher and shout for him to look. The teacher asked again, where was he? The boy replied that he was simply reading a book and smiled. Yuri realized that it was the armor on the skeleton. It was the same man. These must be his memories. Such magic requires a great deal of power. What did this man, the owner of these memories, want to show him? The teacher invited the child to begin today's lesson. Had he prepared for anything? The boy looked away silently, and the teacher angrily said, "But let him just say no, and don't even think about changing the subject." The boy replied that reading books isn't fun, and the teacher asked, "So how does that make him a hunter?" Yuri thought, how familiar it sounded, reminding him of his teacher. At that moment, the teacher told the child to look. It was the mark of an orc hunter. A bright red stone appeared in his hand, glowing incredibly, and the teacher declared that he would become a true hunter in class only when he acquired it. Yuri understood. So that's what it was for. It became clear to him. The boy asked, but he didn't even know why they were killing orcs. Why couldn't they just talk to them? The man was silent for a moment, then said that it seemed time for him to learn the truth. He should listen carefully, because orcs were people who had fallen under the influence of black magic. At that moment, Yuri was dumbfounded by what he heard and asked again, "What?" Once upon a time, there lived a nobleman obsessed with murder. He killed residents for no particular reason. When a royal decree was issued prohibiting murder, a sorcerer came to the nobleman. The king said they couldn't kill people, but he didn't say they couldn't transform people into something else and then kill them. The nobleman was delighted to hear that a sorcerer could transform people into something they could kill without fear. So he ordered his people to embrace black magic. The sorcerers tapped into their dark powers, and afterward, the people enchanted by black magic began to transform into something that no longer resembled human. They became monsters, absurd in appearance, ready to kill people. And thus, the people enchanted by black magic were born. These are today's orcs. Yuri was shocked by what he heard. Could orcs really have been human? So all those orcs he killed were descendants of those humans? The boy asked again, Was this sorcerer punished later? The teacher replied, he hid until the nobleman's crime was revealed. People tried to find a way to reverse the transformations, but they failed, and ultimately the kingdom simply surrendered. The boy was very upset by this story, and the teacher explained that their goal as hunters was to kill these cursed creatures and send their souls to rest. Yuri understood what black magic meant, connected to the power used by the sorcerer and to the human sacrifices the stranger had spoken of. At that moment, the boy and the teacher began to dissolve right in front of him, and he looked into the distance in surprise, wondering how time changed in his memories. When he found himself inside the palace, he asked, "Are they now inside the ruins?" The boy and teacher continued walking through the fortress, and suddenly the boy grabbed the teacher and screamed that he couldn't do this. The teacher screamed back at him to let him go. The boy screamed, "Will he really fight alone? Is he crazy? He can't survive." The teacher shouted, "So be it. They can't just sit and wait for reinforcements. Adelwine can't be saved." Yuri thought about how close to 10 years had passed, and he'd heard the name Adelwine somewhere before. It was the name of a ruined kingdom. That didn't mean they should tire themselves out as bait for orcs. That would be foolish. They were already here, and if they hesitated, he wouldn't be able to distract them. The teacher grabbed his student by the shoulders and said he had to survive and tell the others about their destiny. The student replied that he couldn't get far, even if he ran right now. He'd rather seal those destiny in these ruins and pass it on to future generations. It would be in the form of the hunter's memories during lessons. The teacher responded, how stubborn he was. Yuri understood, so that's why he left his memories. They left them for the generation that would one day come here. Orc secrets, technology, and the experience of orc hunters who were once considered the strongest in Adelwine. They have the experience and skills of orc hunters. Perhaps they will lose and die, but he is confident that in their generation their long-held desire will be forgotten. At that moment, they used magical powers, and may their deaths not be in vain. Yuri wondered if he was looking at him. The boy warned him to beware of the Devil's Tome and began to tremble. Yuri wondered, the Devil's Tome? At that moment, a multitude of bright blue crystals scattered in all directions. The knights tried to revive Yuri, who suddenly returned to real life and stood dumbfounded. He clutched his head and asked again, where are they? He replied that they were inside the ruins. The skeleton glowed, but he suddenly disappeared. But they were glad everything was okay. He replied, yes. He was glad to see them too. The hunter's memories, he doesn't think he's simply reliving their past. He feels as if he's recalling long-forgotten memories, languishing in the depths of his memory. Speaking of which, was this his doing? How hard did he hit that door? He laughed and said it wasn't easy. After that, the knight asked, did he see anything? Yuri scratched his head and replied that he wasn't sure he could say he'd simply seen something. Suddenly, the earthquake struck again and the knights froze. Yuri replied, no, this is different from what happened before. It seems like this is an invasion of orcs who just ran from the street and ran into this room. The orc attack has begun. Jared didn't understand. They were attacking at a time like this. How did they know someone was here? Maybe it was a trap? MC asked him to shut up and concentrated. He explained that orc hunters used to live here. If the ruins of an old enemy suddenly appeared, they would certainly want to destroy them immediately. Judging by the vibrations, they were most likely riding Komodo dragons. This was a reconnaissance squad, approximately 10 orcs. Laurent suggested that they should return to the main forces now. Yuri agreed and told them to follow him. It was time to prepare for battle. Rodin asked, are they not retreating? MC decided that this was unnecessary and took a closer look at the skeleton. Putting the sword in its skeletal hand, he smiled, turned around, and said that now he understood how to fight the orcs. At this time, the orcs were moving towards their target, pointing with their fingers to the necessary place. Suddenly, several flashes of light appeared in the bushes, and the orcs didn't know what to expect. Red energy spread across the area, and the orcs began to growl in pain. This significantly battered them, and then Yuri shouted, attack! Knights jumped out of the bushes and immediately moved toward the orcs, dealing with each of them. Surveying the battlefield, the protagonist concluded that the plan had worked. He hadn't thought that the hunter's mark left in the ruins would be so strong. It would never have occurred to him to sense the number of orcs by vibrations in the ground and traps. Is that why he decided to show him these memories? He prepared his sword for battle, and the orc rushed toward him with a roar. While he was thinking, he felt like he had remembered long-forgotten skills. He saw the orc's most vulnerable spot and, without a shadow of a doubt, attacked him in the arm. Now Yuri didn't even need to use Soul Slash. The sword cuts the orc on its own. After finishing off the monster, MC said he would gladly use their legacy, the Adelwine hunters. That night at the camp, Ragna praised the protagonist because thanks to him, they were able to secure the area around the ruins. He did a good job. So, hunters used to live in these ruins? Yuri confirmed this. They found traces of their last battle. But he was also curious about something. Does Ragna know anything about the Devil's Tome? He replied that he had never heard of such a thing. Does it have something to do with the ruins? The protagonist agreed, but that's all he knew. The commander-in-chief promised to inform him if anything came to light, and he thanked him for that. Afterwards, MC left the tent and saw a knight of the Empire who introduced himself as Rodan. He was simply magnificent in that battle, and MC responded in kind. He asked, does he smile so often? There, near the ruins, he was much stern. Roden admitted that it was because of the strict military rules of the Empire. Any man would have frozen just setting foot on the battlefield for the first time, but Yuri looked like a seasoned veteran. This made him wonder if he had a lady love back home. The protagonist stunned him by asking in response, is this an order from His Majesty? The knight didn't quite understand what he was talking about, and MC continued. It seems he came to find out about his romantic relationships. Roden inquired, does this bother him? He admitted, of course. He wouldn't want to get involved with the imperial princess. The knight didn't understand. Why? Everyone in the Empire wants her as a wife. She is beautiful, kind, very welcoming. Everyone loves her. The protagonist thought that it was precisely because of this kindness that Catherine makes others think they are treated somehow special. He remembered his cover as Sybil and said, nevertheless, he already has a girlfriend. They are crazy about each other. That's all they need to know. And yet, Roden was glad to hear it. He's planning to propose to his girlfriend, so he understands him perfectly. Yuri advised him not to speak like that on the battlefield. It could be a bad sign. At that moment, a barrel filled with explosives landed right behind them. This confirmed the protagonist's words. The time has come. The enemy is attacking. Pointed his hand forward, and at that moment, the fire continued to spread around him and people screamed all around him. The tents are burning. They have to protect the provisions. At that moment, Hernando, watching what was happening, wondered if they were attacking from somewhere underground. Dozens, no, hundreds of orcs appeared out of nowhere in the middle of their camp. That wasn't the only problem. Unlike last time, his dispel spell wasn't working. It looked like they were neutralizing their magic. He then concentrated energy in his hand, and MC asked, is his dispel spell not working? He looked at him and said, Your Highness. The protagonist, continuing to concentrate energy in his body, approached closer, and Hernando said, it looks like the enemy mages have prepared. He replied that he would deal with them, that he should wait until the opportunity presented itself and immediately use a dispel spell. He was counting on him. With these words, he smiled, looking at him, and then ran forward. Hernando anxiously extended his hand towards him and shouted, Your Highness. How will he know which of them is a mage? Meanwhile, he continued running forward and thought that he could handle it after all. He remembered Lucas's words, who had said that orc mages lose their sight due to black magic, so he should look for those with an awkward gait. In the present tense, he said that now everything depended on his memories. Then he identified one orc and thought he had found it. He took a stance and then threw his sword straight at the target, striking it. The orcs around him began to scream loudly, and then MC jumped towards the wounded orc and finished him off with a powerful attack. Then he took his sword and, throwing it over his shoulder, said that he had certainly killed the mage, but now he was trapped. A multitude of orcs stood around him, ready to attack at any second, and he added, at least that's what they think, Hernando. The next second, he concentrated fiery energy in his hand, and then sent a powerful stream of fire forward. Then the protagonist swung his weapon, dispersing a small portion of the fire and spreading it in both directions. Looking at the burning monsters, he asked, how are they, the orcs? Do they still think they have the advantage? Then he heard an explosion behind him. He turned and grinned, his filthy tongue. There's no end in sight for them. Then he looked at Hernando and shouted for him to attack them with another fireball, and with the last of his strength, he said that he apologized, His Highness. He shouted, hey, damn it. Then he looked at the crowd of orcs and said, guys, take it easy on him. He thought it was a mistake to jump into the thick of things to kill an orc mage. He should have seen this coming. Well, he'd already died once. Then he concentrated his energy into his sword and said, he, Yuri Briol, even if he were destined to die today, he did so with honor. He extended his hand and told him to come out, vermin. At that moment, Yunchang leaped forward and said he admired his determination. He swung his weapon, releasing powerful energy, and the protagonist shouted, Master! He turned slightly and told him to do everything he could, leaving the rest to the heavens. After all, when a man is prepared to die, he will definitely survive. But if he starts scrambling to survive, he will die immediately. Only someone who understands this can become his disciple. Today, he will show him the Chongsong sword. With that, he smiled, then concentrated the energy in his weapon, and used the Bloody Azure Sky Sword Art, Crescent Pulse. A powerful energy erupted from his sword as he swung it. His attack struck several monsters at once, and MC gaped in disbelief. He thought, this is the power of the continent's top 10. Then Yunchang said he'd only dealt with half, the rest were on him, and he shouted, yes, sir. Then he charged, and Yunchang, watching him, thought how strange he was. His movements were rough and chaotic, yet restrained and practical. A diamond in the rough. He would never be alone, for followers would constantly gather around him. He said the heavenly order had been disrupted, and an ominous star was spreading darkness. And yet, he was able to find a small glimmer of light within that ominous star. Isn't this manna from heaven? And all he can do is look at it. When this child grows up, will this entire world be consumed by a black star? Or will he himself become a new star? Someday they will find out. At that moment, the knights tirelessly rushed into battle, and then a powerful explosion occurred behind them, and several more orcs burst out of the ground. The next second, the protagonist shouted, Jared, Laurent, they must stop them. Then they leaped into the attack and struck at the monsters, dealing with everyone in their path. And then Jared put his hand to his head and said that there were too many underground tunnels here, And besides, they were so fast. MC agreed and added, something was wrong here. Such a large group can't move so quickly. Then he felt movement underground and kneeling down, put his hand to it. He wondered if there were more among them than the orc mages. Jared looked at him and asked, His Highness? And at that moment the protagonist began to concentrate and wondered, where are they? Digging their tunnels? Then he saw a toothy creature and thought, I found it. He then ran forward and shouted, Here! Jared shouted, His Highness, is he sure they're going that way? And Laurent ran after them shouting, Don't dare question His Highness's decision. He's always right. He agreed, and then MC thought, there are constant vibrations coming from here. He noticed an orc mage pointing his hand at them. The ground in front of him began to crack and split in two, and orcs burst out with renewed vigor, and the protagonist grinned and said, as he thought, they won't give up without a fight, right? They stopped, looking at each other, and then the orcs shouted something unintelligible. Jared approached the protagonist and, leaning towards his ear, said, It looks like he wants to fight him specifically. He answered, Definitely. Then he shouted, They have to take on an orc each. They can't lose. They answered, Yes, sir. And then MC concentrated his energy in his sword again, and thought, There's something down there besides orcs, and we need to deal with that to finish them off. And then he frowned and shouted, Get out of the way, Orc Vow. He delivered powerful blows, but the monster blocked his attack with its weapon. They repeated the blows again and again, and the next second the protagonist jumped to the side. He thought how hard. He knows how to use a saber very well. Then he heard shouts behind him. They have to surrender. He wiped the blood from his face and said, Hey, he needs to get back to his guys, so they have to finish this quickly. He prepared to dash again and then lunged, swinging his weapon. He thought, damn, he's deflecting all his attacks, dodging at the same time practically without moving. It was as if he was reading him like an open book. Was he stalling? His soldiers were going at the same pace. At that moment, he remembered Bernard saying that if he thought for even a split second, the blade would immediately begin to tremble. No matter how strong he was, he wouldn't be able to reach the enemy with trembling hands. Then the protagonist asked, what should he do then? He cried out, oh my god. If he wanted to teach him something, he would have said so. And then Bernard swung his weapon and said that a choice must be made. He tossed the sword into his hands and added, battle is like a turbulent river. Beyond the intuitive and obvious, there are many other variables. Therefore, your highness, he must always remember the reason why he fights. He spoke, as expected of his master. Only after remembering his master's teachings did he, too, come to his senses. A powerful energy surrounded his body, and then he pushed off the ground and leaped high into the air, while the orcs looked at him in bewilderment. He braced himself for the attack, and shouted that he'd clearly meant to anger him, but that was exactly what he'd been trying to achieve from the start. With that, he slammed the ground in front of him, shattering it even further. A toothy worm burst forth, sending a powerful attack ripping through his body. He'd said a frontal attack worked best. Powerful streams of energy erupted around him, and at that moment, Jared, blocking the monster's attack, turned his head to the side and shouted, Your Highness. He looked at the protagonist, who had thrust his sword into the ground and, trying to catch his breath, dropped to one knee. He thought he'd used up all the mana he had left. Damn, mana depletion was worse than he thought. He needed to recover somehow, but with these underground tunnels, it was impossible. At that moment, he glanced away, and Laurent, still fighting the monster, turned to the protagonist and shouted, Your Highness, he must be more careful. At that moment, several toothy worms burst from the ground behind the protagonist, and he exclaimed, Damn it! At that moment, Jared ran up to him, grabbed him, and jumped aside. Laurent then ran up to the monsters and cut down several of them with a swing of his weapon. Meanwhile, MC looked at Jared and, smiling, thanked him, and he said, Yes, he is so grateful. Next time please, he must warn him when he's going to do something like this. Then he got to his feet and asked, Can he fight? Like the protagonist said, he would be glad to, but his body will not withstand it. He said, This is very bad. Do we think they will survive? And then Laurent put his hand to his chest and said that he would gladly die for him, His Majesty. The protagonist got to his feet and said, But they will not give up without a fight, right? His legs were shaking, but he confidently looked ahead and said that they will fight until their very last breath. Then he shouted, Everyone, scatter! They answered, Yes, sir. And he rushed forward and shouted that he will cut a way for them. At that moment, he heard a voice. No need to overexert yourself. Graham ran forward, and MC was surprised by his presence. His energy scattered in all directions, and Graham said that Prince Ragna had summoned them. They had come to their aid. After a while, everyone returned to the tent camp. Graham asked, So they just ran away? Ragna folded his arms and confirmed it. Graham said that by the time they arrived, Prince Yuri had already managed to kill a giant sandworm. Most likely, the orcs realized they could win and decided to flee. Ragna thoughtfully placed his hand to his chin and remarked that it was rather unfortunate. If they had caught them, they could have interrogated them. Then he turned and said that he had done well, Sir Graham. If he had been even a minute late, they would have lost the core of their allied forces. In response, he nodded and thanked him. He said he was free to go. After that, Ragna adjusted the chair and said that he always needs to make a fuss. Yes. He sat down next to the protagonist's bed and said, It feels like the allied forces exist solely to glorify him, Yuri. Well, as expected of Catherine's future husband. After a while, the protagonist abruptly sat up in bed, yelping slightly. He put his hand to his head and frowned, wondering what kind of nightmare that was. It was as if a terrible future had been foretold. Then Sybil entered the room and asked if he was finally awake. He noticed her, and then she came closer and adjusted the chair. He asked, "What's wrong with the others? Are they alive?" And she told him to calm down. They won. She sat down on the chair and added that while he was unconscious, the Allied forces had been advancing for 2 days. Everyone had been very attentive so that he could recover calmly. How is he feeling? At that moment, he began to concentrate energy in his hand, and she said that she believed he had managed to restore his mana. He would thank her for this later. It wasn't every day that he was healed by the princess of the Holy Kingdom. In response, he laughed slightly and said, "Okay, he's grateful, Sybil. And where are they now?" She rose to her feet and asked why he didn't go see for himself. She was sure he'd be surprised. With that, she extended her hand. A few seconds later, they left the tent. But MC looked ahead in surprise and said, "That's it." Sybil held his hand and asked, "How is it?" "This is Okua Fortress, the site of the final battle of the Allied forces." He said they had finally arrived. She agreed with him, and then added, "Yuri, she would like to thank him." He looked surprised, and she said, "Without him, they wouldn't have been able to get this far. And even if they had, there would have been far more casualties. They were so lucky to have him with them, Yuri." She smiled, looking at him, and then he asked if she was so grateful. Would she do him a favor? She was surprised. "A favor?" He said, "Sybil, if she doesn't mind, she can pretend that they are dating." She looked at him in surprise and, clenching her fist, asked what that even meant, and he scratched the back of his head and said that he thought that soon they would want to marry him to a man with whom he wanted nothing to do. And it would also be to her advantage. Won't her brother try to marry her off as soon as she returned to her homeland? And she answered, "Okay." She agrees. He asked, "Really?" Then she pointed her finger at him and said, "But she has one condition." He asked, "The condition?" She nodded, and confirming it, added, "But it will be done in her name, so she needs guarantees." What will he say about a wish?